At the entrance to the castle, Lady Wu Yu and her bodyguard stood discussing the decision that her child needed to leave this place because otherwise he would die. The woman touched the most precious treasure in her life for the last time, her newborn son with sapphire eyes. From the warmth of the mother's hands the baby fell asleep, and the lady, experiencing the pain of parting, asked her child for forgiveness. Since he was the only descendant of divine power in the world, he was hunted, and he was exposed to lifelong danger which was already awaiting both the mistress and her child. The lady heard that the killers were close and hastily gave the baby to the bodyguard and made him promise to send the boy to a place where he would never be found. The child was separated from his mother and the powers were sealed, and now the bodyguard stands in front of the woman whom he instructed to raise the boy, finally saying that he must return and protect the mistress, and the baby will have to survive relying only on himself. While the child was abandoned in the slums full of sin in the castle, all 7 clans rose up against one Lady Wu Yu, and one of the leaders advised the woman to go with them in an amicable way. There was only one reason for the current circumstances, and that was the envy of the gods, so the clans who took this path would soon regret what they had done. Meanwhile, the boy living in the slums and surviving the harsh life was actually God, who fell like a star from the sky. The guy had to fight for his life, running into trouble because he was able to get food for himself. As a teenager who lost his memory, he walked across the blade of a knife every time in order to live another day. It was difficult for the guy to resist gangs of healthy and brainless scum who could beat him every now and then for infiltrating foreign territory, but this was the case until he was 18. People always demanded bread and circuses, so the identity of Lady Wu Yu's son and the man was revealed by one random display of fighting. The hunt continued, so mercenaries were released to kill an important target. As if awakening from sleep, the defenders approached the meeting one by one, not lagging behind the thugs. Each of the heroes mastered the technique of their family in order to fulfill their destiny. The heroes were students of their own parents who passed on to their children not only wisdom but also skills. Some of the descendants were created completely from scratch to carry out a mission on a global scale. Some had to say goodbye to their parents and, despite their appearance, go to fight. During the confrontation, the dark and light sides merged in the struggle to maintain balance in the world. Tears washed away the bitterness of loss, and the empty place inside acquired a fierce fire of desire to live. In place of loneliness and hopelessness, there was a friendship that was stronger than any weapon. Different stories merged together, intertwining the past and the future, creating a new time. The haunting feeling of the ground disappearing from under their feet haunted the heroes literally and figuratively. The risk of destroying the world was each time closer than one could imagine. The lands of the exiles looked like a post-apocalyptic city washed in blood and crushed by ash and dirt. Only thanks to signs and dim lanterns could one see the streets. The air was so polluted, and a guy stood in front of one of these bright advertisements reading the details. The advertising banner announced a fight club called The Walking Dead, the slogan of which was that death is hope and the maximum winnings for a survivor were 3 million. It was the sum of money that attracted the guy, and he thought in his head that if he could win, then this money would be enough to buy something for one person. The stream of thoughts was interrupted by a sharp clap of a palm in the back and the question of what the guy was staring at. The boy with sapphire eyes timidly shouted that it was nothing, thereby giving himself away completely. The guy, very funny, tried to cover the huge banner with his body, but his friend was still able to read what was written on the sign. A friend was very skeptical about the advertising slogan, not understanding what kind of hope after death he was talking about, and added that only silver people could come up with such an advertisement. A friend explained that it was as if they were living on a chessboard. In fact, the silver ones turned their lives into a game, forcing people to exterminate each other, taking comfort in this. The guy pointed his finger at his friend with suspicion that he had already thought of something, but the boy turned his head, denying these suspicions. The young man decided to shift his focus and asked his friend if he had gotten supplies. The friend pulled aside his cloak, which hid not only supplies but also a prosthetic arm, and answered with a smile that he managed to get food for dinner. The boy with sapphire eyes was glad and at the same time proud of such a life companion. But the smile suddenly disappeared from the guy's face as he took a closer look at the prosthetic on the arm of his friend Chun. The boy understood that there was no room for delay, and it was time to remove the prosthesis because due to its rust and malfunction the arm was rotting. Chun looked around and awkwardly covered the supplies with his cloak, reminding his friend that if anyone saw their food, they would be in trouble. Chun grabbed his small comrade by the clothes and dragged him into the shelter like a small child. The guy had no choice but to accept his fate, but a plan was already firmly ingrained in his head on how to get money. In an abandoned alley behind the truck, some hooligan was snatching the last food from the hands of the poor guy. The weak and defenseless old man had a lack of strength due to lack of food, and no matter how he grabbed the food, the hooligan threw the elderly man to the ground for his life, snatching the box of food, and wished his grandfather to die quickly. The robber sat down and the truck started moving, and in the back lay a mountain of such boxes, and when the old man begged not to take the last one, the hooligan shouted that if the grandfather wanted to eat, then let him give him money. The thief threw food into the back of the car along with the rest of the boxes, shouting that they had filled the car to capacity and that special supplies were written on the containers. All this time, two friends stood between the walls of the houses waiting for the truck to leave, and if the younger guy concluded that now it was impossible to walk this road and asked Chun to leave, then Chun told his friend to wait. The guys looked at the old man, who was screaming in despair, and waited for the right moment. Chun checked to see if there was anyone else besides them and the old man and walked out from under the gate. Chun shouted to the old man to catch and throw one of the containers with supplies. The poor fellow crawled to the box, and Chun shouted after him to quickly return home and not wander around the street. The old man ran home as fast as he could, clutching the box of food to himself, and the poor man's fear was quite understandable, because in the exile zone people endlessly fight for food, and those who do not have the strength to protect themselves can only die. The guys looked after the running man, and Chun said that they shouldn't linger here either. The old man, holding in his hands his last hope of holding out a little longer, ran into the door of the house. The poor fellow climbing the stairs heard voices from those who were worse than death, and raising his head realized that if he did not want to die, he would have to give up the food. Humanity, kindness, and trust in the exile zone are worth nothing, but there is only death, and it doesn't matter whether you have food or not. Meanwhile, the guys also returned to the shelter, and you criticized Chun for giving his portion to the old man, but the comrade, calling his friend an imp, said that half was enough for one. The guys lived in an abandoned garage in a closed courtyard, and Chun was the first to reach the house and raised the roller blinds. You counted the amount of supplies and turned to Chun with the fact that he found out how to get to the prefecture, and for this you only need to change your prosthesis to a new one, and then you can apply for residence for work. The young man concluded that due to being in the prefecture, they would see each other less often, and without hearing any reaction from his friend, you looked in his direction. Chun was already fast asleep, lounging on the sofa in what he was wearing. He just took off his prosthesis. You quietly approached and carefully covered his friend with a blanket so as not to wake him. On the box next to the sofa lay Chun's prosthesis, and you stood in front of it and looked at it. You picked up the prosthetic, on the dial of which an error had clearly been glowing for a long time. Every time you looked at the prosthesis, he shuddered from the memories of that day when everything happened because Chun asked if he and you should go to the distribution of rations, and you refused his friend. This was the last time Chun waved his right hand after the fleeing you. Chun stood holding his backpack with his hand and watched as his friend ran to get food from the distribution point. Since the guy was standing next to the gateway and looking forward, he did not notice the hand that was approaching him. Dry and sinewy hands grabbed the boy holding his hair and covering his mouth and dragged him into a dark gateway. You, joyful with a box in his hands, turned to the side where his friend stood, shouting that he managed to get food. The boy ran to the place where his friend was supposed to stand, but looking around you did not see Chun anywhere. Approaching closer to the dark gateway, you heard some strange sounds coming from there. The guy took a turn, and what he saw caused the box to fall out of his hands, and he couldn't make a sound, as if he had swallowed his tongue. Chun lay on the floor in a pool of blood, and from the shock of pain, he could only faintly wheeze for you to save him. Next to the boy covered in blood, some exhausted and wild man was slurping and crunching, who, having heard the sound of the box on the ground, turned towards you. The savage extended Chun's gnawed hand towards you, asking if the guy also wanted a piece. The boy was covered in cold sweat and cried out loudly, realizing what had happened to his friend. And so you, once again having squandered this terrible story, looked down at the prosthesis, reproaching himself for the fact that if he had not left Chun alone, then everything could have been different. You sighed heavily and sat down next to him on the bed, continuing to hold the prosthesis in his hands. The guy put the prosthesis back on the box and quietly said for Chun to wait for him. You was eating wine, and he finally told the sleeping Chun that he owed him a hand and came out of the shelter looking from under the roller blinds at his friend. The young man decided for himself that he would return before dawn, and then lowered the roller shutter down. Meanwhile, in the stands, the crowd was frantically shouting the countdown to the start of the fight. The guy stood on the podium at number 4 in front of armed thugs, ready to kill him as soon as the countdown ended. He was already terribly beaten and bloodied, but the goal of getting these 3 million kindled the fire in him to reach the end. If you could look at the place where the divine child was thrown from a bird's eye view, you could see a division into 3 completely different worlds, and the highest of them was the Pantheon, and in the middle was the prefecture, and at the very end the zone of exiles. This entire circle rules in the world of espers, where every child upon reaching 8 years of age is required to undergo an ability rank assessment. Having determined a person's abilities, they put on a collar with information about the wearer that corresponds to internal strength. And each collar in turn had a specific color according to one of the 5 ranks into which people were divided, and the very first of them was special or golden. The second in rank was considered the highest or silver, which was also a good privilege. The penultimate were the middle and ordinary ranks, and the colors were copper and gray respectively. The lowest color was black, which was worn by the so-called scum, which is where you ended up. In order to get into the ring, you had to come to the registration point at the Walking Dead Club, where those who wanted to were loaded onto a bus, but there was little appearance, and everyone who wanted to get into the ring was still scanned before that. The guy approached the inspector, and the officer pointed the scanner beam at Yu's collar. The scanner beeped with an error signal, and a red card appeared on the screen with Yu's photo on it. The inspectors were wearing copper collars, and one of those who was wearing glasses raised them to look at the guy, and Yu immediately explained that this warning pops up every time he receives food for many years. The inspectors immediately began to discuss this problem since they had never encountered anything like this before. And although in the exiled zone it makes no difference to something like this in the prefecture, they should be more careful, so the one with the glasses told the second one to scan again. But even the second time, when the scanner beam was aimed at Yu's collar, the equipment gave an error signal. The inspector with glasses shook his head, indicating that it would be impossible to let the guy through, and behind Yu meanwhile, there was an irritated exclamation from one of those who wanted the small fry to get out of the queue since he couldn't register. Yu continued to show the back of his head to the irritated man standing behind him, ignoring his angry cries and threats. And when the big guy in the yellow jacket came up to slap the guy on the back of the head, Yu very deftly waved his hand. At the moment, Yu was dodging the hands of the enraged man opposite the bus, sitting on the remains of the store. Those who were not allowed onto the transport were watching everything. The guy looked indifferently at the huge idiot in front of him, who apparently had no intention of calming down. This inadequate person, as if on purpose, decided to tease Yu by not only looking at him but making a face. But Yu, without answering anything or even raising an eyebrow, turned back to the inspectors with a request to scan again, which shocked not only the inadequate guy but also the inspectors themselves. The young man began to explain to the inspectors that he needed to get to this fight, but immediately Yu's gaze caught the threat behind him and reacted. The stupid pile of muscles decided to kick the kid so that it would finally be his turn to get on the bus, but he never expected the guy to dodge. And when Yu dodged and the bully was sitting on the splits, which he clearly could not do, the guy finished his proposal to the inspectors. The officers looked at each other and exchanged a few words that the guy was actually not a mistake. And one of those who sat opposite the bus also did not remain indifferent to what the boy was able to do. Throwing mud at the guy, the would-be fighter in a yellow jacket tried to pull himself together. Being behind the young man's back, this freak wanted to act in the most base and vile way as befits scum, and took out a hidden knife. The inspector with glasses said that Yu's data had been re-uploaded, so he could get on the bus for now, and the second officer meanwhile held the fool with a knife. The officer looked at the big man and calmed his ardor, saying that he would still have time to do what he had planned, adding that he could kill the guy in the ring. Duralii made a dissatisfied face and had to calm down to get on the bus. One of the refuseniks stood and was indignant at the fact that the inspectors had problems with their eyes because they took a skinny monkey that is you, but they didn't, to which another refusenik explained that different people should take part in the battles because it's more interesting. The refuseniks looked at the window where you was visible and laughed because the ratings would creep up, and that they couldn't wait to see how little they would do in the ring. One of the refuseniks knew something more than his narrow-minded friends, surprised them by explaining that because of idiots like them, of which there are quite a lot, people without abilities were labeled as scum, which allowed the espers to play with them. This man stood up and, without waiting for an answer from the scum or understanding, put out his cigarette and headed towards the bus. The man decided to add that the guys were very lucky that they were not chosen because they would be able to take a couple more breaths, and not paying attention to the indignation and a bunch of questions, he walked further to the bus. The refuseniks thought that this man was the same as them and therefore sat next to them, but he told them that by chance he decided to smoke on the side. This man seemed familiar to the scum, and turning to them in profile, the man asked if he had won enough fights yet. And raising his hair and throwing his head back, he reminded that in front of them was Chin Tion, the owner of a series of victories for the Walking Dead Club. Because of his outerwear, the scars that Chin had accumulated for 40 years as the king of the ring, having already won 8 victories in a row, were not visible. The inspectors turned to Chin so that he would not miss the flight again and board the bus. Chin climbed into the spacious interior of the transport, which was taking many passengers to certain death. The doors of the bus closed, and from that moment on, just like on other days, the hope was only for survival. In this part of the world, no matter how hard you try, death cannot be avoided, and even now the bus only went in one direction. While the bus was moving in a given direction, the server department of the prefecture was already looking through information about those who were traveling here. Someone actively went through the buttons on the keyboard until he came across the necessary information. In front of the monitors that illuminated the dark server room, the silhouette of a man stood looking at something on the screen. A person from the gold rank noted that the eyes of the one who is now on the screen are so similar to the eyes of a certain woman. A dossier of Shan Yu, whose age was 18 years old, was displayed on the screen, but the address was not indicated, and it was by his eyes that the man recognized that the guy was a child of God. Shan looked at the passing picture in the window and was worried about returning before dawn, and then Chun would not know anything because otherwise he would scold you. Shan's imagination ran wild, and he imagined his friend with a baton in his hands and realized that this was even worse than him now going to the ring, which was very funny. You looked into the reflection of the window and saw that same stupid big guy in a yellow jacket swinging over him with a knife. The big man kept itching to kill the kid on the way to the ring, so without hesitation he raised the knife over him. And at that time the guy felt for the seat button and without panicking and without getting up pressed it. Shan brought the seat to the sleeping position and thereby struck the big man's hand, causing the knife to fly out. The knife flew off and stuck its tip into the ceiling of the bus as if into butter. One of the passengers displeasedly asked whether it was really necessary to fight right here, and Yu meanwhile jumped from his seat to his feet in front of the big man. Chin noticed all these movements on board, but so far he indifferently watched the already so ordinary sight. Although the big guy was big and strong, his weak brain and state of madness really betrayed him because his interest only peaked after Yu's reaction to the knife, and now the dumbass threatened the guy that he wanted to grind him into powder even before the fight. Shan understood that the situation was crap because now you can't waste your energy on this stupid guy. The guy decided for himself that he needed to finish everything as quickly as possible, otherwise he would not be able to cope with the main battle. But remembering his strength, you stopped, because if he gets into a fight now in front of everyone, and even with his abilities, he will be like an eyesore. Shan stood in front of a pile of muscles in the form of a big man trying to gather his thoughts into a heap to decide what to do. And as soon as the dumbass wanted to make a dash towards the young man shouting that he would finish the boy off, Chin's blow flew right into his face. Chin grabbed a piece of meat on the fly, which was already unconscious, and walked forward, while Shan tried to digest what had just happened. The bus driver noticed Chin's blow and asked the fighter that until they reached their destination, this healthy forehead would be inspected by him. Chin Tian smiled and told the inspector that he could rely on him, and the big man wouldn't wake up until he arrived. You stood rooted to the spot and could not believe how Chin was able to kill such a large guy with one blow. When Chin walked back, still looking at the big man like a teddy bear, Shan timidly thanked the fighter, but immediately realized to himself that if he ran into this man in the ring, he would definitely not see not only victory but also life. Chin confirmed for himself that the guy was still young if he thanked the enemy, but at the same time noted that Shan was lucky, but that was until he met Chin in the ring, and then it dawned on Yu, who was standing in front of him. At the moment when Shan stood with his finger raised and realized that in front of him was a difficult person but could not utter a word, a knife fell from the ceiling on Chin's head, hitting him with the handle right in the top of his head, but the fighter did not even flinch. The bus left the exile zone and approached the tunnel, and at the same time the wall dividing the land of scum from the prefecture. On the other side of the tunnel there was light, as in all life and philosophical statements about hope. The closer the bus approached the exit from the tunnel, the brighter the light became, as if there was just a bright emptiness there. And only after entering the prefecture's possessions could one understand where such a bright source of light was coming from, because unlike the exile zone, everything here was blinding with its variegation and brightness. Shan saw something different for the first time in his 18 years of living in dirt and darkness. The guy's eyes opened wide in order to have time to see absolutely everything in the place where the Supreme Ones live. The bus stopped at a statue in front of the arena representing what is happening inside the huge structure. While the fighters were heading towards the exit and Chin was still carrying the big man like a toy in his bosom, Shan stood and looked at the tall statue. The face of the statue looked worse than ordinary death, because if death comes and takes you away, then this personification of the club takes comfort from the sight before taking you away. The crowd was already in full swing after the previous battles, and now shouted even more in anticipation of the newly arrived fighters. The spectators were people in silver collars and suits, as befits the prefecture. The new arrivals walked along the corridor, unlike the young man who kept looking at everything as if in a museum. Shan's attention was drawn to a cart that was being driven by two people in the same gray suits as the bus inspectors. One of the men was carrying a cart with corpses covered with a black cloth, and the other was walking next to him with a tablet in his hands. The workers passed by Yu, and the guy followed them with his gaze, realizing that those in the cart were the killed participants. Indignant that during this battle there were a lot of dirty killings and a lot of blood, one of the workers pulled the cloth from the cart in which 3 dead men lay. In this entertainment complex for the prefecture, everything was provided for a long time ago, and for the convenience of the staff there were special buttons in the floor. The worker who was driving the cart, after pressing a button in the floor, threw the bodies into the hole behind the door, which rose. The corpses fell down from the cart like garbage, which was actually garbage for the prefecture. It's scary to imagine how deep that hole is and how long ago it has been filled with corpses, the number of which continues to grow. For Shan, everything that he just saw was not new, and he accepted his fate and the fate of those who died in silence. Meanwhile, in a luxurious estate with its own garden, to which the hands of the architect laid hands, the sun was shining brightly. At the entrance to a huge house with high doors stood a servant waiting for the owner. When the doors opened, the servant informed the master that the day spoken of in the prophecy had arrived. The master left the house, and the servant bowed to the master, saying that he could set off on his way. In the preparation room at that moment there were 7 people in the form of fighters, fresh meat for the slaughterhouse, including you, and each of them had their own number and color. Shan carefully watched who got what weapons, and these were brass knuckles and daggers. 2 more guys had a club with nails and a staff, which was pretty good. Unlike Shun, who did not have any weapons, he also got an unlucky number, namely 4. It was not without reason that the guy didn't have a weapon, because that's what the rules of the competition said, which stated that there were 7 participants and 6 weapons. Whether you have a weapon or not is decided by the rating assigned by the audience, and accordingly the higher the rating the better the weapon and the fighter in priority. And a participant with a minimum rating must enter the arena unarmed, which can often immediately be a death sentence for the poor fellow. But Shan was calm on this score, because no one would defend against an opponent with a rating of 1.2% and without weapons respectively. The majority would focus on the strongest with the highest winning rating. While he was thinking about everything, Qin Tian approached the entrance to the room and looked at the young man. The king of the ring did not say anything but turned around and left, but the guy's head was still filled with thoughts that he was worried about Qin's strength. And you also came to the conclusion that it was not so difficult for a fighter with such abilities to survive in exile. One of the participants came close to Shan and asked the guy if he knew the king of the ring. Since you, as usual, ignored the opponent's words, the fighter, with a rating of 30.5%, again asked if the little one knew Qin Tian. This time Shan answered in the negative, realizing that there was nowhere to go anyway, to which the Troika replied dissatisfiedly that he only wanted to find out if Qin would help the guy out, and asked what was wrong with Yu's face. The Troika did not lag behind the boy, and looking closer and closer into Yu's face asked if the guy was hiding something, because as far as the Troika knew, Qin only cared about strong guys, and Shan replied that that was not the point at all, because he was even without a weapon. Troika leaned his forehead on Shan's forehead, and continuing to smile menacingly warned the guy not to lie, and continuing that otherwise he would not let him out, he put a gun to Yu's stomach. The sound of the start of the competition came from the ring, and Yu smiled sweetly and wished him good luck. Workers in gray uniforms stood in front of the ring steps and addressed the participants with the condition that in order to ensure proper conduct of the competition they needed to put on the prepared equipment before entering the arena. In the hands of the club employee were 7 round devices that at first glance looked like tablets or magnets. One of the fighters shouted that these were mini-bombs, and the Troika cynically told the workers that they had a dime a dozen trump cards in their pockets, and the fighter behind the Troika, and Yu was clearly shocked by the turn of events, and the guys in uniform replied that the fighters could perceive bombs as gifts. There was nowhere to go because the outcome was still the same, so everyone took away the so-called gifts. Shan, like everyone else, put a bomb on his collar and asked the workers if he could now enter the arena, to which they agreed. Amid the howls and roars of the audience, as well as stormy applause, the fight was soon to begin. Drones were flown to record and broadcast the battle, and the announcer announced that there would be only one survivor in this competition. The announcer addressed the participants with the condition that before the timer runs out they need to try their best to kill all their opponents, because if one of them shows mercy they will turn into a piece of meat. And while the participants stood in the ring preparing for the massacre in the royal preparation room, the highest-ranking fighters were discussing who would die first and whether to bet on the 4th. Among the kings of the ring was Qin, and while others were glued to the screen watching the fighters, Qin sat indifferently on the sidelines. The excitement and expectation of the instant death of the 4 gave way to bewilderment on the faces of the fighters. While the kings were indignant and shouted that this was not normal, Qin was amused that the battle was already becoming interesting. The bat hit the ring bars, and the crowd raged that something like this could not be possible. The guy bent over with the bat couldn't believe how Shan so deftly dodged all his attacks. The fighter swung his baton again, and shouting that this was not funny at all, rushed towards you. But the newcomer still dodged the deadly blows of the bat with nails as if it were a dance. Shan looked at the guy with the club with his sapphire eyes and said that he was fighting and moving too slowly. This infuriated 5, and he swung his baton again, but Yu dodged and thought to himself that the fighter was full of combat shortcomings. Having escaped from the blow of the bat, Yu emerged with his fist and hit the 5 in the jaw. Fighter number 5 prevailed over Yu both in height and weight, so the blow came with difficulty for the young man. The kings of the ring discussed discussed whether such reflexes were even possible watching on the screen as Sean waved his hand after the blow to relieve the pain. Yu was in pain and he clenched and unclenched his palm looking at the bloody knuckles but still understood that he could not use his power yet. 5 laughed at the boy asking if it hurt him and Sean did not hesitate to answer that the fighter had thick skin which angered the big man and he threatened to kill you. Sean noticed that another fighter was approaching the 5 from behind twisting the guy with the club whom he was threatening to kill. But the 5 didn't have time to react and the knife was already at his throat and the last thing he heard were the words "he's mine." The one who could not calm down his ardor even on the bus had already dealt with the 5 and now became closer to you. Sean looked at the big man in the yellow jacket and saw that he had killer energy. Deuce wiping the blood from his face told the guy that he made him look like a fool on the bus and that's why they weren't finished yet, but if he was killed by someone else then who would be the big deal to deal with. 10 minutes remained on the scoreboard out of 15 and the signal for the elimination of the 5th player sounded just as there was no longer a 7th. The 6th player ran up to the bars and with tears and hysterics pounded on it shouting that he was giving up and wanted to refuse to participate and that he didn't even need money just to be let out. While the 6th was trying to get out and shouting to be let out, the workers standing at the steps looked at each other. One of the uniforms had a remote control with a red button and looking at the number 6 he pressed it. The small tablet on the collar lit up red and beeped. There was another participant standing near the 6 and he had to cover himself from the explosion and the blood that scattered around. One fell to the floor and screamed in hysterics while the 6 collar rolled on the floor. On top of the 7 sat a Troika with a pistol scolding the workers for stealing his screen time. Troika looked carefully at the headless corpse whose head had just been blown out by an explosion. It is not known what was going on in his head, but the Troika decided to hit the already dead 7th in the face. The Deuce at that moment was running around the ring with a knife behind you and the guy was still dodging except for the last moment. Sean slid some distance from the two realizing that the speed and strength of the enemy had increased and this really only indicated that he was restraining himself on the bus. At the last moment Deuce was still able to strike with a knife which landed on Shan's leg and the guy made a decision for himself that if he continued to dodge he would achieve nothing and would waste his time and energy. Getting ready for further struggle, Sean asked in his head what he should do and this question was addressed to his friend. You remembered the moments of his and Chun's training that they had to arrange in order to survive and protect themselves in the exile zone. Chun looked at his friend Yu with pride because the guy had become even better and if before he could be hit a couple of times now it was impossible to even touch Sean. Chun looked at his out-of-breath friend and realized that his movements were more and more like some kind of superpower. Yu begged for rest but Chun insisted that even though his friend had quite good defense when faced with danger Sean would not defeat anyone with his dodges. Chun showed his fist to his friend and said that attacking is the best way to win, adding that from now on they will train even harder. A determined friend shouted to Yu whether he was ready despite the fact that Sean loudly repeated that they would now rest. And in the moments when Sean could not attack Chun during training, he got the impression that a curse had been placed on his body. Yu fell dead tired on the sofa next to Chun and his friend was glad that Sean was becoming better at dodging every day but was upset that his friend had not improved his attacks because at this rate his enemies would grow old before he defeated them. Yu lay neither alive nor dead trying to catch his breath and Chun kept thinking about the fact that this, although strange, was quite interesting. A friend expressed his assumption that the lack of strength could be connected with the woman that Sean always sees in his dreams. Chun leaned towards Yu's ear and quietly clarified that he meant the woman with the divine ring. But Sean indifferently replied that it was just a dream about that divine thing and asked how it could be connected with his power. Chun hugged and encouraged his friend telling him not to be sad because at least the enemy wouldn't be able to hit him and added that if in the future he came face to face with danger he just needed to run away. Yu was devoured by guilt for the fact that he was always hiding behind the back of the one-armed Chun, and this only made him hate his weaknesses and incompetence more. The guy recalled how he threshed a pear until his hands bled, wanting to become stronger and constantly repeating to himself that he would not bend to fate. Yu grouped himself and told himself that he couldn't run away from danger forever. Sean ran towards the two, which only provoked the fighter, and he also rushed towards the guy. Yu was close to the two and dodged a lightning strike with a knife. Bending down and avoiding another blow, Sean decided that he needed to exploit the two's weaknesses. Yu used his fist, but halfway his hand was caught by the hand of the Deuce many times larger. Deuce laughed at the guy, shouting to him what kind of blow this was, and then Sean realized that it was rubbish. Deuce shouted whether the guy was mocking him and threw the boy above him in the air like a toy. Sean fell on his back and then rolled some distance around the ring. While Yu was getting up from the floor, the two shouted that the guy turned out to be just a stinking rat who only knows how to dodge. Deuce threw the knife over his shoulder and was very pleased with how he managed to hiccup the guy. The kings of the ring were confused and every now and then turned to Chin to ask why the guy had just been strong and now he had weakened so sharply, and whether this could mean that he had some kind of ace up his sleeve. And while in the ring, the public's interest in the new fighter was just flaring up, someone's shadow appeared near the garages where the guys lived in the exile zone. The man whistling a melody slowly approached closer and closer to the garage doors. The stranger knocked on the door twice, thereby waking up the sleeping Ah-chun. The guy asked who was behind the doors and asked if it was Shan Yu. There were 4 people left on the podium, and while Yu was trying to gather himself together and a twosome was heading towards him, then to the side of them a trio who still had a pistol swung his hand and threw something towards the fighters. Shan raised his head up and tried to look at the object that the troika threw. A small object was flying towards the drone from which the live broadcast was being broadcast. Yu was able to see in this object the same small bomb that they were given at the beginning of the game for the collar. Shan's face darkened from the understanding of what would happen next with the explosives. And the third shortly after the throw fired a shot in the direction where the deuce and 4 were located. A powerful explosion occurred above the heads of Shan and the 2, and the announcer only in a commendable manner told the third how vile it was and added that this was to be expected from a player with the highest rating. The deuce received a severe burn and stood covered in smoke, covering his face with his hand. The third was rejoicing that the smoke would now clear and he would see you dead. But the fourth emerged from the smoke alive, although wounded and stunned after the explosion, and the third could not believe his eyes how the guy was able to dodge the bullet that was flying straight at him. Shan was stunned by the explosion and held his head with one hand, which was hiding the blood. The third one was attacked with all his might by the second one with terrible burns, and the anger became even greater from the pain. The second was able to knock the pistol out of the third's hand, and the weapon rolled straight to use feet spinning. A fight broke out between the second and third, and they tumbled around the ring and laid each other on their shoulder blades. The third was dominated by physical strength, while the second was already exhausted and wounded, which the troika noticed, and without even taking the knife from the opponent's hands, simply began to press it on the body. The second understood that his strength was running out and turned to Shan and yelled for him to take the gun. The second frantically shouted to the newcomer to take the gun and shoot at the third, but Yu only indifferently remained in place and looked at his rivals. To save his life, Deuce was already shouting that he would let Shan win and that he would give him part of the money, and the knife was getting closer to the body. The third finally told the two that he was a fool and, leaning with his whole body, plunged the knife into the heart. The second could no longer breathe, but only wheezed, choking on blood, and rolled his eyes and died immediately. The third got to his feet and, looking at the second, said that he was very sorry because the guy was not bad. Troika stared at Shan, saying that he was next, but at that moment a pistol shot sounded. The third looked down at the hole in his body that was already oozing blood, but did not make a sound and did not grab the wound. The next 3 shots hit the head and torso, causing the third to lose his balance and begin to fall. The pistol ended up in the hands of the first one, who no longer in himself shouted that 300,000 would be his. The third fell loudly and dead to the floor of the ring right next to the second. Out of 7 participants, only 2 remained in the arena, and all this was seen live by the audience both present and on the broadcast. The Walking Dead Club Arena was the largest and most colorful attraction in the prefecture. The battle was broadcast on one of the skyscrapers where all the remaining participants were visible in close-up. A man in a strict and respectable suit was just watching what was happening on the big screen. The stranger looked at Shan and told him not to dare to die and activated his power, which emitted purple electrical discharges. At the same instant, the glass in the street lamps burst due to overvoltage and they went out. It was as if the power that man used began to cover the prefecture like a dark wave, and the light began to disappear as it approached the arena. People watched as all the electronics in the city crunched from overvoltage and crashed, showing an error or stopping working altogether. This massive shutdown and explosions of light sources were not only external but also internal, causing some people to be injured. The prefecture sparkled with purple discharges and went dark, which ultimately led to pitch darkness except for the main source of light in the arena. This man was happy with the work done, as if nothing terrible had happened but just some ordinary thing. Shan, although weak, told the first one that he would not receive any money. The first was little concerned about Yu's statement, since his main argument was the pistol in his hand, and he asked how the unarmed fourth was going to fight in such a case. Shan admitted to himself that he really couldn't win in such a situation, but he was not going to give up. The announcer noticed that Yu was getting up from his knees and, bringing the camera closer to him, announced to everyone that the fourth would fight to the end. The first one took the pistol with both hands to make the decisive shot, and the announcer only urged him on in this. But Yu, realizing that it was not so easy to go so far and Chun was waiting for him at home, decided to continue the fight no matter the cost, and then a shot sounded. Shan closed his eyes and took a deep breath, concentrating and sharpening all his senses. The guy felt a bullet flying in his direction straight to his head and caught a barely audible smell of rust in the air. Right before the bullet hit Yu's head, he quickly dodged it. The announcer could not contain his surprise and shouted to the first one whether he was even able to finish this fight because the enemy was so close, but the fighter missed. The first one began to chicken out from what he saw, and the gun fell out of his hands, and he stammered and asked how the fourth one was able to dodge the bullet because they are both at the lowest rank. Sean felt dizzy and weak, but the guy told himself that it was too early to pass out. The first, unable to stand being in this arena, wanted to quickly finish with his opponent and muttered the word die through his teeth. The first had a knife in his hand, and screaming he rushed at the fourth to finish him off. But Sean decided that he needed to survive, which means he chose to fight, and thus he again dodged the blow thanks to his strength. Now you could smell the rust more clearly and noticed that the first one was already quite weak and was attacking in a state of shock, so the guy struck under the jaw. The fourth understood that if he was fast enough he would be able to guess the moment and win, so with one hand he grabbed the first by the hand and with the other he took away the knife and swung it. The knife was a couple of centimeters from the first one's neck, and you also didn't forget about the timer that was almost expired. Only the fourth did not kill the first but only froze with a knife at his neck. The guy felt someone with incredible power heading into the arena. The scoreboard meanwhile showed the last 4 seconds before the end of the fight. The kings of the ring sat at the screen and screamed why this kid wouldn't finish with the first one because there was only so much time, and Chin just continued to watch but also did not hide his misunderstanding. The screen on which the broadcast was broadcast in the king's room went out and purple sparkles came from it. Chin looked at the exit from the room and thought that this was not just a power outage. In the dark corridor of the arena, the confident and even step of the one who was involved in turning off the lights was heard. Chin realized that this is a certain person who has the ability, and right now he is heading towards the ring. At the last second, the main ring board went out and the participants remained standing in the arena. Sean held a bomb in his hand which also sparkled and did not understand why it was removed. While the first fell on all fours and muttered to himself that he was saved, the fourth at that moment felt that it was not yet time to let down his guard because someone was coming here. A worker opened the grid and told the participants that they had some problems with energy, so the end of the competition was postponed, and asked them to go back to the rooms and wait for the announcement. Sean silently backed away after the worker, but the first one still did not calm down and bombarded him with questions about who would win, and where the money was, and who would receive it, and whether it would be possible to divide it, into which the guard said that management would negotiate the reward. You stopped right next to the culprit of all this chaos, who was already waiting for the guy. The man in the suit praised the young man that he had done a pretty good job, causing mute surprise on the guy's face. The stranger smiled and asked if the guy wouldn't even thank his savior. Sean could barely look at the so-called savior with one eye, and he wanted to ask a question but could not. The guy's strength suddenly left him, and he fell face down on the floor as if dead, and the man was indignant at what a weakling the kid was. The security guard stood and asked the audience to leave the room, and a man with you on his shoulder passed by him. The employee turned to the person who he was and asked to lower the participant to the floor because they could not leave the club. But the man continued to walk, ignoring the requests, and the employee holding the stranger's shoulder repeated that the guy was the property of the club. With a slight movement of his hand, the man slammed the guard into the wall and finally said that participant number 4 was no longer the property of the club. The kings of the ring, including Chin, heard and saw all this, and one of them asked Tion what he thought about what happened. Chin looked after the leaving man and replied that the wind had changed, and thought to himself that perhaps that child with the black ring was the key to changing this world. The king of the ring looked at the guy moving away from him and hoped that they would meet again. At the entrance to the prefecture there was an expensive car, rather unusual for these places. And in the gateway the scum were already waiting for their boss's command to rob the car, but the leader was just watching. A stranger was sitting behind the wheel, and Sean was lying passed out in the front passenger seat, which already rather annoyed his savior because he was sitting waiting for the guy to wake up. The savior decided to speed up the process of awakening the young man, and the car sparkled from the current discharge. The stranger's plan worked flawlessly, and you woke up, but his hair stood on end. The young man finally woke up, opening his eyes wide when he saw in front of him the one who had caused trouble in the club, and began to ask questions who he was and why he brought him here. Sean has already realized that this is the owner of the ability by the fact that he cannot move from the pressure he feels being next to him. The guy concluded that the owner was definitely of the highest level, if not special, but he was interested in the question of why he needed to save such trash as him. After all, you saw with his own eyes how such people trample and play with the life of scum as they want. Although Sean really wanted to ask the owner a lot, he decided that it was better not to get involved with him and tried to carefully open the car doors. Of course, it was not possible to do this silently, and the owner introduced himself as Lu Jichuan, thereby forcing the guy to freeze in place. Sean seemed to hear something familiar to himself, and the attempt to remember was successful since the Lu family is the third among the 8 great families, and the guy thought about the ring on Ji's neck. Lu, as if reading Yu's thoughts, showed a gold ring under his shirt, indicating to the guy that his train of thought was correct. Ji sharply pointed his finger at Sean, and told him not to even think about running away since from now on the guy's life is in the hands of the owner. Lu looked at the guy's bright sapphire eyes and called him God's child. Lu explained that behind the legend above the special class there was another more impressive divine class. And one person from the divine class was superior to 100 people from the special class due to the concentration of abilities. The existence of a representative of the divine class was similar to the name of their category, that is, they were equated to gods. Sean answered Ji that he had heard about the legend and about a person with a divine class named Leo Song, and Lu immediately replied that the same Leo was his great-great-grandfather. You began to compare the information logically, that if he is a divine child, then he is the child of Leo Songting, and he in turn is the great-grandfather of Leo Chuan, and in horror Sean covered his mouth with his hand and quietly asked if he was Lu's great-grandfather. Lu threatened the guy not to talk nonsense and indicated that the legends he had heard about the divine class were not entirely true. Ji showed 3 fingers and said that since the appearance of the first holder of the ability, 3 people with the divine class were known. Lu of course talked about all 3, naming the first great-great-grandfather Leo Songting, the second was Lady Wu Yu who had the gift of foresight and immortality, and the third person disappeared after being recognized as a divine class. Ji pointed his finger at the guy and said that Shan is the child of the owner of immortality Wu Yu. Shan smiled, taking it all as a joke, and asked Lu if he really wanted to say that the guy did not belong to the scum. But the smile abruptly disappeared from Yu's face when the memory of that dream that he constantly had came to mind. Shan asked himself the question that the woman from the dreams turned out to be his mother, and Lu, seeing the guy's stupor, said that he understood that a lot of questions would arise in the near future and promised that he would gradually answer everything, but for now it was important to ensure safety. Ji explained to Shan that his face was broadcast throughout the jurisdiction, which is why they would soon learn about the guy in the heavenly city. God found it amusing to talk about such things, and smiling, he told the boy that there was very little time left before those who wanted to kill him began to appear, and this was an omen of the beginning of a new war. The guys finally moved, driving through the streets of the exile zone. Lu periodically glanced at the guy, realizing that he still would not accept the truth that had befallen him 18 years later. Ji asked Shan why he took part in the battle, because a guy should be aware of the limits of his strength, to which he replied that he needed money, but Lu did not understand why. Without answering his savior why he needed money, the guy asked him to stop instead. The guys approached some hardware store, and a man with an eye patch displeasedly asked Shan whether he had brought money this time, to which he replied in the affirmative. You looked at Lu, and the savior was surprised and asked if he looked like money, to which the guy quite reasonably replied that Lu had taken responsibility for the boy. Ji looked at the seller and said to give the guy the best, from which the man's menacing look changed to terribly pleased. While the seller was packing the best prosthesis, Shan explained to Lu that he had a friend with whom he grew up, and his name was Ah-chun, and his class was below standard, so he did not need to stay in the zone, but because of you the friend took advantage of his disability to stay. The young man also finally explained to his savior that he wanted to win the match in order to buy his friend's hand, because with it Ah-chun would be able to move normally and get a job in the jurisdiction. The seller gave the prosthesis to the guy, and Lu at that moment looked at the child and thought to himself whether the boy knew that the tournament in which he took part would change so many human lives. Leaving the store, Lu reminded the guy that anyone he came into contact with could become their target, and added that if Shan cared he would need to leave Ah-chun. Yu finally asked if he could return to Ah-chun and explain the situation before further actions were planned between him and Lu, and besides the guy had many more questions. The savior agreed to the guy's last wish before changes in his life, and when they arrived at the garages, Ji said that he would wait in the car. While Yu was walking towards the door, a bird flew onto the wall at the entrance to the guy's home and carefully watched the guy. Shan was in a hurry to see his friend, but was worried that he would scold him because the guy looked rumpled, but it was still worth it, and having driven away thoughts of punishment and excitement, Yu was no longer eager to tell his friend about Lu and that he was a divine child. Yu was wildly happy, imagining his friend's reaction to the gift of a new prosthesis. The guy raised the roller shutter and shouted to Ah-chun to wake up and see what Yu has for him. Shan walked into the dark garage without looking at his feet and was already beginning to tell his friend that he would never believe what he heard. But Yu fell silent, feeling that he had tripped over something on the floor, and began to look closely at the obstacle in the darkness. On the floor at the guy's feet lay his friend's completely disabled prosthesis covered in blood. Somewhere from the depths of the garage came a sweet voice that said that the guy had finally returned, and that he had been waiting for him, and Yu stood like a stone and looked at the prosthesis. A voice from nowhere continued to say that if I had not seen it with my own eyes, I would never have believed that the boy would hide in such a dirty place where no one with the ability would set foot, which is pretty smart. The man in the suit and silver collar snapped his fingers because to a large extent all decisions were given to him that way. The light turned on, and before Shan's gaze, there was a killer sitting on the sofa with his foot standing on Chun's body, and this man said that it was an honor for him to meet God's child. Everything swam before Shan's eyes, and he looked at the dead body of his friend. He was torn apart from the inside, and he frantically shouted his friend's name, hoping that he would still hear him. The killer stood up, raising his hands up, and solemnly said that he found you first, so now he is closest to the deity. It became difficult for the guy to breathe, and he broke out into a cold sweat because he didn't even pay attention to the man but just looked at his friend. Just like on that ill-fated day when Sean almost lost his friend, this time the box fell from his hands to the floor again. You screamed loudly from the pain of loss cutting through the air, and not believing that he was now seeing what he was seeing. The killer just as indifferently stood with one foot on Chun's body and asked if the guy had such a reaction to this person. Sean, barely able to stand on his feet, ran up to his lying friend, and the man asked if the boy really knew him. You did not further notice the killer or what he was saying, but only scared his friend, saying that he had returned, and asked him to wake up. The killer still stood and asked if the boy was crying. As befits a representative of the Silver Collar, he called the murdered Chun low-grade trash. The freak grabbed you by the clothes, calling him a useless loser, and lifted him up to face him. And the killer, asking if this nonentity, the heir to the deity, hit him in the ribs with his fist, saying that this was complete disappointment. The blow was so strong that Sean flew into the wall, leaving a dent and cracks in it. The tyrant raised his hand to use force and pull the guy's body towards him. Like a toy, Sean found himself near the Silver One, and he took the guy by the neck with ease. Silver was surprised that he really misrepresented himself because the boy is such a weakling. But you didn't lean because he understood that he could have dodged, and looked with eyes full of tears at his dead friend. At that moment, nothing else mattered to the guy in order to at least make an attempt to survive. Memories of his friend appeared before Yu's eyes, as if he was now standing in front of him, alive and cheerful as always. Choking from lack of air, Sean thought only about why it was not he who died. The strength left his divine child, but he did not resist but accepted his fate. The hand that had just been holding the killer's hand flew down dead. Sean felt that he was flying into some dark world that he had never seen before. The guy fell into the open doors from which two hands were already reaching out to him. Closing Shan's mouth and pushing him further into the door, exactly the same person appeared next to him. The other Sean confidently walked up the steps while the first one fell into the dark abyss behind the door. Finally, the new you looked at the falling old Sean with completely different eyes and told him that he was a coward. Sean tried to shout to the newcomer and asked him to wait, but the doors slammed shut. The killer's face lit up with a blue light, and this made him nervous. The guy, without raising his face, firmly grabbed the Silver One by the hand and removed it from his neck. The Silver One, spinning with terrible force, flew off as Sean had previously flown into the wall. Nuyu took a deep breath and exhaled, as if settling into his body after a long hibernation. The guy went to where the crippled Silver One lay by the sofa, whining in pain. The killer's head was covered in blood, and his hand was broken into smithereens, and he looked at her, realizing that the matter was rubbish. Before Silver had time to come to his senses, Sean was standing in front of him with a completely different strength. The killer tried to cry out for mercy and mumbled something about what he didn't want, but it was too late. Something strong was looking at the Silver One, the aura of which was completely different from what it was before. The scumbag held his hand, which had already turned blue, and lowered his head down. Objects in the garage began to float in the air, and the guy's clothes fluttered in the air. Silver shouted how he could screw up like that and wanted to use force against the guy with his whole hand. But you looked at the scoundrel with eyes dark as impenetrable darkness, and was not even influenced by the statement to go to hell. The Silver One's hand stopped right in front of the boy's face and froze like a statue. The bastard was seriously scared, feeling that his hand was not obeying him. Sean, using telekinesis, lifted absolutely all the objects in the room. The child flew up sharply and grabbed the Silver One by the neck, but didn't stop there. With a powerful blow, Sean threw the geek like a rag into the other end of the garage. Silver slammed into the wall so that blood sprayed out of his mouth, most likely from internal bleeding. You wasted no time in throwing absolutely everything he had picked up in the air at the killer. The bastard was sitting on the floor under the wall and began to dodge and hide from the boxes and cabinets flying at him. The guy still had a bunch of furniture and other rubbish in his arsenal, so he mercilessly continued to throw everything at the Silver One. This rag had no choice but to stand up in grief and run away to save his insignificant soul. Silver tore his claws and turned to the guy and realized that he had underestimated him because he was wearing a black ring, and it was necessary to finish him off right away. The bastard saw the exit from the garage and remembered that telekinesis has a range. Silver ran to the exit, thinking that as long as he increased the distance between them and went outside, the boy would not do anything. But at the entrance, the brat faced another obstacle in the form of an even stronger opponent. The owner asked the Silver One if he was really thinking of quietly giving up after creating such a mess here. The weakling looked at the lightning attribute as well as the scar on his face and the golden ring, which made him realize that Lu Jichuan himself was in front of him. This moment of unexpected meeting was to Shan's advantage, and in the blink of an eye, he found himself behind the silver one. You used the power of telekinesis to grab his own neck with the bastard's broken hand and strangle him. The silver man's face turned white from lack of oxygen, and no matter how much he beat himself with his second hand, it did not help. The compression force was so strong that the neck broke and tore all the tissue inside. Silver remained on his knees, only his head was already hanging behind his back, and he began to look like a puppet without some of the strings. Lu continued to stand at the entrance sparkling, and you pushed the dead body to the floor with his foot. The one who came instead of the usual Shan stared at Lu and breathed heavily. Ji smiled at the boy and asked if the guy would attack him too. Shan did not answer but only fell forward on his face, leaning slightly towards Lu. The powers dimmed and dissipated like smoke, and you lay completely immobilized. Ji stood with folded hands and said to himself displeasedly that somehow he did not look like the savior whom they had all prophesied. The garage still stood open, but it was already quiet inside, and a lot of time passed before Shan came to his senses. The guy exploded as if from a nightmare, and the first thing he screamed was his friend's name. You sank, realizing that everything was actually looking at the body covered with a sheet. Then the boy drew attention to the entrance to the garage where Lu stood, and next to the locker lay the silver body. Ji was smoking while waiting, and now, after taking a long drag, he looked at Shan and asked if he had woken up. He was terribly unsteady and he could barely stand on his feet, but he still headed to the bed where his friend was lying. The guy opened the sheet and looked at the face of Ah-chun, whose eyes were apparently closed by Lu. Shan, overcoming the pain tearing him inside, silently lifted his friend's body. Yu's weakness was very strong, and without calculating this, he fell to the floor with Chun in his arms. Lu did not interfere but just stood and watched silently while continuing to smoke. Shan, carrying his friend in his arms, walked past Ji onto the street, and the owner only glanced at them. The wind blew Yu's hair and ruffled Ah-chun's cloak, and if it weren't for what happened, one would have thought that Chun had just fallen asleep in his friend's arms. In the courtyard under a tree, Shan dug a grave and placed Chun's body there. You picked up a handful of earth to throw into the grave but was in no hurry to do so. Shan waited for some more time, sincerely hoping that maybe his friend would come to his senses. After all, it was difficult to believe in this loss. But the earth itself slowly began to fall from the guy's hands onto Chun's already cold and pale body. After some time, the grave was filled up, and with it a very important part of you. The guy made a cross out of sticks, wrapped them with rope, and placed it on top of the embankment. When it was all over, Shan sat down in front of the grave like one continuous lump of pain. You hugged himself with his arms, tucking his legs to his head and leaning his face like that, looking at the grave with his sapphire eyes. Suddenly a bright sun shone right next to Shan, and he heard a painfully familiar voice that asked how long the guy would continue to have this mournful look. The young man looked up and saw Chun, who asked him to cheer up and was still smiling. Chun sat down next to you and put his hand on his head, ruffling his hair like a younger brother. And just as suddenly as this vision appeared, it disappeared, and Shan again sat alone, peering into nowhere. He was unable to restrain himself, and tears rolled onto the dry ground, leaving dark spots. The guy sat sobbing from the loss of his closest and dearest person, whom he could not save for the second time. Lu was already starting to doze off while sitting in the car when a boy knocked on his window. The owner lowered the window and, looking at his swollen face and dark circles under his eyes, realized that the guy was crying quite a lot. You himself decided to start an unfinished conversation by indicating that Ah-chung died due to the disclosure of his identity. Ji confirmed that he would not give the guy any consoling speeches and that indeed Chun's death was on his conscience, but added that you was not allowed to choose his fate, and especially now was not the time to feel sorry for himself since he needed to move on. Lu looked at the grave under the tree and warned you that something like this could happen again. But the owner also pointed out that if the boy does not want someone else to die, then he should become stronger and then change his fate and the fate of all people in this world. Shan nodded but sank even more from what was said, and in order not to prolong this moment longer, Lu told the boy to get into the car. You opened the door and turned to the house to take a last look at the place where he grew up. The guy's imagination pictured two playing and cheerful boys. The guys told each other some interesting things and both laughed loudly and cheerfully. The boys turned towards the one who represented them, and if Shan simply looked with his sapphire eyes, then Chun smiled as always. The friends held hands and waved to those who looked at them warmly and with friendly smiles. He was ready to cry again, but he already cried all he could at the grave, and now all that was left was to capture this picture. The guy overcame himself and turned around to get into the car, although he didn't really see the point in this. You mentally said goodbye to his friend, telling him that they would definitely see each other again. While the guys were driving in the car, Shan recalled how he clearly felt that his body was occupied by someone else, and you himself could only helplessly watch what the strongest was doing. The young man again imagined those eyes before the doors closed and noted that the strongest was very similar to him, but had the most powerful strength that would terrify even the gifted. Sean sadly remembered his friend lying on the floor and blamed himself for the fact that if he had been in his place, Ah Chang's death would have been avoided. The guy felt uneasy because the thoughts in his head seemed to no longer be his. Yu brought himself to his senses by hitting his legs with his fists, pushing away the stupid thoughts in his head. The guys continued to move around the exile zone by car, heading to their destination. Various scum kept looking at the car every now and then, and before that they glanced slyly at each other. Sean asked Lu where they were going, and the owner answered briefly about the best place. Yu wanted to know what Ji meant, and his savior replied that he was looking for a building with a good view that would be a base for them. Lu smiled and sarcastically remarked to the guy that he needed to change his dirty rags, to which Yu sarcastically responded with gratitude, and the owner sharply braked. The guys stopped at an impressive building on which a ferocious bear was painted, and Lu ordered the boy to climb out. The guys at the entrance were met by armed guards in the form of 2 people, and asked what gang the uninvited guests were from, and Yu stood behind the owner and waved his hand at him, explaining that this was the Black Bear Gang. Lu was only amused by the young man's fears and worries, and he smiled brightly, while Sean mumbled about the fact that people call them black bears, and they are engaged in the resale of goods and management of the illegal production of prosthetics. He was still standing and quietly muttering something about the gang, but Ji turned to him and pointing his finger ordered the guy to wait for him here, and added that the boy's task was to protect himself. The blast waved through the guards far from the entrance, and the owner went on to clear the area. A bright purple light poured from the windows of the house, and lightning flashed, and Sean stood and watched this, realizing that Lu's plan was successful. The electrical discharges were so powerful that you heard the crackling and crunching of lightning, and realized that this would not end with just a bright light. The guy's suspicions were confirmed, and there was a loud explosion that blew out the windows. Like ants, the people of the Black Bear Gang rushed from the exit of the base, shouting to run away because there was a gifted person in the room. Yu barely managed to withstand this crowd and covered himself with his hands, coughing from the smoke. Ji came out and, standing at the door, waved to Sean to enter the new cleared home. The boy was shocked by how quickly and easily Lu managed, and completely trusting his savior followed him inside. People from the gang stood blackened in the soot and tried to catch their breath while discussing what had happened, and came to the conclusion that if that gifted one appeared here, then something important would happen, and they did not ignore the boy. It seemed suspicious to the men that the guy who stood behind the gifted one had a black collar, and one of the gang decided to first go to the boss and figure out what to do about it. At the entrance to the arena stood the jurisdiction of many people, as well as their van with the doors open behind them. The commissioners brought someone with them in this van with special handcuffs on their legs and ordered them to get out of the car. A girl with a black ring and handcuffs on her hands got out of the car and looked at one of the jurisdiction. The girl was led to the place in the arena where Lu slammed the guard into the wall when he left, and a man in a suit and with notes in his hands was already standing next to the body. The subordinate sank next to the body of the guard, and at the moment when she put her hands to the head of the dead man, a glow appeared. The poor thing was cowardly, but she didn't remove her hands until she did what they brought her here for. One of the men looked like the leader among everyone, and he asked the girl if she had seen the attacker, and the unfortunate woman staggered, almost falling, and answered that she had seen. The prisoner was shaking, and she was covered in sweat, and catching her breath, she began to tell details about the golden ring and purple hair, as well as a rare electrical superpower, and at the end she added that the man left with a boy who had a black ring. The leader found out everything he wanted and ordered the poor man to be sent back to the laboratory, which is what one of the men in uniform did, taking the girl by the hand. The girl could not take her eyes off the one whose thoughts she saw, but they told her not to hesitate and hurry up. It was not in vain that the subject looked in the direction of the guard, because he was already lying on the floor in a pool of blood. Representatives of the jurisdiction discussed outside that the young master of the Lu house was openly opposing the 8 main houses, but at the same time nothing was clear about the boy because there were no clues, and the decision was made to report everything to the authorities first. Sean walked along the road with uncertainty and fear, and everything around him was covered in blood. Ah Chun's prosthesis lay in front of the guy again, and he shouted from somewhere far away, asking Sean for help and salvation. Yu rushed to save his friend, although he did not understand where to run because everything around was red and blurred, and only the voice remained as a guide. Sean stopped because the silver one who killed Chun appeared in front of him, and in a vile afterlife voice he told the guy that he was trash. The silver one's face twisted in a terrible grimace and swam, and in an even more terrible voice, he said that Sean was trash who killed his own friend. Yu screamed and jumped up, greedily grabbing air and opening his eyes wide, and his body was covered in cold sweat. The guy, putting his hand to his face, realized that he had just seen a terrible nightmare, and from the side he heard a question from Lu whether the boy had woken up. Sean turned to where Ji's voice sounded, and seeing that he was watching TV, He asked why there was no sound, but Lu cynically asked whether it was really so incomprehensible because he was watching the news that talked about them. The owner picked up the remote control and pressed the volume button several times. The news presenter was just talking about the fact that the investigation into the attack of the holder of the ability in the arena was still ongoing and invited the audience to look at the scene of the incident. Sean indifferently looked out the window where it was dark and only some lights were on, which made him wonder how long he had been sleeping. Ji heard the boy's thoughts in the ear and said that it didn't matter how much he slept and could even continue to sleep for some more time because then he would have no time to sleep so well. You asked the question directly that those people about whom the owner spoke would soon come for him, and Lu replied that he really had no idea because the fastest time for their arrival was the next second and the slowest was a day or two. The savior asked the guy if he was afraid, and Sean didn't even know what to answer considering that he never thought that he would live in the exile zone for so long. The boy remembered very well how he tried his best to live until tomorrow and did not at all expect that it would come. At such a young age you realize that having a desire to live is both frightening and greedy, and remembering his friendship with Chun, he thought that despite all the darkness, there was a drop of good that made him want to live. Lu turned off the TV and looked at the boy, who was again lost in thought without answering the question of whether he was afraid. The owner deftly launched the remote control directly at the young man's head to bring him to his senses. But all of Yu's senses were so dulled that he didn't even groan from the blow but only rubbed his head and said that he perfectly understood Lu's strength, but he was worried about what they would do if the enemies attacked all at once. The boy embarrassedly added to his worries that he didn't want Ji to get hurt, and this surprised the owner. Lu broke into a sly grin and told the boy that no one said that only the owner was on his side, and now Yu was surprised. Meanwhile, Ji's phone showed a message about her and her boyfriend's coordinates in a temporary group chat, and 4 people saw it. The owner decided to express his thoughts out loud about the fact that he was interested in what choice the other 4 would make, namely whether they would keep the promise made 18 years ago to protect or abandon the boy to his fate, or whether they would even go over to the side of the Lin clan. Sean listened carefully to Lu, and although he didn't know who he was talking about, he clarified about the choice and whether Ji really wanted to say that those 4 were not allies. The owner's face showed despondency and disappointment as he plunged into past memories. Ji told the guy that at that time Mrs. Wu Yu was supported by 6 clans, and besides his Lu family, there were also Han and Zhou Su as well as Pei and He. And Lady Wu Yu always believed that division into castes increases the evil of the human heart. And on this basis, she wanted to create a society where espers and people without abilities could exist. Wu Yu came to the decision-making center with a request to demolish the wall, after which a lot of indignation flew in her direction that it was utter stupidity to live on the same land with low-ranking people, and those who supported Yu indicated that this was not a squabble for such outcries. The lady stood in front of the round table waiting for an answer from the main leader, and after some time Lin Shi asked the defenders of Yu who was the quarrelsome one here. Not wanting to lose power, the Lin clan started a war enlisting the support of families from outside, and Mrs. Wu Yu sensed the impending danger and gathered all the ancestors, who then saw baby Sean for the first time. That evening the woman sat by the fireplace holding her precious treasure with sapphire eyes in her hands. Mrs. Wu Yu understood that her request was too selfish and dangerous, but she begged the heads of the families not to forget about their purpose. Yu justified her request with the explanation that as soon as they make concessions, the owners of the powers will become a threat to the existence of this world, and after 18 years of oppression, the Esper's contemptuous attitude towards the people will become even more cruel than at the moment. The lady believed that the wall was the border of 2 completely different worlds, and this border was the result of connivance with the exorbitant growth of the Esper's power. Lady Yu gave each head of family the right to choose that evening, only begging their families to save her child in the impending war. The mother leaned close to her child and said that he would soon fall into a deep sleep, but immediately assured everyone that when he woke up he would definitely become the one who would restore order in this society. The baby, as if sensing his mother's anxiety, leaned against her and raised his arms to hug her. And after the failure in the first battle, the special ones began to increasingly strengthen control over the castes committing inhumane actions. It got to the point that Lady Wu Yu was captured by the Lin clan, and everything materially that reminded her of her was burned. The pantheon suffered colossal changes, and behind it the 8 great clans were replaced as the Lin clan defeated the alliance of Wu Yu supporters. Already in his memory, Ji knew that the Lin clan was watching their every move, so for 18 years the descendants of those who took on the important mission had to pretend that they did not know each other even when they encountered each other in public. Lu ended his story by recalling how they could not make contact because they could not allow the Lin clan to reveal the plan. Ji periodically glanced at the phone screen, as if trying to make sure that the message had been read. Lu thought about how 18 years have passed and how many people there really are left who remember the plan. The owner somehow even became depressed, realizing that perhaps no one would show up at all, and he would have to figure it out alone, and now Sean looked at him carefully and said that he had disappointed Ji. Lu confirmed the guy's fears and explained that he wanted to see a child from the deity's stories who would change the world, but in the end he met the most ordinary person and you wilted from what he heard. But Ji immediately said that despite the disappointment he does not regret that he came and surprised the boy. Sean smiled and got out of bed thanking Lu, to which the owner only silently accepted it. You went to the door of the warehouse saying that Ji was most likely hungry, so he decided to look for something to eat. Inside the warehouse there were a lot of food, drinks and water, but the guy went inside and did not go to the food but closed the door behind him and leaned on them. Sean slid down the door and sat on the floor with his hand to his head, feeling his weakness in front of everything that was to come. You sat with emptiness in his eyes and took his hand and ordered his body to stop shaking. The boy looked at his hand and his mother's words echoed in his head that when he awakens he will definitely become the one who will restore order in society. Sean remembered how he lived on the street from an early age, almost in a box, and fled for his life afraid of everyone and everything. I remembered how he almost lost his life while on the operating table where they wanted to disassemble him into organs and he ran away with an open wound. The guy's fresh wounds from the battles where he was thoroughly beaten up also made themselves felt. Even the fact that you saw how the bodies were thrown into the pit left a mark on his memory, and he seemed to be turning to his mother and admitted that he was not at all the child from her speeches who could save the world because he could not even protect himself. A silver bastard appeared before my eyes, humiliating you for crying over the death of a friend. And then nature took over and the guy realized that he was not going to put up with everything, and grabbing his clothes, he said to himself that although he doesn't know how many more espers will come for him, he doesn't have time to be afraid anymore. When Sean told himself that he needed to get ready, the floor under his feet shook as if during an earthquake. The young talent, as was typical for him, deftly dodged what he saw behind him. At the place where the guy was sitting, a stream of fire broke through the floor and hit the ceiling, turning into a pillar. Sean turned to the door with a silent question on his face, what the hell was going on and where the fire came from. Meanwhile, Lu, calmly smoking a cigarette on the sofa, announced into the air that Pei Xingho had appeared, and given the noise outside the door, he wondered if the girl had become an enemy. And the guy kept dodging the fire as if it were a ball that continually chased him across the room. You realized that the flame was definitely hunting him, but he didn't understand how this was possible, and he was surprised that someone had determined his location with such speed, even though the guy didn't even see the face of the attacker. Sean ran behind the shelf and wondered if this was a flame that could sense an aura. The boy crouched down and breathed heavily, watching the fire from behind the boxes. Before Yu's eyes, the flame split in two for greater efficiency and shocked the guy. Sean just thought that he urgently needed to go to Lu when an explosion occurred and the temporary shelter was destroyed. The flames burned the boy, driving him more and more into a dead end, both physically and mentally, which made you wonder if he could only rely on others. Sean came out of the shelter with his hand firmly grasping one side of the shelf, and with the thought that he was tired of constantly just running away, he overturned the cabinet onto the flames. The flame burst out from under the barrier, splitting into a bunch of tongues and flying up. The dancing lights burned towards the target standing in the middle of the room, and at that moment you decided that enough was enough. Sean concluded that the flame repeats his movements, so he needs to become invisible to him. The young man concentrated on hiding the aura, and then only a moment would be enough to find the source and catch the owner of the flame. Sean defying himself, and the flame looked forward and was ready not to attack or flee but to take the blow. The guy watched as fireballs approached him, and it would have scared anyone else and made him run. But you opened his eyes wide and remembered how a Chong taught him that by dodging it is impossible to win. Sean remained standing in place, not resisting the attack but completely accepting it. A huge explosion of flame burst out of the window, throwing sparks in different directions and rushing upward. Several sources of flame obediently returned to the owner, who was standing on the roof. The lights, like tamed wild animals, flew near the mistress, and she stood and realized that she no longer felt the guy. But behind her someone broke the silence with their landing, and the girl turned around. You landed on the roof covered in soot. Sweat was running down his face and his clothes and hair were burnt. Smoke emanated from the guy as if he were a pie that had just been taken out of the oven, and the girl standing in front of him carefully watched as he rose to his feet. Sean came to his senses only when he realized that he had not thought through his further actions, but it was too late because the guest came closer to him. The guy raised his head up and looked at the silhouette of the girl illuminated by the full moon. The mistress of the flame joyfully waved one of the sticks that was on her hair and said that the guy did a good job. Lu sat on the sofa all this time waiting for what would happen next without interfering in either the boy's fight with the fire or the acquaintance. But after the owner realized that everything was in order and the boy still managed to do a similar trick with the aura, a smile appeared on his face. One part of Yu's hair stood on end and was burnt, and he barely managed to smile at the fact that Sinho appreciated the maneuver he had performed. The young man could not rise to his full height because his legs did not support him at all, but he did not want to fall right in front of the guest because he had only just been recognized. When Yu began to lose strength and was leaning towards the floor, Lu arrived in time and grabbed the guy by the collar of his clothes. Sean was about to say thank you to his savior once again, but Ji hit the boy at a certain point on the neck. Yu passed out from Lu's precise point strike, and the owner turned to Zingo with a request to talk, and the girl agreed. The guy was lying on the sofa carefully covered with Ji's jacket, who explained to Sinho that extrasensory perception turned out to be just a quick reaction. Zingo ironically said that if such a crappy ability was inherited by Mrs. Wu Yu's child, then their future would definitely be filled with hope, and at the end she added that she would be returning home. Lu decided to convince the girl by explaining that when the boy resisted the surprise attack, he was able to briefly hide his aura in the fire when the flames consumed him, and then found the exact location of Shinho. The owner also added that even if someone else had dared, they would not have been able to do something like this, and Zingo again waved it off, saying that she had given in, and immediately asked why Lu had such a high opinion of the guy. He had seen something before her arrival. Ji thought and remembered how this weakest boy broke the silver one's neck with his own hand using telekinesis. Lu smiled slyly and answered the girl that before her arrival there was indeed something interesting, and when Sinho asked what exactly it was, she did not receive an answer. Instead of details about the guy, Ji turned his attention to the girl, and reminding the two that they had not seen each other for 16 years, noticed that the girl trained a lot. Sinho touched the scar on her neck with her fingers exactly the same as on Lu's face and replied that he too was not behind in training. The girl laughed, noticing that the man with the scar on his face would have said something about her and Lu had nothing to object to. Sinho looked out the window and noticed that dawn was soon, and it would be interesting to know who will appear next, who will be an enemy or an ally, and Lu decided to joke that the main thing is that whoever appears has a good tongue, and Sinho was a little enraged by such a hint. The bird that once flew to the guy's garage before you returned from the battle flew to a tree growing near the pantheon of the meeting hall of the 8 clans. Two men in formal raincoats looked out from the glass walls onto the street and discussed the fact that this meeting room had not been used for years, and then everyone showed up due to the fact that something serious might have happened. Another man looking at the building shared with his colleague that he still remembers the times of Lady Yu's reign, and that then this place radiated greatness because the best of all 8 clans were here, and now there are several monsters who are trying to pass themselves off as representatives of the clans. The first colleague asked to speak more quietly because the demons responsible for determining the location of the descendants of Yu are also espers and the walls have ears. The man was right about the wiretapping because at that moment 2 demons were watching them, and one of them said how he wanted to rip out the tongues of those talkers. The demon looked at the demoness standing next to her and asked whether she had such thoughts in her head or not. The demoness thought for a moment and later reminded her that she was annoyed by this and asked again threateningly if she hadn't talked about this. The demoness warned her colleague standing next to her that if he got into her head again he would lose his. The most important leader at the round table noticed the discussion between the demons and drew their attention to the need to return to the main issue. One of the demons looked rather warily at the others while they discussed the latest news. On the table screens and large screens on the wall there were photos of Lu and Shan, and the main leader announced that everyone present must have heard about Lu Jichuan because the results of the assessment of his abilities made a noise. One of the demons voiced that if we take into account only strength, then Lu is the only esper who is close to the divine rank, so I would not want to meet him face to face, and Demoness Xia looking at Yu's photo suggested sending half-bloods. Xia asked if they raised half-breeds like cattle not for such an occasion, and after that further looking at the photo, Shania said that it was such a pity because she so wanted to taste the child of God. Looking through the holograms further, Xia analyzed that Lu is not the only headache because there is also a defender, and in the photo was Pei Xingho. The photo of Zingo was taken just as she was heading to the coordinates for Lu and Shan. The demons began to be disturbed by such news, and this could be seen by the glances they exchanged and by their movements, but they still expected an answer from the chief. Lin ordered to send people to capture Shan Yu and bring him alive, and regarding Xingho, he gave the order to kill him. One of the demons reminded Lin what about the other 3 families that support you, and the head replied that they have not done anything yet. These creepy entities had all the information, and they began to look at each of the families, and one of them was the weapons master Su Yi, who disappeared 10 years ago, and since he did not leave any descendants behind him, there is nothing to be afraid of. The second person to come up for discussion was a gifted descendant of the Han family, whose name was Shu. But Han Shu is constantly confined to a hospital bed and definitely won't be able to fight that also disappears. And finally, as for Zhou Shi, after the last battle, the Zhou clan sent him to a monastery to improve and moved away from him, and accordingly he will need protection more than others. Lin instructed that his subordinates give the descendants of the families a warning that if they continue to hide they will remain alive, but if they decide to support Lu Jichuan then kill them all. The three demons disappeared, teleporting to where the three targets were located, that is the descendants and the remaining demons, and Lin remained. Demon, he noticed something behind him and turned around at the sound coming from the window. It was a bird that had already taken off and flown away from the conference hall. The bird flew to a mountainous area in which the forest densely embraced the monastery. The bird landed where a waterfall raged among the trees, and a man sat in the lotus position on a stone at the foot of the waterfall. It was the same Zhou Shi, and the bird that flew away from the pantheon landed on the guy's shoulder. The feathered assistant began to tweet what she learned into the ear of her owner, who listened attentively to her. She was surprised that the descendant of the Lu clan had already met with Shan Yu, and that Xingho was already on his way. The bird began to restlessly flap its wings and chirp louder, expressing its concern for its owner. Zhou Shi moved his assistant from his shoulder to his finger and looked at her carefully. She took his weapon and was about to leave, but before that he raised his hand in the air, helping the bird to take off and convinced it to fly, and he could handle it himself. At that moment, the head of one of the demons sent by Lin appeared right out of the water. The house of the Su clan, although huge, was quite discreet and was also located in the mountains, so there was often fog there. The rooms of the home were quite minimalist but spacious, indicating a love of scale. The house was practically part of nature, since in addition to the mountains on the very territory of the building there was a lot of greenery. The downside of this huge house was that there was silence everywhere because the owner was unwell. Demon Chun took over Su and had already entered the house to convey a warning from Mr. Lin. And Han Shu lay in the hospital and for a long time listened to the same cradle of the squeaking sounds of the life support machine. Wooden sticks sharp as knives moved close to the immobilized body. A demon had already arrived to Han Yu with sharp branches coming out from behind his back, ready to pierce anyone at any moment. Morning came and Shan woke up from strange sounds outside the window, which also attracted his allies. The guy jumped up from the sofa and ran to Lu and Sinho asking if there were enemies there, but the owner said that they were not enemies at all. Ji looked down, concluding that in the lands of the exiles everyone is so arrogant that they overestimate their strength, and with so many people they really want to take their lands from him. At the entrance of the base there were 2 vans, and in the yard itself there was a gang of 6 people, and the main one asked through a bullhorn if they could talk. Shan was very surprised to see Qin Tian below, who also wants to talk and not fight. Lu simultaneously shut the guy's mouth and moved him away from the window, answering the gang below that he had nothing to say to them. Qin smiled and said that he didn't want to talk to the owner at all, but to the pink-haired guy whom Ji had dragged away. The king of the ring added that this conversation was only between them with black collars, and then Yu was even more surprised. Sinho, standing next to Lu at the wall, advised him to moderate his disappointment, and when Ji asked if it was really so noticeable, the girl confirmed that it was very noticeable. The silence was broken by Lu's feigned evil laughter and his words that his hands were terribly itching, and he wanted to finally see his real enemies, and lightning crackled around him, and Shinho at that moment would really like someone to calm him down. In the room, Qin told the boy that he had not thought about such a quick meeting, but when he heard that the building was attacked by Esper, he immediately thought about Shang, and the guy immediately apologized, but Tian indicated that it didn't matter because he didn't come to fight for the land. Qin indicated that he was wondering why the special ones needed the guy, and Yu, looking away, said that if he explained, Qin wouldn't believe it. Meanwhile, each of the gang was doing his own thing on the street. One of the guys was indignant about why he could talk for so long because he was hungry, and the other was indignant in response that all he did was eat. The guy who played cards said that the boss doesn't worry about the people at all, driving Tian go back and forth between the lands of the exiled and the prefecture. Qin for himself once again repeated the boy's information that in short he is a descendant of Lady Wu Yu and he will have to confront the entire pantheon, and inquired about the guy's allies, only those 2 outside the door. Shan confirmed that these were his allies and could not understand how Qin knew his mother because he did not name his mother, and Tian asked a leading question: when was the day of the battle? Did you leave the lands of the exiled for the first time? And when the guy nodded, Qin explained that residents of other areas know the name of his mother, although all these years it was banned and could not be mentioned under any circumstances. Tian noted that the boy's frankness was amazing because they had met only once, and the king of the ring said that he could go out the door now and reveal the location of the divine child to those who were hunting for him, and asked if he was afraid. Shan replied that Qin would not do such a thing because his intuition tells him that he can be trusted, and Tian clearly grimaced in bewilderment because Shan asked not to look at him like that because his intuition is quite accurate. Qin sarcastically asked if the guy's intuition really was like that, and in his head, he thought that in just 2 days the boy's look had changed so much. The King of the Ring decided to give you a return gift for his honesty in the form of a lead that concerns his mother. Tian said that 20 years ago he got a job in the prefecture in the form of building a building. The important point was that the location and purpose of the object were classified so Qing, and the other guys were ordered not to remove the blindfolds until they arrived at the site. Tian, after some time, concluded that they were most likely building something like a prison. One day, while carrying materials for construction to the right place, Qin passed by doors that were not completely closed. Tian saw only one capsule in the huge hall and realized that the prison was intended for only one person. At some point, 3 men walked towards Tian, but not the workers who brought them here. The person walking in front, and most likely the main person, had a golden ring, and he turned to the 2 people behind it that everything needed to be finished as soon as possible. The workers shouted to the builders, among whom was Qin, to bow their heads and not stare around, but he still heard the chief say that they needed to finish with the cage for God. The king finished the story and voiced his thoughts that Shan's mother might still be locked in that prison, and he warned the guy that this was just his guess, but if it was true, then Mrs. Wu Yu was still alive. And in the house of the Su clan at that very moment, the demon was prowling around trying to find someone, but there was emptiness everywhere. The demon walked from room to room, but did not find anyone, and came to the conclusion that he did not sense anyone alive here. Like a ghost moving through the walls, the demon seemed to find himself in a shelter under a house or laboratory, but even then, not finding anyone, he decided that he could return. But Esper's attention was attracted by a closed door behind which he felt some weak energy. The demon leaked through the door and was surprised by what he found there. A picture appeared before Esper's gaze that he had never expected to see, which made him laugh, and he told himself that this could not happen. The demon looked at something similar to a person but completely robotic and with a bunch of connected wires, which led to even greater misunderstanding because the Su clan had no descendants left. Most likely reacting to the movement and sound, the robot's unusually beautiful pink eyes opened and Esper realized that he had woken him up. The machine started the process of updating data, which so far was 20%, so looking at the demon, the object was not yet identified. Esper continued to stand in front of the robot and analyze out loud that he was without a collar, and therefore they did not know about his existence, and began to ask questions about who this guy is and how he is connected with Suyi. The demon stared at the robot and indignantly asked if he was deaf, but the data update showed another 70%. The update completion signal sounded, and the machine's eyes showed 100%. Esper, not expecting absolutely any turn of events, continued looking at the robot with a silent question. The car remained motionless and looked at the demon in the same way as he looked at him, but at the same time the robot voiced 2 words to Chen Yen. Esper was not ready for this and was shocked by what the machine said when it saw him for the first time. The demon was angry and at the same time frightened by this situation, and he was already in an attack position, asking how the robot knew his name. The Esper used teleportation to get behind the machine and take it by surprise, shouting at him to answer the question. But the robot only turned, pointing his hand at the demon and firing from there a beam of the same color as his eyes. Chun was thrown back by the shock wave and blinded, and all he could do was save himself by teleporting again. In the place where the demon had just been, there was only a trail of smoke from the impact. All wires were disconnected from the robot, considering it to be in full combat readiness. Chun sat against the wall and covered the wound from which blood was oozing, and in his head there was only the thought of how this was possible. The demon realized that the directed shock wave emanating from the palm was the ability of the deceased Esper Luo Xingguang. Chun stood up but could barely walk, but he understood that something was wrong here, and they had completely different information, so he urgently needed to report to the others because Wu Yu's minions were not so simple. A bright pink fog appeared behind the demon, and the one who was usually feared was now terrified. Chun understood that the matter was rubbish and tried to leave as quickly as possible, but it was already too late, and the robot standing close to the demon held his hand behind his back. Lin's henchman finally only managed to say the word no, looking somewhere ahead, realizing that this was the end. A powerful beam of light was activated from the robot's hand, which was accompanied by the demon's scream. She was also visited by a demonic guest who appeared before him straight from the water. The demoness, using her power, lifted a large amount of water into the air, and using it as a weapon launched it at Esper C, screaming for him to die. She remained level and just waited for the water to come close enough. The Esper put his hand in front of him and without saying a single word stopped the huge drops of water. The water lost the color of the demon's power and became as transparent as always, and she began to control it with ease. With his hand, the guy swirled the water into a beautiful whirlwind that flew up like birds. The demoness decided that she would calmly defeat the one who makes birds out of water, so she hurried to attack Zhou, but despite his careless appearance, as a monk he repelled blow after blow without giving the enemy a break. The decisive blow was Shi's last blow with which he launched the demoness body high into the sky. And while the body was flying in the air, Zhou himself deftly moved through the water straight to where it should fall. The demoness fell with terrible force onto the stone surface so that blood clots flew out of her mouth. But she had already arrived at the enemy from above, holding his weapon at the ready to finish what he started. And holding his head with a scabbard, Zhou placed a sword in front of them like a guillotine to cut off the head. The demoness, choking on blood, tried to find out what ability the descendant of the Zhou clan used. The guy looked carefully at the enemy and replied that he never uses Esper's abilities in battles with weaklings. In the monastery, a huge statue of Buddha was entwined with tails of incense smoke that were used for meditation. The monks sat like carbon copies facing the divine in long rows, and some of them prayed and some held singing bowls in their hands. The students' voices merged into a single stream, creating a powerful vibration wave. One of the prayers and teachings was that an unsullied heart like pure water reflects everything without distortion, but a heart absorbed by worldly passions like muddy water cannot comprehend the true nature of reality, the body of the Buddha Dharma. The water washed not only the young man Shi but also his sword from the dirty blood of the enemy who wanted death in the name of power. Zhou Shi stood over the dead body of the demon on the stone where he had originally meditated, and the water near the stone was colored with blood and carried it further downstream. If she had already dealt with the uninvited guest, then Han Shu was still in danger because he was vulnerable. The demon decided to check whether the young man's body was really immobilized and raised his hand with its wooden tentacles. Squeezing Han Shu's hand, Lin's henchman concluded that the intelligence was right and the guy was no more dangerous than an ordinary corpse. The demon lifted the descendant's golden ring with one of the branches and looked attentively. The demon made a cut on Shu's hand and found it rather pitiful that such a talented awakened one had to lie in a hospital bed forever. Thin streams of blood flowed down the young man's arm from the wound and drops fell onto the floor. The demon took advantage of the wound it made and by attaching one of its appendages to the arm began to absorb blood. As expected from a special rank, the demon was flooded with memories from what he had absorbed along with the blood. Some sounds were heard behind Lin's henchman, and as he stood with his head thrown back tasting blood, he looked back. From the hands of the one who entered Shu's room, a box of apples fell onto the floor. A sweet little girl with a large white bow on her long golden hair screamed for the demon to quickly move away from her brother. The enemy was so indifferent to the child that he remained standing and, moreover, had the audacity to answer that he did not want to leave. The baby did not stand on ceremony and, rising into the air, grabbed the wooden branches of the demon with both hands, which he did not expect at all. The girl made a throw and threw the uninvited guest across the room right out the window. The young talent immediately ran to his brother to check if he was safe. But she didn't have long to stay near her brother, and one of the tentacles pierced the baby's shoulder. The demon repeated what the girl did to him and, holding her with a shoot stuck in his shoulder, hit him against the wall. The enemy mocked the girl, calling her a careless little sister, and pulled out a tentacle from her shoulder, causing the little girl to collapse to the floor, covering the wound that was bleeding with her hand. The demon twisted Shu's body and jumped out through the already broken window, not paying attention to his sister's screams. Although the girl was wounded, she deftly jumped over the balcony fence in a hurry to save her brother. The little girl shouted to the villain to stop and landed on the ground with such power that it cracked, and the enemy actually stopped, but not because of the girl's threats, but because they were already waiting for him. The Han family, led by their mother, met the venerable ghost, and Mrs. Han still warmly addressed the demon that he should have warned him in advance about the visit, and they would have prepared a reception. Lady Han smiled sweetly at the uninvited guest and said that she just didn't understand why everything was so complicated. The ghost felt that all this mercy was feigned, and his interest in the mistress's further actions only warmed up. Lin's henchmen indicated that they knew that the Han family was still loyal to the Wu Yu family, and at that moment everyone who stood behind Lady Han was ready to attack, but she, being even further, showed them with a hand gesture to stop and listen further to the demon. The enemy continued to explain that perhaps the Han family knew what stupidity Lu Chuan had done, and he came here to warn the family not to poke their nose into something that was not their business, and then they would remain alive and they would capture the heir of Wu Yu at any cost, and tied Shu more tightly. The color of Mrs. Han's eyes changed to a more pronounced one, and she made it clear to the bastard that she did not care about other people's offspring, after which, for the time being, she politely asked to let her son go. The demon, twisting Shu's body more tightly, raised it higher and mocked whether Lady Han really meant this lifeless thing. And if the family stood in anticipation that everything would be decided by conversation, then the ghost, according to its nature, committed a dirty trick and said that if the lady values her son so much, then let him catch him, and Shu threw him like a toy into the air. The little sister sat on the cracked ground after the jump and all the time watched what the adults were doing. But But then little Lee reacted to her mother's cry and understood everything without any other words. The sister activated her power and rose into the air in flight, catching the body of her brother. The demon took advantage of the fact that everyone was distracted by Shu and teleported away, satisfied with the work done. Madame Han, without turning around, explained to everyone that there was no point in chasing the ghost, but that it was better to take Shu back to the ward. Lee sat on the ground and held her brother in her arms, but she was told that her wounds also needed to be treated, but her daughter, without raising her head, asked if her mother was serious when she said that she didn't care about other people's children and that their family would really sit idly by. Having not received an answer, the girl in her hearts told her mother the words of her brother, that he always spoke about the power that is given to the awakened to change the world for the better, and although Lee did not understand much, she saw that their world was getting worse. The girl could not understand why her mother was so polite to the impudent man even after he so carelessly grabbed her brother, but Mrs. Han remained silent. One of the assistants turned to the young mistress with a request to return inside because even the walls have ears, but the little girl could not understand why her mother was silent. Faced with silence in response to her misunderstanding, Lee leaned closer to her brother and answered for herself that she still understood one thing. Tears welled up in the little girl's eyes, and she realized that she herself would fulfill the will of her older brother. Mrs. Han nevertheless approached her daughter and restrainedly reported that Lee had made 2 mistakes at once during the battle. While the girl rose from her knees, the mistress looked at the broken window and explained that the first mistake was when Lee did not make sure that the enemy was dead, thereby giving him a chance to injure himself. The second mistake is that realizing that a loved one needed help, the young lady hesitated before making the right decision, and Lee asked whether it was really that important. Mrs. Han was no longer looking somewhere but at her daughter, and to the girl's question about the importance of mistakes, the mother replied that it was not important, and that was just her answer. Meanwhile, at the base where Yu was staying, the guy and Chin continued their dialogue. Shan asked Tian to describe the place in more detail, and he asked if the guy meant a divine rank chamber, to which he received an affirmative answer. Chin made a thoughtful look on his face and began to explain that the place looked like a cage around which there were pillars, and in the middle there was a capsule under which there was something similar to a pool. Tian also pointed out that the liquid in the pool was like lava, and that he still remembers that sharp, sickening smell, after which he drew attention to the guy who sat with his head down looking at the floor and did not even respond to his name. Indeed, at that moment in Chin's story, Shan was looking at the floor and imagining how there was lava under his feet, and the fighter's words were flying in his head and echoing. Yu did not understand what had happened, and this made him feel even more uncomfortable, and his heart was terribly pounding. At some point, his mother appeared in front of the young man and asked in an eerie voice whether Shan was capable of doing something alone. Yu called his mother, but she sat down on the chair opposite, smiled, and asked to give her his body. The guy at that moment gave way to ferocity and realized that this was not his own mother. In a completely different voice, the deceitful face of the mother replied that the boy had guessed right, and the image began to disintegrate even more. Instead of Mrs. Wu, a guy with different eyes appeared who once inhabited the body, and now, pointing a gun at a weak version of himself, introduced himself to the boy as Shanyu. The strong version, without hesitation and without saying anything else, shot the weak one in the head. Chin jumped up from his seat and looked at the guy who was lying with his head thrown back but did not react to the fighter's cries. Tian ran out into the corridor and called Zingo and Lu, saying that something was wrong with the boy. Sinho grabbed the boy by the shoulders and began to shake him, but the sight was so pitiful that his head might just fall off. Shan looked ahead with his eyes wide open, but he saw not Zingo but a strong version of himself. While both versions were conducting a dialogue, nothing helped the boy wake up from this bad dream in reality. Both versions again stood at the door that apparently led to the mind. The stronger one held the weak one tightly by the hand and continued to tell the guy to give him the power of the body. Shan felt this terrible power, which is why he could not move his body, as if he was chained. The strongest leaned towards his weaker version and asked if the guy had forgotten that he himself had called him. Shan raised his head to the strongest, and he continued to say that when Ah-Chong was killed and the guy turned out to be so pitiful that he could not do anything to the enemy, then Strong you replaced that frightened kitten. The Strong extended his hand forward and argued that only he could win the upcoming war, and then asked Shan to give up this body and the strongest would complete their mission. Yu resisted the power of the other but realized that his power eclipsed everything he had ever seen, and it was like a deity. The strongest, like a mirror, approached Shan's face and asked the guy to simply say that he was giving him his body, but Yu resisted, and then the deity again called the young man a coward. Other Yu let go of the hand of his weak version because sounds similar to voices began to be heard from behind the doors, and he, being dissatisfied with this, said that someone was always interfering in their conversation. Shan was returning to his place, but everything was swimming in his eyes, and the voices of the owners and Chin were muffled, and Lu, releasing sparks from his hands, joked about Zingo that his electricity turned out to be much more effective than her fire, and the girl was worried that the guy's brains would not turn into mush from the discharges. Qin also wondered if the guy was okay and if he could hear them, but against the background of the voices of living people you heard the last phrase of the strongest version, which said that they would meet again, and this made him scream loudly. And along with the cry, Sean grabbed the first hand that came his way in order to also grab hold of reality. You breathed heavily while continuing to hold Lu's hand, which plunged everyone into shock and misunderstanding. The boy raised his head, looking at the owner with his sapphire eyes, and addressed him by name. Lu reacted and asked what happened, but before that he muttered that it was Sinho's idea to shock the guy, and the girl, having heard this, had already prepared one of her sticks, asking if she had not received blows for a long time. Sean, still holding Lu by the hand, shouted out a request to him to fight with him. Ji said out loud that he definitely went too far with the tension, while Zingo, trying to find out if the boy had a fever, put one hand on his forehead and the other on him, but you replied that he was fine. The young man explained his strange request by saying that he needed his awakened power, and the only way to get it was through battle. Sean looked at the owner with all determination, and Zingo and Lu looked at each other, realizing that this could end badly. The guys went to the corner of the room and leaned against each other, barely holding back their laughter, and Sinho, covering her mouth, said that the guy was cutely naive, and Lu said that his request was even a little insulting. The owner, standing in the corner, whispered that training would be useful for the boy, but Sinho immediately threatened Lu to save energy, from which he laughed and said that there would be no need to strain himself because he was a weakling, and you replied that in fact he could hear them. Qin turned to the guys with the news that he knew a suitable place for sparring. Everyone arrived at the huge port base, and compared to the containers that stood there, the people were like ants. Sinho was not particularly happy about this idea, but on some side, having her own strength, she understood what he was asking for. No matter how strong and cruel the girl was, she was worried about the boy and asked him to try not to die, but Sean in turn replied that this is exactly what he needs, because only when he is on the verge of death will he get what he needs. Yu was determined, saying that he had to become stronger for so many reasons. The fighters stood opposite each other, and Sinho, watching this, thought that it seemed she had made the right decision when she decided to support the divine child. Lu, as always, stood in his relaxed manner and looked at his ward, but Sean had already taken a defensive position. You had already analyzed where Ji would attack from and whether he would do it at a distance or go into close combat, and calming himself, the guy set himself up to focus and follow the movements of the owner. Lu laughed because he found it amusing to watch the boy's seriousness. And while Sean was thinking through battle tactics, Ji had already prepared an unexpected turn of events, offering to give this place a more presentable appearance, and used his power. A dome of honeycombs began to form above the fighters, causing the guy to even lower his hands while looking up. The dome closed like a huge lid, raising dust and a wave of wind, which made Sinho worry even more. The girl, knowing full well that the outcome could be fatal because Lu's strength is great against the still weak guy, ran to the dome. But the dome was created using Ji's electrical power, so Zingo was thrown back. The owner looked at the dome, and all she thought about then was Sean. The fighters looked at each other carefully, and there was no hint of fear on Shan's face. Lu extended his hand charged with energy forward and asked the boy to watch carefully because he would show him who the real awakened one was, and before the fight he asked if he was ready to shed some blood. Sean grouped himself even more and silently made it clear that he was ready for battle. The guy wanted to use his ability to quickly move, but did not at all expect what happened. Lu appeared next to him with such speed that Yu's hair flew back from the gust of wind. All Sean managed to do before attacking the owner was to ask himself in his head how Ji did it. Not sparing the guy, Chuan slammed him into the asphalt with a powerful and charged blow. Yu lay blackened and sparks were still emanating from him, and in his head there was only an understanding of how fast Lu was. After all, it was impossible to even see any movements. The young man reached the point where he was almost dead to meet his strongest version. Before Sean plunged into himself, he saw Ji walking towards him, and he thought that the owner was still using only one hand. Chuan broke into a sly smile and asked the boy to try harder because they were just warming up. Sinho's flames raged outside in an attempt to open the dome, but to no avail. Qin, observing everything, noticed that throughout his life he had seen a lot of awakened ones, but he had never met anyone like Lu. Chuan and Zingo, exhausted, agreed with the fighter. The girl also confirmed Qin's words and said that at this time there is no one who is closer to the divine rank than Lu Chuan. Zingo plunged into memories of how she saw Lu 16 years ago at the day of assessment of the awakened ones. Chuan was in a special cell number 97, and even though the room was closed, sparks of his power went beyond the security door. The people who were nearby at that moment experienced terrifying pressure and could not believe that the power of the awakened could be so powerful. The board above the camera was supposed to calculate how close Lu Chuan's strength was to rank. The system could not specifically determine Lu's strength, so the image showed an eye with the same color as Lady Wu Yu's ring. Little Shinho stood with the others and watched what the system would show while people angrily shouted that this couldn't happen. And for unknown reasons, the system nevertheless highlighted the golden rank of the awakened, to which people were now whispering indignantly that they had said that this would happen. The cell door rose and clouds of smoke were the first to emerge from there, and the room itself was black with soot. Compared to the place outside where everyone else was, the cell was pitch black. The room was illuminated only by a boy who came out glowing with a violet flame and sparks of the same color. People applauded the young talent, but not because of his high rank but more out of fear. Zingo then looked at Lu and was truly amazed by his abilities. Those accompanying the young lady said that now it was her turn to show what she was capable of. Sinho then entered the cell with only one thought, that she would never lose to that boy. The girl was brought back from her memories by the touch of her scar on her neck and the silver ring, as well as Qin's question about what happened. She was gifted since childhood. The question was rhetorical, and Tian concluded that since Lu is so strong, Shan has no chance of survival. The girl explained that she wasn't worried about you, and the real reason was that the enemies could attack at any moment, so they need to be alert to hold their position, because if they appear before the end of the guy's battle, the consequences could be dire. Qin told Zingo that they can rely on him since he will guard the entrance, and if anything happens he will inform them immediately. After what was said, the girl asked why the fighter was helping them. Tian gave a completely reasonable answer, that at the moment there are a large number of exiles awakened in the zone who are interested in the divine child, and this only means that the guy is important to such an extent that he is able to change this world. The King of the Ring finally added that all of them are black rings, including him, who are eager for this world to change, even if it means sweating on the boy's side. Without turning around, Qin said that he would let you know if something happened. Shan was lying on the ground trying to get up, but his strength was leaving him, and before the meeting he thought that he was very grateful to the gods for having Lu Chuan on their side. Another moment and you felt like he was sinking, and his body was becoming even softer and his eyes were closing. And the strongest appears right above him with the words that the guy already understands everything himself, that without his help Shan is useless. You looked into those black bottomless eyes and realized that he was disgusted to be in the presence of the other, because he was not talking about trust but rather about something all-consumingly terrible. The strongest leaned towards Yu's ear and like a snake continued to say that he knew perfectly well what the guy was thinking about. It was as if the devil on his shoulder was convincing the guy of his supposedly false thoughts, that he was tired of being a weakling, and that he longed for strength that could overcome even Lu. The little imp stood in front of Shan and said to beg him for help, and continued to call the young man a pathetic coward who is not able to face reality, arguing that there is no point in resisting. It was a pure voice of fear driving him into a dead end, repeating that isn't the guy afraid of what all those awakened ones will do if they grab him. Shan did not answer anything, and the other only added even more doubts, saying that fate is worse than death, and cited the example of a mother in captivity trying to put pressure on the patient. The strongest pointing out that there were still countless rows of monsters drinking blood. You once again tried to persuade the guy to surrender and give him the body, reinforcing this with the fact that he would erase every single one and no one would escape his punishment. And Shan caught the most important thing from all this. The other said that he would erase every single one, which confirmed the guy's fears that the force was destructive. You finally entered into a dialogue and told the strongest that they were completely different, asking again if he had forgotten what he had once said. The guy thought back to that day when the streets were illuminated due to loud and bright explosions. At a time when in one part of the city a fire was burning above the houses, garlands were hanging in a small courtyard and people were dancing around the fire. The people were dressed in white robes with a black cross painted on them and weapons hung behind their backs. This whole spectacle was observed by two boys who were still alive. The guys were sitting away from the dancing crowd and were clearly not happy to be here, and Ah-chun looked carefully in the direction where one man was giving bread to another. A gray-haired man came up to give bread to the boys, and when Shan had already extended his hand, Chun stopped him and asked his grandfather what he would eat then. The old man patted the guys by the hair and told them not to worry about him because he was already quite old to eat a lot, and the guys would be able to repay him as soon as they got back on their feet. Ah-chun thanked his grandfather, and you looked at his friend, not understanding what was happening. Not knowing much yet, Shan asked an older and smarter friend maybe they should stay here, to which Chun replied no way. You asked why they couldn't stay because it was so cozy here, and Chun asked his friend to listen better. Chun focused not on music or dancing but on other sounds in the form of endless screams. No matter how nice these people may seem at first glance, they were cruel because they also had to survive. Not everyone was allowed inside, separating families as they pleased, mostly letting women and children through. Shan looked at the beautiful picture, which with every word from his friend in the background became more and more distorted because Chun explained that this place and all these people are even worse than bandits, and if they stay here they will become the same. Chun finished chewing his bread, telling his friend that he didn't want to grow up like them. Then Yu, turning to the people in white cloaks, said that this world is rotting because of the cruelty of the awakened ones. Chun diluted the seriousness of his friend by laughing and saying that unfortunately he himself was a kind of awakened one, and raised a piece of bread a couple of centimeters above his hand, to which he replied that Chun was completely different from those awakened ones. Chun looked up and asked Chun what if there was a completely different world in which there was not a single awakened person, and then asked if his friend thought that in such a world there would be much fewer scoundrels, to which Chun replied that this was impossible. Chun also pointed out Yu's words about the impossibility of another world about the bread that his friend was holding in his hand, that before everyone received their fair share, and now that everything belongs to the awakened ones they eat their food as charity. And Chun took advantage of the fact that his friend was thoughtful, and saying that it was unlikely that the awakened ones thought that anyone would accept their charity. With such statements he reached for a piece of you. Shan cried out that he wanted to save a piece of bread for later, but Chun, already stuffing food into his mouth, warned that there was no point in sitting with his mouth open. The guys sat and watched a more terrible picture than what was outside the gate, and so Chun said that it was time for them to return to their reality. Having finished with the memories, you noticed that in the area of his heart the same sapphire glow appeared as his eyes, and he told the strongest that he would not receive this body. This was the guy's final decision, and it shattered the veil that the other had laid over his eyes and ears. Changes inside led to changes outside, and at that moment when everything inside you shattered, then outside it was as if something that had been holding him in chains for a long time came out of him, and Lu saw it. The guy stood up glowing with sapphire light and addressed the owner by name. Shan raised his head with a completely different look and eye color and told Ji that he could still fight. Lu was incredibly pleased that everything was finally becoming more interesting, and while the guys were warming up, the gates to the zone of jurisdiction rose to release the half-breeds from there. The very enemies that Shinho feared had already entered the exile zone, inhaling the dirty air and reporting that everything was like the good old days. 6 guys in suits confidently went to fulfill the mission that was intended for them. A truck was driving along a winding mountain road, and one of the drivers reported by phone that they had taken the bodies. The worker reported that the injuries of the 2 ghosts they were transporting indicate that everything was much worse than expected. In the cargo area, 2 wounded ghosts lay on couches, and the worker reported that they found almost no traces of the attacker, but made the assumption that the one they were looking for headed to the exile zone. A voice on the other side said that the one who was able to hide would not go far because hybrids had already been sent after him. Fog covered the walls connecting 2 different zones, but this was not an obstacle to opening the gate. 1 girl out of 6 hybrids began to be indignant that the gates were opening too slowly, and the guy standing next to her asked to keep quiet because she was disgracing them, and another young man whom the boy was holding onto was just talking to the chief that they would intercept those they needed. The workers accompanying the prisoners were wearing special glasses, and one of them thought that he did not remember that the jurisdiction had a separate area for containing black rings. The most impatient girl of all abruptly moved from her place towards the guards. At one point, a razor-sharp sword appeared at the man's throat, and the girl asked what the guard was staring at, and out of fear, he began to stutter and ask for forgiveness. The cutie flashed her bright eyes looking straight at the guard's glasses. The equipment on the man's face began to go crazy and glow so brightly that the worker at some point lost his vigilance. And after the bright colors, the glasses exploded right on the guy's face, and he screamed in terrible pain. The girl stood and kicked the worker, asking if he had seen enough, and threateningly told him to look again, and while she was angry, another worker pointed a gun at her, but he could not shoot. The evil one turned to finish off the other worker, but she was stopped in time by one of the hybrids who ended the conversation with the chief. The guy told the girl named Thea to stop fooling around because it was time for them to get to work, because plans had changed and they needed to split up so that 2 of their group would go to intercept the awakened special rank before he came to the exile zone. The one who looked the coolest and stood in front of everyone asked who these 2 would be. Thea responded, and turning around was already running to complete the task, and the friend who told her to keep quiet also volunteered, and another young lady, who was older side, nostalgically noting the enthusiasm of the guys and remembering her youth. The guy and the girl separated from the main group and set off to meet the guests, while the rest went to those who were already in the zone. The city was noisy like a huge living colony, and in the midst of all this, someone who was accustomed to completely different sounds arrived. Moving softly and deftly like water Zhou, she appeared in the jurisdiction zone. Despite the stone iron jungle, she moved around the city with ease. The guy was extremely focused on reaching his destination. In one of the buildings that she passed, workers in overalls were busy creating circuit boards. Zhou stopped near this building because he felt threatened. The owner's sword was always ready to defend or attack. At the moment when she felt something suspicious, he was on the roof of the building. For now, only the train could distract attention, but the guy felt that somewhere nearby they were already waiting for him. It was not without reason that Zhou felt that something was wrong, because on the roof of the house where he was inside there was his enemy, who was muttering under his breath that he was not an idiot to fight openly because he had just gotten out of prison, so he will be here and he just needs to detain Guy. The chalk drawing on the floor was almost ready, and it was a labyrinth with a little man drawn inside. The hybrid completed the finishing touches, and looking at his creation realized that it was ready. All that remained was to revive the drawing, which is what this craftsman did, which is why the lines on the floor began to glow. And from the outside it manifested itself so that instead of the usual walls of the labyrinth, houses rose high up. It didn't matter whether the houses were low or high because they all fulfilled the task that the guy came up with for himself. Since she did not yet understand what was going on, he only watched what was happening and felt movement under his feet. The factory workers stopped and began asking each other if they had all felt some movement under their feet. One of the workers shouted that this was not an earthquake because he saw the buildings moving and everyone who could rush to the exit. The buildings really grew like mushrooms after rain, obediently fulfilling the task of their master. Behind she trains fell and more houses appeared, and he tried to see the direction in which he could go. And every time Zhou looked in the direction where the house was not yet there, and he could run, an obstacle would definitely appear there. Panic and lack of understanding of what to do were not about this trained and disciplined man, so he just waited. The last building reached its height and blocked the possibility of getting out. She found himself driven into a dead end like the little man in the picture, looking up at a small piece of the sky towards which the birds flew up. The monk realized that they had decided to drive him into a trap, and activating his power, he said that he did not have time to play hide and seek. C climbed up with deft leaps to get out of the trap. And now the monk had the opportunity to escape from the trap, but another owner was watching him. The guy drew chalk along the floor, drawing another line, and thought to himself that Zhou would not get out. She was just making a jump when another obstacle appeared in front of him in the form of a house. Zhou was not one to give up and continued to climb to where there was still an opportunity to get out. As soon as the guy wanted to grab the wall of the house to jump higher, the building disappeared. The monk grabbed his head and began to go down and landed back where he started his attempts. Standing on that very roof, she realized that he had returned to his starting point and was again looking at a piece of the sky. It seemed as if there was even less space, and even if the walls simply stood still, they still looked oppressive. Another guest flew over the bridge and was supposed to intercept they. The robot had the ability to get anywhere in the world using jet propulsion. But the machine's processor displayed a warning about a malfunction of the energy core, and an emergency landing was recommended. The jet thrust began to weaken, and it was clear that this was Thea's doing. The robot froze in place and looked down carefully, trying to detect an obstacle. The mechanism found a very nice girl on the bridge who waved greetings to him. Thea smiled very friendly, but her image became worse and more distorted. And when the girl told the robot to go down, he, not expecting this, actually began to descend lower and lower towards the bridge. Chin had already called Zingo and warned him about the arrival of the guests, and the girl thanked him and told him to find somewhere to hide, warning that there was no point in returning and that she would be fine. The girl finished the conversation, and one of the sticks had already begun to slide down her hair, trying to fall into the hands of the mistress. Sinho pulled out her assistant and said that she was so annoyed when people looked down on her. The owner turned to the containers and loudly declared to those who were on them that she was addressing them specifically. The remaining 4 hybrids carefully watched the equally strong rival. Sinho smiled and kindly asked the guests who would like to die first. Since the hybrids had not yet taken any action, the girl again asked them if they really wanted to attack all at once, because it didn't make much difference to her, to which one of the uninvited guests said that the words were too loud. Sinho was not very happy that she had to stall for time until the guys finished their battle under the dome. The girl understood that even if Shan managed to awaken her power, it would most likely be telepathic abilities, which was the weakness of such awakened ones. Sinho did not count on other descendants of the clans, so she concluded that when it was necessary to fight, she and Chuan would figure everything out. The coolest of the hybrids told the others that he had not been here for quite a long time, and the place looked even more terrible than last time, and the girl asked not to think of this hole as a place full of warm memories. While the 4 were chatting among themselves, Sinho noted for herself the important point that all hybrids have black collars. The girl remembered everything her father told her and realized that he was right. Sinho plunged her thoughts into childhood memories 14 years ago, when she returned from training in the evening with a result of 98 wins and 2 losses. The girl was heading to her room but noticed that a light was burning under the doors that led to her father's office. The little girl knocked, telling her dad that it was her, and the father asked his daughter to come into the room. The father was sitting at the table with a bunch of papers, but despite being busy, he asked his daughter not to exhaust herself so much with training because the body was still growing, and asked to find a balance, to which the young lady said that since she was so young she would recover quickly. The girl made tea for Dad, saying that he shouldn't stay up late because he didn't want his father to die early, and Mr. Pei was amused by the fact that his daughter was sharp-tongued as always, and Zingo was worried that his father had not drunk tea while it was hot. Mr. Pei, like a mischievous child, reluctantly agreed to drink freshly brewed tea, but Zingo did not bring the mug into her hands because she saw important papers on her father's desk. In some table, the girl was attracted by the already familiar name of one of the great families, and it was Lu. The gentleman drank tea looking at his daughter, while the little girl looked at the papers and quietly wondered where Mrs. Wu Yu was hidden, and she felt very sad that the search had taken so long. The father repeated his daughter's question where the lady could really be and expressed his great desire to find out about this too, since if he found her, Mr. Pei would be able to more often carefree communicate with his daughter and drink hot tea. Sighing heavily, the father replied that the price of such happiness as his and his daughter's time together is the freedom of Mrs. Wu Yu. Mr. Pei showed his daughter a frame from CCTV cameras asking if she recognized the logo on the trucks, and Zingo, knowing quite a lot, immediately answered that these were special trucks from the Heavenly City, but noted that the video was filmed in the exile zone. The father confirmed his daughter's words about the location of the trucks and that the recording was indeed made in the exile zone. Mr. Pei bent over the papers, thinking out loud about the fact that recently 8 families have become more active and are constantly catching children with black rings. Looking at the reports and observations, the father told Shinho that in just 2 weeks more than 1,000 awakened ones were captured. Shinho was horrified by this figure and asked the most important thing from her father what they were going to do with these children. The head of the Pei family answered his daughter that after analyzing many different options, they all led to only one conclusion. The captured children were raised in a special way in order to destroy potential enemies of the 8 families. The most pompous of the hybrids mockingly said that it was time for them to stop ignoring their enemy, thereby hinting that it was time to start fighting. To which another guy from their group, kicking the cool one, clarified that he wasn't the first to decide to evade the main topic. The serious guy with whom the chief kept in touch very gallantly appealed to the others to let him sort everything out. But the bright girl stopped the gentleman, explaining that if he did this, it would be like mutilating a painting, and added that she did not want the beautiful girl to die in such a vile way. Having gracefully said her speech, the girl also went downstairs near the containers. She went to meet Shinho, saying that you couldn't say that about her because she kills differently. And looking at Shinho Pei with her snake eyes, the hybrid said that she would give the owner a graceful death. Although Shinho was not a snake, her father was right about the sharpness of the tongue, and the girl threw it to the hybrid so that she could show what she could do. The 3 of the guys were left sitting on the containers, and the one who was smarter concluded that Lu and Shan most likely took refuge in that strange dome, to which the cool guy displeasedly called them cowards, and both thought about why don't they just get inside. The cool guy said that there was no need for such a rush, and it was better to wait until Xiame beat Zingo Pei half to death, which would cause the guys to get out of the dome to help their friend, and laughingly added that then they would divide the trophies and he would take Lu Chuan for himself. The cool guy suddenly began to think out loud which of them was stronger, those who were closest to the divine rank or those who fed on the substance of the divine. The serious boy looked at his brother and only silently shared with him this question that tormented them all. Under the dome, both guys froze in anticipation because Shan was just now beginning to come to his senses. He was frightened by the danger of the situation because for a moment it seemed to him that the person inside had finally taken control. But the guy realized that, on the contrary, thanks to the strongest, he now sees absolutely everything. Lu was already unbearable, and he turned to Shan asking what kind of crooked face he had, and the guy looking at the owner thought about how he could name the strongest, and given the color of his eyes wanted to give the name Chernish. But at the same moment, Lu watched as Yu gave himself a tasty slap in the face. And not lagging behind the first, the guy's own hand added another one to him on the other cheek. Ji looked at the boy in complete confusion about what he was doing, and Shan, without answering, understood in his head that the name Chernish was not to the liking of the strongest. Yu shouted to Chuan not to hesitate but to attack, saying that he could cope with any of his attacks. For the first time, Shan understood why last time he could not see Lu appearing near him so quickly, and all because he moved like a charge of energy. Yu dodged the sparkling charges and realized that before he would never have been able to dodge the owner's attacks. But now that the guy saw all the trajectories in advance, this radically changes the situation. Shan still turned to the strongest, named Chernish, and said that he was right, that he could not cope alone, and repelled the attack of Lu, which he had already seen. And the guy was thrown back with a powerful blow, and then he told Blackie not to forget that his existence exists only thanks to busting Shan's ass all these 18 years in an attempt to survive. You seem to be having a conversation with a friend, and continued to explain that in matters of survival Blackie is no better than him, and clearly indicated that the strongest should not dare appear out of nowhere and belittle his right to exist as the owner. The boy froze for a moment because for the first time in all 18 years of his life, he felt completely himself. The guy was forced to emerge from the sea of thoughts again by the sudden appearance of Lu next to him. But now when Shan felt that for the first time someone else besides Chun was on his side, he was not afraid of blows. Yu admitted the existence of the strongest and the fact that he is now not alone, but pointed out to Chernish that this merit belongs to Shan. The young man slowed down after the impact almost to the end of the canopy, lifting particles of the road into the air behind him. When Shan stopped and wiped his face and then looked carefully at Lu, he realized that no matter what he attacked, he would survive everything. Chuan finally drew attention to the boy's eyes, indicating that something was wrong with them. But Shan was already picking up speed in order to finally experience his new skills in full force. He ran so fast that his hair fluttered like in the wind, and he told Blackie to stand behind and just watch. Lu had already made a shield against Shang's attack, but the boy had a different idea. Just now the young man was in front of Chuan, and now flying in the air he was above him. Shan put his fist ready to strike Ji, and like the wind approached the owner. Although you had taken possession of the ability, Lu was also still training and developing his skill. Therefore the owner intercepted the guy's hand even before he struck. While in flight, Chuan changed the trajectory of the boy's attack, thereby spinning him even more and taking control of the situation. A powerful explosion occurred, and for a moment neither Lu nor Shan were visible, only lightning sparkled from everywhere. Having descended from somewhere under the dome, Chuan was already holding the divine child tied in chains with the help of his strength. For the first time, the owner looked at the guy like that and said that without a special ability he would never have dodged that blow. Lu looked at the smiling boy who was lying face down on the floor and asked if he was now able to see the future. Having approached Pei Xingho at a sufficient distance so that she could hear, Xia Mei asked the girl to answer one question that interested her very much. Xinho, with all possible disgust, showed her opponent that she refused to answer questions, but the underhanded snake Mei smiling sweetly asked to give her a chance and at least hear the question. Mei began to explain that their team was given two tasks, the first to catch Shan Yu and the second to kill the one who was now standing in front of her. And after Mei's explanations, she became curious why the 8 great clans needed the death of a girl from a high rank. The bastard decided to press on Xinho's sore spot, so she emphasized that she was not distinguished by any special features, and that she only wore a worthless silver collar around her neck. Mei wanted to get down to business, so she pointed her finger at Pei and asked if she and the clans were enemies, or if perhaps the secret lay in the fact that the girl was special for another reason. The word insignificant could barely be heard coming out of Xinho's mouth, and it was the last calm before the storm. Having turned into a fiend of hell, Pei questioningly repeated the snake's words about the insignificant silver collar, which only meant that the bomb was about to explode. Mei smiled and sarcastically asked Pei if she had said something wrong towards the one who wears a trinket around her neck that hides her true essence. Xinho took out all the dirt that was pouring out of the viper's mouth, so without thinking twice, she launched a stream of flame above herself as if it had been spewed out by a dragon and not her wand. When the wave of fire left, Mei was very pleased with how the performance began and continued to look closely at her opponent. The snake poked Xinho's nose with hypocritical regret at the fact that she had ruined their sweet conversation, but Pei clarified that it was strange since she had aimed right at the pretty head. Now Mei realized that she could put the empty chatter to rest and also enter the battle, so she ran in the direction of her opponent. Xinho got to work and began to release tongues of flame at the snake, mentally wanting it to show everything it was capable of. Mei deftly dodged each fire shot approaching her target and throwing caustic remarks at Xinho about how she should improve her aim. Pei silently responded to the enemy's words, but the rage that raged inside her did not diminish but only grew in order to strike harder. The first clash between the opponents occurred when Mei was able to overcome all the fire attacks and get close enough to Xinho to strike. Xia Mei touched Xingo's hand in an attempt to use her power, but she didn't dare do it yet, because she was curious how far their battle would go. So as soon as Mei had the opportunity to strike the enemy blow after blow, she used it to disorient them. Among the many blows and sudden movements, Xinho managed to grab the snake's hand and thus take control of the situation. Pei, holding her opponent tightly, made a sharp jerk with her hand to the side to knock her down, but it turned out to be difficult. Xinho continued her attempt to put the upstart on her shoulder blades by holding her by the arm and pushing her further to the ground, and in addition hitting her on the leg. But at the last moment, Mei broke free from Xinho's hands and, jumping above the ground, kicked her in the head, but she was able to put up a defense with her hand. Skillfully manipulating her body, Xia found herself in an upside-down position, thus taking advantage of the opportunity to touch Pei's body again. Xinho immediately used her ability but missed because Mei pushed off with her hand and did a somersault to the side of her opponent. But after one fiery shot, another one followed, to which Xia turned around to understand which way to dodge again. This time, Mei again managed to avoid the blazing attack and continue such an interesting fight with the silver one. Mei was able to touch the body once again, rushing past Xinho, further goading her that the poor thing clearly felt inferior because in the eyes of the golden ones everyone else was wretched regardless of the color of the collar. Pei made a swing shouting at the snake to shut up, but she dodged and ran away laughing as if it was a funny game, and she managed to touch the girl to the quick again. In the distance, the click of a pistol bolt was heard, which was prepared for one person who needed to be finished off given the given tasks. And Pei would not be herself if she did not hear sounds that an ordinary person would not be able to hear from such a long distance. The girl activated a fiery swirl above her head in order to impair visibility for those behind her. And after the rotation, Shinho even made pillars of fire shooting out from under the ground, indicating to the young lady that she can't stand rats that strike from behind, and she clarified that she was talking about the rest of the team. The guys stood on one of the containers and saw a wall of fire, which meant there was nowhere to aim and no one to aim it, so the handsome guy laughed at his friend for getting caught. Yao Guang looked closely at the flames and silently accepted the sharp jokes of his teammate, because he knew that killing was a matter of time. The guy lowered his hand which held the gun, realizing that the moment of death had simply been delayed but not cancelled. Meanwhile, Mei, overcoming each pillar of fire again, decided to get closer to her victim, so she quickly moved in its direction. There is one last step left to get closer to your enemy to fulfill the promise of a graceful and beautiful death. Mei found herself close to Shinho, almost touching her body, and looking into her very soul, asking if the girl's scars really hid those memories that were dragging her to the bottom. Barely touching and looking into the eyes of her opponent, Xia asked her to share what was weighing on her inside and to tell her about what she could not let go of. But instead of a blow or a spit in the eyes, Mei saw in front of her, in an instant, a fiery whirlwind taller than her, behind which Shinho was not visible. Mei began to look around to see where Pei had gone, and could not understand how this had happened, because the fire had also disappeared, and now there was neither the mistress nor her ability. So that the snake would not worry for a long time about not being able to find its victim, it returned only this time from behind for a better effect of surprise. When Mei turned to the one she had underestimated, she heard only one question about whether she had decided on her last wish. Pei held one of her sticks in both hands, preparing to deliver a blow that she had not used before, and mentally asked Shan for forgiveness for the fact that now she needed to definitely finish the fight and not just drag out time. Pei put into her fury the thought that she was already pretty tired of this snake, and thus created an explosive wave behind her. By making a downward gesture with her hand, Shinho seemed to command her power to attack her opponent, and it looked not just like fire but like a huge number of the same sticks that she wielded, only red hot. For the first time in the entire fight, Mei looked at what was approaching her with true fear on her face, but she did not move from her place. The explosion that occurred upon impact with the target was the size of the dome that stood nearby, which indicated the impossibility of survival. It was necessary to wait until the smoke cleared, since the force of the impact was great and nothing could be seen behind such a wall. The weapon returned to the mistress as she came closer to look at the result of her actions and ask one question, just like her opponent did at the beginning. Shinho asked, looking at the injured and no longer so confident Mei, how it felt to lose to someone who wears an insignificant silver collar. Xia sat on the ground with burns and cuts, breathing heavily because her body was burning, but at the same time she looked at her enemy. And the next moment the girl suddenly smiled, widely pleased with how much fun she had had. Sitting in a circle of fiery pillars, Mei laughed heartily, admitting that the entertainment was a great success, and that she liked Pei Zingo even more now because she had proven herself to be one of the best silver espers. Shinho didn't react to the girl's empty chatter, even in the form of deathbed praise, but her gaze was fixed on the victim with whom she was determined to finish off. The pillars of fire stood tightly, and it was impossible to escape from them since Pei had strengthened their effect, but Mei did not even try to escape, and only continued to look at her opponent with a wide smile on her face while burning alive. The smell of burnt flesh and its hissing rose into the air, and all this time the guys watched this terrible picture. Little Dudu watched his little sister burn alive, and the sight made him squeeze his older brother's hand even tighter. The guy noticed how worried Dudu was and ruffled his hair, and explained that there was nothing to worry about since this part of the performance was Mei's favorite. The handsome man casually tossed the baby, who he decided to worry about, and continued to watch the fire burning below. Dudu didn't answer because tears welled up in his eyes, but the older brother decided not to stop and added that the one he was worried about was already a corpse. While the black collars were dealing with the silver one, an alarm went off in the room where the video surveillance was being conducted. The observer alerted the guards via radio that there had been a failure in the surveillance system in cell B313 of the Western Bloc. The observer gave the order for those who were currently free to go into the cell to see what happened. The last thing the worker said was a warning about the danger and for the guards to be careful because the one they were heading to had gone through a transformation stage. The guards went down to the floor they needed, and among all the cameras, the one that had broken down was immediately noticeable because it was flashing red. Instead of doors, the cells had glass walls, which one of the workers knocked on, calling the boy an asshole and indicating that he had gotten out of bed. The guard who had prepared the weapon suggested that his partner come in, and he agreed because there was no other choice since he needed to find out what was broken. The glass wall rose and the workers entered the cell very slowly, heading towards the guy who was lying with his back to them in the bed. At first the worker without a gun simply addressed the boy but did not touch him, and he did not react in any way. But the guy suddenly opened his eyes, only pretending to be asleep when he felt the touch of the worker, but he behaved very quietly. In order for the guy to succeed, he needed to suddenly attack the guard from a quiet and sleeping state, and when he did this, the second worker shouted to calm down or he would shoot. The boy did not stop at grabbing the worker and did not get off, and the next moment he bit him. The guy bit off and spat out the guard's ear, then looked at the one standing behind him, indicating to quickly give him a pass. The worker backed away under the pretext that he needed to go to the wall where the pass was sticking out, but this was only a distraction. The boy was shaking all over and remained in the arms of one of the workers, extending his hand to the leaving guard for a pass. But instead of a miss, 2 shots rang out and traces of blood appeared on the wall, indicating a direct hit to the head and a fatal outcome. Another worker was riding in the elevator, responsible for delivering the corpse of the failed experiment to the necessary place in this entire anthill. That's how the days of the people working here passed, when they crossed paths in the corridor, and if some carried corpses on couches, others dragged fugitives back to their cells. Some were not treated with ceremony and were dealt with immediately if the fugitives did not intend to calm down and tried to get out of this hell. And when some were doing their job of selecting those who resisted, those appeared, who finished what had been started, packing the guys like meat in bags and taking them away, reporting everything above. And all these murders could have taken place while someone was taking one of the dead down for further inspection and destruction. The route was already boring and familiar, as were all the sounds happening around from the elevator, ringing about arrival to the shots and screams in the corridor. The way the workers moved with the couches looked like a death conveyor belt, because while some were leaving with empty seats, someone else was carrying another corpse. When examining the man who had literally just been killed, the man let out a sad and heavy sigh as he looked at the barcode on the corpse's neck. The guy asked the senior worker that this was the most successful example among all the others in recent times, to which the old man replied that the camera was indeed some kind of unlucky one, and ordered that the body be burned as quickly as possible. The guy pressed the button and a fire broke out in the chamber where the body was already, and added his thoughts that this was all some kind of mistake, because for 100 dead black collars, one transformed one appeared, but they treated him indifferently. The old man sat on a chair, and his whole appearance indicated that the work he was doing was not hard because of physical labor, so he responded to the guy's thoughts with a counter-question whether he knew how long this crematorium had been operating. To complete the experience, the old man told the guy the whole horror of how the stoves here have been burning non-stop for 10 years since the building was built, and everyone who is here has long since gone crazy. Regarding the black collars, the grandfather replied that they were not guilty of anything but were only pursuing the goal of becoming espers and changing their fate. And when these children receive their powers, they hope that they will be able to escape from here, saving not only themselves. And in the end, their freedom is limited either to their cell or to their last run down the corridor until a bullet flies into their forehead. The old man drooped to such an extent that he lowered his head and finally said that the black collars will forever bear this brand on themselves. In the chamber, the boy's body made its last sounds of crackling and hissing before turning to ash and disappearing forever. Pei moved closer to her opponent, whom she had trapped in a fiery prison, continuing to hold the pillars high. Shinho looked at Mei, asking her to directly use her abilities before destroying her to the ground. But after taking a closer look, the girl noticed old scars that were visible through her opponent's clothes. This only meant one thing, that Xia Mei was perhaps also special like Zingo, but no one knew about it because she hid it. Xia was still sitting in the circle of fire pillars, and looking at Pei, smiling slyly, she said that no one said that she had not yet used her power. Shinho now decided to be sarcastic too, saying that it was clear why the air smelled like shit, because it turned out to be the abilities of an elegant lady. The girl felt uneasy from what she felt in her body, while looking at how the enemy did nothing but continued to sit in place. An incomprehensible purple point appeared near Shinho's shoulder, which looked very much like a sting, and it touched her. The next moment, the girl felt sensations inside her body in different parts that reminded her of explosions. Pei's skin became covered in purple veins as the toxin spread, and she couldn't say a word, but just stared ahead, gradually losing her strength. Unable to support her own weight due to her weak muscles, Shinho fell helplessly to the ground, unable to do anything. The girl's most important weapon also fell from her hands to the ground loudly, and ringing first on one side then on the other until it calmed down. Now both girls were on their knees, but the fire that was holding back Mei had disappeared, indicating that Shinho's strength had left her. Mei still unsteadily rose to her feet and exhaled heavily, that she finally had something to breathe, and that she would not burn alive. The poisonous one approached her opponent and kicked her weapon with her foot now as if it were a regular stick, saying that kneeling for too long was tiring, so now it was Shinho's turn to do the same. Poor Pei, from the spasms and the toxin in her body, began to cough up blood, and her skin became more and more covered with veins that were already poisoned. Mei stood in front of her victim, watching as she was enveloped in poisonous flowers, the seeds of which she had deliberately left behind. Although Pei's body was paralyzed, her head was working perfectly, so she remembered absolutely every touch that the poisonous one made, but at that moment she did not attach any importance to it. Being on her knees and in such a shitty position, Shinho still smiled, asking Mei if paralyzing through touch was really her ability, to which she answered negatively. The snake sat down next to its victim, lightly stroking her shoulder and reminding her that if the ability consisted only of paralysis, then it would not encroach on her life. Mei's soft touches changed to a tight grip on her opponent's hand, with which she could now do whatever she wanted. The guy from the team who was watching what was happening from above all this time heard how his partner wanted to tell about her ability, and in his head he continued for the girl that this ability is unique and belongs only to her. Mei held Shinho so that she wouldn't fall and looked at her closely, and at the same time mortally, each time explaining that she had control over the aging process. Yao Guang watched as his sister in misfortune played with the victim and understood that the latter had no chance because Xia possessed a truly deadly ability. The boy was flooded with memories of the sound of the machine cutting their hair, and how that day he looked at the girl in front of him whose beautiful long hair was cut off, and they were the only two of all the children who did not cry. The boys then met with glances that were already empty at that moment. So unlike other children, they did not cry but simply sat accepting their fate, but in their souls a fierce desire to take revenge on someone in the future was born. From that moment on, although Yao Guang and Mei did not show it, they understood that they would stick together in the future. Even when the children were doused with cold water like in prison before being sent to their cells, the kids felt uncomfortable, but they didn't scream. Yao Guang would not have paid attention to his half-sister if the worker pouring water on them had not asked what kind of nasty thing she had on her body and whether it was contagious. The guy looked at the girl covered in scars, who bent over even more, not from the cold but from the fact that the worker called her an abomination. Mei was shaking at that moment, both from the cold and the anger she felt towards everyone who hurt her, and it no longer mattered whether it was words or actions. The girl seemed to feel the gaze of her future partner and brother on her, and when they stopped pouring water on her, she turned around, opening her eyes that were burning with righteous anger. A huge number of children were seated in a spacious hall in front of a screen where they were congratulated on their selection to participate in a new program for rebirth, and where they were was called the place where the fate of black collars would change. A beautiful speech and a picture flowed from the screen about how the only way for children to get rid of their low rank would be through an experience of awakening abilities that would reveal their potential. The guards stood among the rows of children monitoring the situation, and some stood with their heads down, tired from this hard work, and some glanced out of the corner of their eyes at the children, who sincerely believed what was being broadcast to them from the big screen. A pleasant voice explained to the children that those who successfully transform with the best results will have the opportunity to enter the Pantheon. Guan sat next to his friend, and instead of the screen he looked around with displeasure, quietly asking his friend if they were really sure that they could brainwash them, but he did not respond, sitting rooted to the spot in his chair. On the screen, the Pantheon representatives smiled and clapped for a boy holding a bouquet of flowers to celebrate his chance to enter the gates of heaven, which looked beautiful but so delusional. Guan tried to call his friend Tian Lang again, but he had already believed in a blind dream that would never come true, giving only false hope and a desire to undergo transformation. Since his friend didn't react, Yao looked further down the row, where he noticed the same girl he saw when they were getting their hair cut. But when Mei looked at Guan, her gaze left much to be desired, and she was clearly unhappy with the fact that the guy was staring at her, but this spoke of their difference from the others. Guan looked at the girl, trying to remember her name, and they were the only ones who sat like that and looked to the side and not at the screen standing out from the crowd. After the performance, all the children were brought to the buffet so that they could have a proper snack before continuing their journey on this conveyor belt. Tian noticed that someone approached Guan faster and managed to turn around with something, although the hand was already on his shoulder. Mei was able to sharpen the wand enough to stab the boy, saying that if he looked at her again, he would lose his eyes. But the girl was unable to thrust the sharp object into the guy because Tian managed to stop her halfway by exposing his hand to the blow, which immediately bled out. A security guard approached the guys holding a stun gun to Mei's neck, while Guan asked his friend if his hand was okay, and he replied that it was fine and also asked how he was. Before leaving, the worker warned the children that their experience would end in an hour, after which they would no longer be able to throw their strength around left and right, so now they should eat and not waste time on nonsense. The poor guys stood there staring at the scary guy, not understanding why they were now being accused of starting a showdown. After the guards left, Guan went down to Mei asking if she could get up and walk, but she didn't react in any way. The boy, not hearing or seeing seeing anything in response, decided to carefully touch the girl to check if she was alive at all. And then Mei jumped up, knocking Guan's hand away from herself, screaming furiously for him not to touch her under any circumstances. Feeling humiliated once again and not used to someone helping and caring, the girl turned around and ran away without eating. Tian immediately concluded out loud that judging by Mei's reaction, she had been with the silver foxes before arriving in this place, and Guan agreed with this judgment. The children took turns injecting the necessary substance into their hands for transformation, of which there was enough for everyone in that place. Everyone was divided into rows and put in a queue where the test subjects one by one approached the guard for their dose of changes. After the substance was administered, the children were allowed into the room one by one with clear instructions to go to the chamber that corresponded to their ordinal number. Guan, standing opposite Mei without turning around, explained to her that he was staring because she seemed to him to be quite strong, unlike the others. Before entering the cell, the boy turned around to ask for forgiveness for touching the girl without asking. Mei looked at the guy with eyes full of indifference and disappointment with this life, but at the same time she behaved calmly and remained silent. When the guys turned their backs to each other and went to their cells, Mei said one single word that said a lot, namely she asked the guy to survive. Guan agreed with what the girl said and expressed his hope that they would all be able to overcome the transformation. When the test subjects were released into the cells, the guards rose to their places yawning because they were tired but would not be able to sleep after midnight since the work was just beginning. There was still one worker at the observation console sleeping while changes were being made to the children in the cells. At some point, heartbreaking screams and cries of those who were having a very hard time with the transformation began to be heard from the cameras. The children approached the glass, knocking on it with their hands, trying to get out, but it was resistant to their blows. Some had a high fever and heavy breathing that was rapidly leading to a dying state. Mei also got it like everyone else, and she curled up in a ball on the floor from unbearable pain that seemed like it would never go away. In another chamber, it was impossible to see anything at all because it was filled with some kind of incomprehensible thick smoke reminiscent of blurred colors. In the other chambers, you could see children dying from activated abilities exploding or growing additional limbs. One of the workers, sipping a drink, walked away from the control panel, indicating to another to turn down the volume because all the screaming was too much for his ears. The guard on command lowered the slider to the very bottom to the 0 mark, and the problem disappeared, and the fact that the picture remained did not bother anyone. Tian stood at the glass wall of one of the cells and quietly called his friend, believing that he had managed to survive and would now also come to the wall. Tian, without losing hope, looked towards his friend's camera and continued to call him, expecting to see him. Yao lay on his bed sweating and closing his eyes from the bright light, but he could already distantly hear his friend's voice. Tian's call helped Guan understand that he was still alive and that what he heard was the real voice of his friend. So the guy opened his eyes, which were filled with the energy that personified his ability. But the body was still too weak for such changes, and the bright, unnatural color of the eyes disappeared after a moment. Yao stood up, swaying and shaking violently, and quietly answered his friend that he was here, and that a true friend would not be a friend if he did not say that if he died he would despise him. Tian called his friend again to make sure that he was okay, and Guan, even with some irritation, replied that he was alive. Gradually getting off the bed and putting his feet on the floor, Yao pointed out to Tian that if there were still those who had not died, then his grumbling would definitely finish them off. Slowly, Guan, already moving more confidently, walked across the room in the direction of the glass wall to also see his friend and Mei. Tian liked Yao's joke about his grumbling, and he laughed at it when he saw Guan at the wall, happy about his brother's appearance. Guan first of all approached the wall, knocked on it, calling Mei and asking if she was there, and if she was okay then let her give some kind of sign. Poor Mei was still lying on the floor curled up, and compared to the guy's rooms, hers was a complete nightmare, as if a hurricane was raging there and everything was upside down. The girl's fingertips were covered in blood, but when she heard the voice of the one she asked to survive, she made an effort and raised her thumb up just a little. Guana was quite satisfied with this gesture from his girlfriend, and he was already standing by the wall with a smile, holding onto it with one hand, imagining how much fun they would have together in the future. And then the guy heard signals. Yao turned around to where the signals came from and saw that the doors to their floor had opened, which meant that someone was coming towards them. Workers actually approached the cameras, discussing that this block had a good result and that there were 3 survivors numbered 310, 312, and 313, unlike the neighboring blocks where no one survived. The guards walked past the boys reading their names and stopped at the cell of the girl who managed to survive, which was even more rare. Lifting the glass wall, one of the workers leaned over to Mei to examine her, while his partner stood with a tablet in his hands watching. The guard turned Xia onto her back, asking that she was the only survivor of all the girls in this group, and her partner checked the information and replied that this was true. The worker looked closely at the girl, but did not find any signs of changes, which alerted him. The guard asked his partner to wait outside the doors to check what Mei was now capable of, but he advised against taking such a risk since they were all just after the transformation, and it could be mortally dangerous. But the worker asked his colleague not to be a bore and to do as he was asked because he himself was wasting time and the test subject could get up and run away at any moment. Tion sat with his back to the wall studying his new abilities while the guard's partner stood with a tablet in his hands waiting for him, and Guan carefully watched what was happening in Mei's cell. Tion was already quite good at controlling his power, and he watched his ability with fascination like a cat watching a toy. In other chambers there was deathly silence and dead bodies, and on the glass walls there were traces of their lethal transformation. Guan froze in anticipation of what Mei would do and hoped that she would not kill the guard, so that nothing would happen to her for it later. Yao realized that even though they had survived and gone through the transformation, no one had led them to the gates of the Pantheon and handed them a bouquet of flowers, and their fate would not change because everything that was initially poured into their ears was complete nonsense. When the guard left Mei's cell, his partner ran up to him screaming what had happened to his neck and face, but he didn't understand anything. Having noticed his hands, the worker was taken aback that not only were they in a shitty state, but he also felt the same way. Having unbuttoned his jacket, the guy was in even greater shock because his body was not only covered in some purple stripes, but also turned black as if it was burning alive. The guy's scream was the last one, after which he was paralyzed and turned into a silent, lifeless statue, while his partner called for help on the radio in the Western Block B313. The result of Mei's work fell to the floor dying in terrible agony, and she watched it carefully, but calling for reinforcements would not have changed anything. The little girl stood in her cell, not taking her eyes wide off the stupid victim, who decided that if she worked here she was allowed to do anything, including humiliating the test subjects. And now Mei, looking closely at her victim again, explained to Pei that as soon as she touched her solar plexus her heart would stop forever. Mei looked into Shinho's eyes for the last time, saying goodbye to her, even with a hint of pity that she would no longer have the opportunity to have fun with such a rival. Pei couldn't do anything or even say anything. Sosia could only press her hand against her opponent's solar plexus. While the other heroes were quite close to Shan Yu, little Li was just preparing to run away from home to fulfill her brother's will, and at the moment she had the task of removing the surveillance cameras from her path. The girl aimed the stone at the video surveillance device, telling herself that the blow had to be done very lightly and carefully. But unfortunately the little girl didn't succeed because her gift made itself known, and instead of the camera she knocked down a column of the house. Li ran to the knockdown column where the camera was attached to hold it down and not cause more problems. But if Li managed to knock down the column perfectly, then the camera fell unharmed right in front of her nose onto her hands while she was holding the stone block. Behind the gates of the garage where the family's cars were located, the beeping of the system could be heard, through which Li tried to enter the password for the entrance, but she did not succeed, and after another unsuccessful attempt the system announced that the next attempt was in 10 minutes. The 10 minutes was too much of a grueling wait for the young lady, so she once again took the path of least resistance and simply began to break down the armored garage doors with her fists. Li lifted the heavy gate with ease as it crumpled into a convenient accordion and pulled out the wire to immediately ease her fate with the alarm. Although the girl had a gift, it was still inside her body, which was still wounded after that skirmish with the demon, and the wound had not yet completely healed. Throwing aside thoughts of pain, the little girl entered the garage where she turned on all the lights to assess what kind of car she should take to get to the lands of the exiled. While the girl was looking at the cars, on one of them stood an unremarkable figurine of a monkey in glasses, not arousing any suspicion. But as soon as this figure noticed movement in the garage, one of its eyes immediately worked and blinked a red light conducting video surveillance. It turned out that Ms. Han had been watching her daughter from her office the entire time, while her assistant clutched her head and ran back and forth at the table lamenting that Ms. Li had stolen the phone and now also the car, which spoke of her serious intentions. The assistant could not stand it any longer and rushed to the lady in the garage to stop her from such a stupid act of going to the lands of the exiled herself. Ms. Han herself remained calm the entire time and advised her assistant to do the same since her daughter did not have access to cars. The servant breathed a sigh of relief, remembering that the cars were assembled by Mr. Su, who made sure that there was a recognition system thanks to which only Mrs. Han and young Mr. Shu could drive the car, but the miss was already typing something on the keyboard. The assistant turned to Mrs. Han in horror, worried that her suspicions about the lady's actions had been confirmed. The servant's guess was correct because Lady Han reprogrammed the system so that the machine could be used, and all he had to do was press the enter button. The little girl was sitting in one of the cars holding two wires in her hands and remembering that she needed to connect them like they did in the movies. But Li didn't have to suffer for long because the doors of another car opened next to the car she was sitting in. Li was very surprised that her brother's car not only opened but also the system started up and said that it was activated and the user was changed from Han Shu to Han Li. The girl immediately climbed into the car, into the passenger seat, happy that the situation was being simplified, and the system immediately recognized that the user was not yet 18 years old. Since the passenger was a minor, Yuan Ye's system activated the autopilot and slammed the door on Li's side, thereby frightening her, and then notified her that the navigator's seat had been successfully determined, and now she needed to fasten her seatbelt. Lee did everything as the system ordered and opened her phone, and began to look at what location was sent to her brother in the group chat, to which the system again responded with lightning speed asking whether the lady confirmed the destination or not. The car screen lit up with exactly the same destination point as on the phone, which once again made the situation easier. Lee looked at the screen, realizing that she had done nothing to mark the location, and the only one who could was her mother. The system asked the young lady if it was necessary to change the destination to another one, but the girl replied that the location was correct and that it was possible to leave, which the system accepted as a command. The car, like a madman, pressed the gas pedal to the floor and spun the steering while saying that it was happy to serve its mistress, while Lee was thrown from side to side in the passenger seat, and she shouted at the system to slow down. Like a rocket, the car flew out of Han's domain, leaving behind dust balls, and in the distance Lee's cry could be heard, "Does the system even know how to drive?" to which she reported on her rich knowledge and study of the Introduction to Driving 1.0. Mrs. Han looked out the window as her daughter drove away in the car, and the assistant asked if she was not worried at all, since the young lady had never left her home and her family before. Instead of answering, Mrs. Han silently watched her daughter go, and at the same time she was immersed in memories with which she could now describe why she was no longer worried. The words of the song began to play in Han's head, not in her voice but in the voice of Mrs. Wu Yu, who was singing it to her then unborn godson, and the women were chatting and laughing sweetly in the fresh air. Mrs. Yu communicated with the baby through her good friend's belly, telling her godson to come into this world safely. Han looked at this sweet sight and the love that was already enveloping her baby, and was also very much looking forward to meeting him. No one knew that something would happen that you wouldn't wish on your enemy, and the first person Han turned to was Yu, and her friend begged for help from the one who possessed immortality to save the newborn baby. Han did not understand how the one who loved and waited for this child so much was now inactive and did not provide any help at all. But Yu explained that with all her strength she would not want to interfere with the fate that this little man had chosen, because she was not God to decide someone's life issue. Han's heart, which was already bleeding from fear of losing the baby, was now filled with anger from hopelessness. Han couldn't bear the pain that had consumed her and threw it out by hitting the person closest to her in the face, but Yu took the blow without resisting. The poor girl was crying in front of her faithful friend, and the scream was tearing her apart from the inside into many pieces, because despite having the opportunity to help, she refused. Han then, without looking up at Yu, shouted that from now on she would hate her forever for how much pain she had caused her. The assistant, noticing that the lady had been standing silently for quite a long time and staring at one point, asked if everything was okay with her, to which she replied that everything was normal and she was simply remembering the old days. Mrs. Han looked out the window again and, although ambiguously, gave her assistant an answer saying that the future could still be changed. At the moment when the mother said that she trusted her daughter, her hands trembled from the fact that they squeezed each other very tightly, because once Han also trusted but got burned by it. The car had already left the Pantheon and was driving onto the bridge that brought Lee closer to the prefecture, while the oasis remained behind. The fresh air, the singing of birds, and the plants were replaced by smog, grayness, and a bunch of cars, although the girl had not yet even entered the lands of the prefecture. There was a dirty, thick fog in the city which made the advertising banners barely visible, and the noise and hum was so loud that your head would start to split over time. But for Lee, this dirty and gray place was new, so she was amazed at how interesting and differently everything was arranged here. The girl sat herself down in the chair, shouting that she had no time to be distracted because the trip was important and serious and not for entertainment. Lee understood that everything she saw was no longer what it was before, and now the prefecture belonged to bad people. The little girl picked up her brother's phone and, opening the chat where the location was sent, pressed the button to record a voice message. Lee dictated a message to the boys that she was Han Lee, that she was 14 years old, that she was Han Shu's younger sister, and since her brother was unable to join them, she had come to help in his place. A little worried, the girl sent her voice message, not knowing what to expect from guys much older than her. When Lee saw that the message status lit up as sent, she continued to look excitedly out the window, and her thoughts were only about the response from the other guys. The little girl was driving along the roads of the prefecture, looking out the window, thinking about whether her mother would forgive her for leaving so abruptly and, moreover, without saying goodbye. One huge high-rise building was replaced by another, and the bridges seemed to have no end, twisting between the roofs of houses. Lee was no longer staring out the window as she had been at the beginning, because her focus was on the phone and waiting for a response from the team. Perhaps not so much time has passed since the little girl once again looked at her phone in the hope of seeing the cherished answers there. But the same status was flashing on the screen, saying that no new messages had been received, and this was making the girl nervous because a bunch of caustic thoughts immediately crept into her head. The system suddenly notified the lady that chat users can track location by default, so it advised the girl to check the locations of others, and Lee, burning with shame, asked her to do so. Yuan Yi reported that according to the coordinates there were 2 people near the lady, But then the system's voice began to jam and change while she was saying that one of the people seemed familiar to her. Lee turned to the system, but it did not respond, and some kind of bug began to occur with the screen since the hologram began to delaminate into pieces. Yuan Ye's system suddenly accelerated, sharply maneuvering along the road lanes between cars driving into the oncoming lane, but did not respond to the girl's comments and questions about where she was taking her. One thing was clear: the car was heading strictly along the course to the beacon from which the failure occurred, and it was emitting an approaching signal and was driving at a crazy speed. However, certain birds were able to fly into the prefecture to help their owner find what he needed from their height. Cheese, as it turned out, was also sitting in the chat waiting for his partners to respond, but no one wrote, which made the guy bored. The young man raised his head and looked up from his phone, feeling a chill run down his spine, although there was no reason for it. Having carefully checked her drawing, Cheese saw that the little man was in place in the very heart of the labyrinth, which meant there was no reason to worry. But at the moment when the guy realized that the little man in the picture had not moved for a long time, birds began knocking on the window, chirping loudly. Cheese realized that he was in bad shape, but he couldn't move from his spot, continuing to look at the birds, which were only becoming more numerous. The guy saw the silhouette of the one called the birds and couldn't believe that he managed to trick the kid as cleverly as he did with him. Breaking the window glass, Zhou Shi and his loyal assistants burst into the room, holding his hand on his sword. Zhou confidently walked across the floor in the direction of his enemy, and the glass crunched loudly under his shoes, but the guy was not distracted by this. The little man drawn by Cheese was still in the drawing in the center of the maze, although he was now right in front of him. The guy stepped back, taken aback, asking C how he was able to get out without it going unnoticed. C explained to the enemy that he had managed to carry out some kind of experiment after realizing that the young man's ability was to sense and direct the flow of power. Realizing how to deceive the deceiver, Zhou pressed the blade of his sword to Chiz's neck, indicating that, as he could see, the experiment had been successful. Cheese looked at his enemy indifferently, continuing to ask about what was in the middle of the labyrinth instead of C himself. The owner again explained that he was able to concentrate his energy there, thereby creating a similar one to himself to distract attention. Getting further to find Chiz was not an easy task, so in some houses there were gaping holes from which the remains of concrete slabs were still falling. Factory workers were the first to witness something or someone passing through a wall, which was not the most pleasant experience for ordinary people. Zhou, without removing the sword from the scoundrel's neck, indicated to him that now it was his turn to ask questions about how many of them were here in total, and why he was the only one here and the others were not visible. But the most important thing that interested Shi was the question of how the black collars could use power. Cheese thought in his head that he was not going to answer this idiot, even though he understood that his head could fly off his shoulders, but instead he tried to soften Zhou's anger by asking about the fact that monks don't kill. Bringing the blade close enough to his neck to injure him, she ordered the guy to answer questions and not to talk trash. Cheese replied that it was clear to him what was said because only a complete idiot would not answer when the sword was at his throat, and after a moment he pretended to choose which question to start with while his hand reached for the drawing. Putting his hand on the drawing, Cheese delayed a little more, saying that he would be happy to answer all questions, but there was one thing. And when the guy felt that he could again control what he had drawn, he looked at his opponent, wondering what the very thing was their time to listen to the answers. At that moment, the young man ran his hand through the labyrinth, and a loud sound of a falling building burst through the window along with a wave of dust. Zhou saw out of the corner of his eye that the houses that were used to act as walls for the labyrinth were now collapsing like cards. Cheese took advantage of the moment while the enemy was distracted, and putting his hand to the floor beneath him, made a slab out of it that separated and began to descend downwards like a hovering platform. The young man was pleased with himself, and already going down to the floor below, he pointed out to the monk that he had a choice to pursue him in order to get answers or to save people because time was passing and they were under the rubble. The guy certainly had no time to despair, and he chose to save many lives instead of chasing someone who could lay waste to an entire city while running. Zhou jumped onto the window frame and commanded the birds that it was time for them to go because he felt that the house he was in would collapse as soon as the enemy came out of it, and this could happen at any moment. Cheese finally managed to get through to Thea, and she asked him discontentedly what he needed because she was busy, to which the young man happily said that his plans had changed and he was heading towards her, and at that moment a building creaked and fell behind him. At that moment Thea was fighting with a robot that also arrived to help Sean, but the girl intercepted it with the help of her ability to control electronics. The girl was not against her partner joining her, but asked not to disturb her upon arrival as she was having fun with the guest. After hanging up, Thea looked at the robot, smiling widely from the fact that she had returned to a more interesting conversation. The girl mocked the robot, asking if he was still holding on, and each time she hit him harder with her sword, not sparing her opponent for a moment. At that moment, the robot had two errors displayed on its panel: the inability to launch the upper limb repulsors and an unstable signal. Zhou, meanwhile, was rushing at full speed with his feathered warriors to help the people who were trapped under the rubble. The guy knew that the birds were more agile and sensitive than him, so he asked to help show him the way to the black collars. The birds immediately rushed to where there was the largest concentration of people who had piled up or were already running out of oxygen. The buildings fell one after another, in addition to those that Chiz started with, which complicated the task many times over, but the monk's assistants like himself were not going to give up. The corridor of one of the factories was creaking from its own weight and crunching with sparks coming from torn wires. And in an instant, a green whirlwind rushed through this corridor at supersonic speed, overcoming walls and doors. Zhou headed where his assistants pointed him, and finally the first person was visible, who was piled up in a column. The monk lifted the column and freed the man, taking the poor fellow on his shoulders to take him out of here and hand him over to those who would be conscious to provide assistance. Like the wind, the guy moved from person to person, picking them up and carrying them out of the building, which was collapsing with every second. Zhou rose higher to those who needed help, clearly following the path that the birds showed him. Thanks to his transformation into a light element that could appear anywhere, she combed through all possible corners incredibly quickly. Those who survived found themselves trapped and tried to open the doors to get out by leaning on it, but it was all in vain since a blockage had already formed behind the door. People felt even worse after the last hope of getting out disappeared, because those who pushed the doors said that there was debris behind them blocking the exit. The workers clutched their heads in panic, because although they were alive, it wouldn't be for long, because they wouldn't have enough oxygen until the rescuers arrived, and they would die of suffocation. Some of the workers fell to the floor, experiencing wild horror that they would die here alive among the others like in a huge grave. Some employees still tried to check the windows and doors again, but this did not lead to anything and only escalated the situation even more. One of the workers put his ear to the door, which they tried to open, but nothing worked, and now he heard some sounds behind it. The guy turned to everyone, thinking that he had already gone crazy from lack of oxygen, and reported that he heard birds chirping outside the door. The doors that had resisted several people swung open wide, and birds flew in, and people stared at them as if they were gods who had come to save them. And the birds really did start grabbing people by their hoods and clothes and pulling them out from under the rubble, although not everyone wanted this and ran away screaming from the birds, thinking that they had definitely gone crazy from nerves. The birds pulled workers out from under the rubble, sometimes at a very great height, thereby forcing the already frightened guys to scream because they were about to fall and would definitely crash to their deaths. But none of the rescued people crashed, but on the contrary successfully landed on the surviving platform, where they would at least be safe now. Many people were already sitting down, having come to their senses, and some were coughing and trying to breathe in some fresh air. Some needed help, but Zhou did not stop and continued to save them, flying like the wind from place to place. When everyone the monk was able to save was outside the house, he finally collapsed, roaring like a wounded animal. Zhou went down to one of the guys who was safe and sound, asking him to take care of the man he was holding in his arms. The woman lay half dead on the concrete floor, crying and calling for someone named Xiao Qiu, unable to even get up. Overcoming her pain, the girl jumped up, frantically shouting that she needed to find Xiao because he was still inside the building, and one of the workers pricked her with the remark that she had been told not to bring a child to the factory. The girl, sobbing and already regretting what she had done, shouted that she had no choice because otherwise the baby would have remained in the land of the exiled and would have died too. The building was crumbling before our eyes as if it were made of matches, raising dust and other debris in streams of air, so that we had to cover our faces with our hands. The girl closed her mouth, saying the name of her baby and sobbing because he might already be buried alive, but she heard someone ask the only question: where? Zhou asked again where exactly the girl's son was, and the poor fellow, stuttering with fear, answered that he was in the lower tier warehouse. The monk immediately went to the building, and the girl did not even have time to say anything to him, but only watched with tears in her eyes as he went to certain death. The feathered assistants stopped their master in every possible way, but he went on without being distracted by them. When one of the birds landed on its owner's hand, he stroked the little one and assured her that everything would be fine with him, just as it had been before. Zhou rushed to the building before it was too late, and his assistants remained in place watching their hero. It was at that moment that she found himself somewhere among the rubble of the building that it completely collapsed, causing the frightened birds to fly up into the air. In addition to the problem that the building was hanging on by a thread, it was also sinking into the water with every second, and behind the doors of one of the rooms the heartbreaking voice of a boy calling for help could still be heard. The doors of the room where the boy was staying were blocked both by rubble from the outside and by furniture from the inside, and the room was already more than half filled with water. The boy stood on one of the shelves with tears in his eyes, and the water just kept coming out of all the cracks at a furious speed. This small man already understood that if he didn't do anything right now, death would be inevitable, so he tried to climb higher. The only thing that helped the boy move on was thoughts about his mother, and how she was still waiting for him outside, and this only made his eyes wetter. Grasping his last hope for survival, the boy heard such a terrible crunch that he realized that he would not be able to get out. The structure was too destroyed and flooded with water, so the boy fell down along with the debris from the ceiling. With a loud splash, the child fell into the water without any chance to grab onto anything to save himself. Floundering in the water, the boy was overcome with panic and called for his mother as loudly as he could. The frightened and exhausted child sank under the water, and in his head the words about who would save him now and whether he would save him at all were beating like a hot blow. Help arrived almost on time in the form of a curling green trail that quickly overcame obstacles. Zhou immediately extended his hands to the boy as soon as he transformed so as not to waste a second. Using his powers again, the monk began to lift them and the boy up in order to get out of the water and the building itself as quickly as possible. Having gotten out of the water, Zhou needed to leave the remains of the house as quickly as possible, which was already a threat to both of them and the child. The feathered helpers flew over the slabs and nervously shouted, calling for their master, worrying about his survival, and at the same time the mother was on her knees, no longer knowing whether to believe in her son's salvation. A very small spark of hope had not yet died out in the eyes of the woman, who with all her might believed the stranger and his words that he would save the boy. The birds, as if sensing something, began to scream even louder and more anxiously, descending lower towards the place where their owner was heading. One of the feathered helpers looked with his keen eye at a specific place and froze in anticipation. The birds were not mistaken, and an explosion appeared from under the ruins, scattering the remains of the building around. The first thing that eyewitnesses of the event saw was a hand in which a sword was firmly held, which helped break through the obstacles. Zhou held a sword in one hand, and in the other, he held a boy who, although very weak and coughing, was alive. The monk, despite all the mortal danger, smiled the warmest smile and asked the young man his name, to which he replied that he was Xiao Qiu. An unknown but very kind person stroked the baby's hair and assured him that the danger was now behind him, for which Xiao thanked the hero. But Zhou had to leave the boy, and he asked him to find his mother on his own, and just in case asked if the baby could handle it, to which he replied that he could, although he was unsure. Before continuing his mission, the monk once again gently and in a friendly manner patted the boy's hair, telling him that he was very brave. And the next moment Zhou disappeared from the spot in the same green air trail, and the birds flew away after him. Xiao froze in place for a while after seeing what he saw, and only the sound of the wind remained next to him. Meanwhile, on the bridge, a high-tech skirmish continued between the robot and the girl who knew how to control electronics. The robot kept getting errors on the processor, but this only amused Taya even more because she was wondering how far their entertainment could go, but the creation of Mr. Lo Xingguang reminded the team to continue the mission. The command worked, and this gave the robot the opportunity to repel both Taya's blow and herself, which made the girl laugh even more. The walking glitch complimented the robot that he was not one of the timid and was quite strong. But Taya also had her own aces up her sleeve, and taking out a pistol, she suggested that the iron guy try to play a little differently. Mr. Lo's robot, in his usual manner, warned his opponent to stop attacking and clear the way for his further movement, but Taya sarcastically asked if she was really in the way. The robot's eyes lit up, and he did not lower his hand, which meant he was ready for battle, uttering the programmed command that in addition to Shan Yu and Mrs. Yu, the rest of the espers could be destroyed. Mr. Lo's creation was already prepared to strike, but all it got was a couple of unfortunate sparks. Looking at his hand, the robot concluded that, at the moment, launching the repulsors of the upper limbs is impossible. The machine began to use absolutely all the functions built into it, but they appeared as an error on the screen. Thea was terribly pleased with how good she was, because the next moment the robot even began to analyze the potential of his opponent, since he felt a failure in the activation of the energy cores. With a happy face, the girl raised the gun in front of the car again, and at the moment when the notification about T's ability to disable equipment came, she confirmed that there was no point in kicking. In order to make her task easier, Taya made it so that the robot's ability to move was blocked, so he went into a forced shutdown just as the girl fired a bullet at him. Even before shutting down, Mr. Luo's creation took a bullet right in front of its face without any problems. The crumpled piece of iron, still smoking, fell from the robot's hand as he stared intently at his opponent. Steam began to come out of the car, supporting its ability to move, which is why it immediately began to slouch. Thea still stood there dumbfounded by how this piece of iron had caught the bullet and considered it an amazing gesture, but she didn't say anything out loud. The girl accepted completely and fully that this was a worthy creation for the secret weapon of the great Master Lo. Having walked around her opponent, Tay, with a satisfied face, clarified that she was sure that the master would not have objected if she had taken the robot apart a little to take a deeper look at the structure. The girl couldn't wait to get inside the machine, so she immediately got down to business and, resting her foot on the robot's back, began to pull on the tubes, saying that no one would be against it, especially the dead master. Thea was so engrossed in the robot that she didn't notice the approach of a pink car in which a cute girl was telling her assistant to open the door, but she warned her mistress that she had detected interference ahead. When the car with the lady was already close enough, only then did Thea decide to finally pay attention to the noise behind. Yuan Ye's loyal assistant told her young mistress that she could no longer be in autopilot mode, and the wheels began to screech along the road, leaving a black trail. Li shouted to Yuan that, in that case, she would have to leave her assistant for a while and take on the mission. Yuan turned around quickly and opened the doors as the young lady had asked, and Li was already ready to jump to meet the enemy. And the guys were still having their own showdowns under the dome, and Lu Jichuan, seriously afraid for little Shan, warned him that he could have died if his abilities had not awakened. And the boy lay on his stomach with a satisfied face looking at his partner, while Lu asked again what was happening now that he could see the future. Instead of a yes or no answer, there followed a quiet voice from Shan, who went to his friend by the name, thereby asking him to supposedly listen carefully. The guy pointed out to Chuan that he should not go outside the dome under any circumstances, and this was connected with the vision. Shan lay on the ground and watched in horror before him what no one else could see, and this vision frightened him the most. The young man saw a picture of how the person closest to him at the moment was being killed by someone very strong, and he could do nothing about it, and this was the last time they looked at each other. And when Shan in horror frantically tried to call his friend, a strong explosion occurred behind him, but who did it was unknown, just as it was unknown who killed Chuan. Gasping for air and breathing heavily, Shan woke up after his vision, as if for a moment he had disappeared from the place where he was. The guy burst into tears, begging and forbidding Lu to leave the dome because death awaited him there. Chuan scratched his ear in irritation after such a shout and clarified what exactly Shan saw in his vision of the future. You answered Ji that he would die if he left this essentially safe place at the moment. Lu looked at the guy attentively and even sternly while he continued to shout to his friend that he would die if he left the dome. Chuan, unable to bear this youthful hysteria, brought the guy to his senses by going down to him and giving him a good whack, claiming that apparently his powers had not yet awakened, or if they had awakened then with some kind of glitch. But Shan continued to be serious and assured Lu that although he saw literally for a moment what awaited him, he was sure that this was not a mistake. In a calm voice, No Shan asked Chuan not to leave the dome again, as if it would be as painful for the boy as losing a chun once. But Lu's stern grimace changed to a sly smile, and a prank was clearly born in his head that he absolutely had to carry out. To begin with, Chuan removed the shackles that still held the guy, thereby showing that he would still go against the young man's word. The chains sparked as they returned in power to their master before becoming useful to him again in battle. Lu walked confidently towards the exit of the dome because he believed that there was nothing to wait for, and besides he was being eaten away by curiosity about what was waiting for him outside. While Pei Xingho and Xia Mei were sitting opposite each other near the dome on the roof, not only the guys from the enemy team were watching them, but also one of Qin Tian's messengers who explained to him on the phone that the black collar had almost killed the silver one. The guy couldn't understand what he had missed, but things were bad, and one of Zhou's feathered assistants was flying over his head. The observer nervously asked his boss to hurry, otherwise there would be one less on the battlefield. And staring at the girl who sat motionless, the guy prayed that Qin would actually arrive on time. It was hell in the exile zone because rations were thrown right onto the road, but people continued to run after the truck to grab some food for themselves, and at the same time Qin was talking on the phone with his friend. Qin had his own plan on how to help Pei and everyone else, so while the truck was transporting them, he threw out the rations, and his friend nearby shouted into a megaphone that there were enough provisions in the port that could be obtained for free if they got there first. People pushed and fought for these boxes, and after hearing this, without thinking, they rushed after the truck because it would show them the way to the supplies. The unfortunate people were already more like wild animals who were ready to rip each other's throats out for a piece of food, and two individuals were watching all this in a dark alley. Two bandits also heard about the announcement and decided not to lag behind the others and also go and look at the promised supplies. The young man who was helping Qin turned to him nervously, warning that if Madame found out about their plan and the leaking of information about the location of the provisions, then they would get waffles, namely their severed heads would be displayed on the display case. Tian smiled sarcastically and, patting the guy on the head, sarcastically clarified that there was a small amendment and that it would not be their heads that would be cut off but only the guy's head. The young man felt completely uneasy and, letting out a nervous laugh, he understood what the boss was getting at, because if the lady found out about their intrigues, then they would be dead anyway, whether they went to the port or returned to the gang. Qin caught the moment when the rather strong Pei was unable to defeat the scum, which meant that their black collars were only for cover. Looking at the people running after them, the king of the ring realized that if Pei was in a dire situation, then there was only one outcome for all of them. Tian banged on the side of the truck, indicating to the driver to press the pedal to the floor in order to at least protect himself from the angry and hungry crowd. And having comfortably sat down among the provisions, the fighter decided that in fact it didn't matter at all what happened to them, so he could play for all he was worth. And Mei continued to talk to Shinho for now not killing her, but telling her thoughts about how wonderful the moment before death is. The brothers in misfortune watched their friend as she explained to Pei that it was in the short moment before leaving for another world that they all became equal. Also, the owner of the poisonous flower decided to clarify for the girl that if even a strong Esper could not avoid his own death, then what can we say about ordinary people? And without waiting for an answer, Mei smiled easily and mockingly asked for forgiveness from Shinho for completely forgetting about the girl's lack of strength to talk. But Pei, although very weakly and barely audibly, still said the word "your first," causing Mei to be surprised. And the second word from Shinho was "name," because of which the poisonous flower even lowered her head to better hear her opponent. The last thing Pei could utter was a 3-word request for Mei to state her name and continued to stare intently at the enemy. But Xia stood over her victim a little confused and remained silent, because she didn't understand how a completely paralyzed man could still say anything. And when Pei's eyelids closed, she heard Mei's caustic remark that there was no need for a corpse to know such information. Shinho heard her name, but it was no longer the voice of her opponent, but the distinct voice of her father, which she could always recognize even though there was complete darkness and silence around. The girl turned into the void, asking her father where he was so that he would call her again, and she would know where to go. Pei woke up from hearing a cicada making noise somewhere on the street, and besides that it was light and smelled of wood. Around the bed there were pillows that were clearly unnecessary and not particularly comfortable, and in the middle of the huge bed lay a girl covered with a blanket and gradually waking up. It was difficult for the eyes to open fully because of the bright sunlight that was pouring throughout the room. The first thing Pei saw was a beautiful drawing of a dragon on the ceiling, and it seemed that it was about to come to life and wriggle its flexible body around the room. Finally, the sleeping beauty sat up in bed, rubbing her sleepy eyes with her hands, thereby helping herself to wake up faster. But the lightness and pleasant sensations did not last long because Pei felt her wounds and immediately grabbed the sore spot. The girl stared at where there were many more bandages like the ones she already had on her, which meant that someone had helped her. But still, one question tormented Shinho, namely, that after death wounds are not bandaged, so she tried to understand whether she was alive. And after some moment the girl realized that since she was breathing, seeing, hearing, and even moving, it turned out that she was able to survive. The next thing the young lady did for herself was to finally get out of bed in order to make sure that she was also able to walk. The only thing that interested Shinho when she approached the table were the bright red sticks that she wanted to look at. In the girl's hands were the remaining parts of whole sticks that were important to her, and she could only look at them. With big eyes full of sadness, Shinho looked at an object that was common to many people and that was dear to her. And suddenly, while looking at the sticks, the girl was distracted by a male voice behind the door, who asked a certain Jimon whether she had fertilized the beds today. Now a female and clearly irritated voice addressed Pei Firen with a remark that he was sitting idle and only wearing out his pants so he could work in the garden himself, but the gentleman asked why he was waiting for the girl to wake up. Zinho very quietly and carefully opened the door, continuing to listen to Jimon's indignation about the fact that the gentleman was simply a lazy person who hid behind a child and only went to the garden once this week. The girl watched a very funny picture of a woman pulling an adult man by the ear and scolding him, saying that she would go and tear everything out by the roots if he did not go himself and restore order, and Pei only smiled. Jimon didn't stop and pulled her ear as hard as she could, so that Pei didn't have a chance to escape. Shinho looked with alarm at how the lower-ranked silver one was treating the gold one so freely and strictly. What a relief it was for the gentleman when he noticed the little girl in the doorway and asked how she was feeling. Pei continued to smile, but at the same time rubbed his ear, which had been twisted quite a bit, but judging by everything he didn't mind. Shinho immediately assumed a defensive pose, and her eyes showed wariness like a kitten who had been hurt once and could only hiss now. The first thing Pei decided to ask the little girl besides her well-being was whether she liked growing vegetables, but he immediately received a slap in the face from his assistant and a remark that a person needs recovery and rest and not to be pestered with garden beds. Shinho had already concluded that she had never met such wonderful gold ones before, but she followed the gentleman, listening to his not particularly interesting chatter about how he grew the vegetables they eat himself, so the little girl would also try them at dinner. The girl stopped, looked at the golden disc in the sky, and listened to the noise of the ears of corn, which were no less beautiful than the sun. The earth was fragrant, and everything that was in it and above it bloomed and smelled, showing a completely different picture of the world. Shinho directly asked Mr. Pei why he saved her, although in fact she was already so disappointed in her own life that she did not really care to know the answer. Feijan, without turning to the little girl, answered the question with a question about how sad it would be to leave such an amazing world at such a young age. Shinho did not hide her feelings from the adult and stated that she had no reason to live in this world, so nothing was holding her here. Feijan felt sad from such speeches of such a small man who had really seen a lot but not what he could. Therefore, taking off his straw hat, Pei turned to the little girl and also confessed to her that he had no children, so if Shinho didn't mind, then from now on he would like to offer her to be his daughter. The girl could not believe what the man with the golden collar and unlimited possibilities said, and she was even more shocked when Feijan asked her to put aside her past and become part of the Pei family. And before Shinho answered anything, Pei gave his word that the baby had nothing more to fear, and no one would know that she was on Pantheon territory. Feijan would not be himself if immediately after such solemn speeches, he did not make a joke about how he keeps secrets as well as he grows vegetables, trying to show that he has a sense of self-irony. But in front of the cheerful Pei stood a terribly serious Shinho, asking if he was afraid that he would cause problems for his clan. Sitting down opposite the little girl, Feijan tried to make the same serious look and explained that if he was really worried about trouble, she wouldn't be here. Shinho glanced at the floor, looking again with her sad big eyes, and asked directly what Pei wanted from her, still unable to believe that someone could just let her into the family in safety. Once again answering a question with a question, Feijan asked whether he really needed to want something from the little girl for her to decide to stay. There was silence in response, and Pei decided to tell Shinho something about what was really important at the moment, namely the protection of one child, who just like the girl had unlimited possibilities that would manifest themselves in the future. Feijan put on his Zinho hat, showing concern because the sun was blazing hotter than usual that day, and they still had to pick green peppers and cherry tomatoes, to which the girl agreed, but in fact these were the vegetables she couldn't stand. But instead of collecting vegetables for dinner, the little girl was distracted by some sounds coming from the thick bushes. Following the faint sound, Shinho pushed aside the leaves and saw a bird on the ground whose feathers were covered in blood. The girl carefully took the poor fellow in her arms, wanting to help her as much as she could. For some time, Shinho listened to the barely audible chirping and call for help of the bird, which was becoming weaker and weaker but did nothing. The bird's voice faded more and more, and the little girl looked, realizing that most likely the creature was in great pain if it could only whistle quietly and plaintively. Shinho couldn't think of anything else but to put her hand on top and start pressing on the poor guy with force so that the pain would go away as quickly as possible. Pei arrived in time and, having slowed down, asked his daughter to give him the wounded bird to help her survive. Shinho obediently handed the bird to Feijan and spoke for the first time, wondering what he was going to do with the creature. Since Pei possessed fire, without answering anything, he simply began to show the girl what such a dangerous element could be. Without thinking twice, Shinho asked if Pei really wanted to roast this unfortunate bird, which made him confused, and he replied that of course that was not what he was going to do. Still not understanding, the little girl just wanted to ask what Feijan was going to do. And then the fire in the Esper's hand flared up, surprising Shinho even more. The girl looked at the bird, which was literally lying on fire but was not burning, and this caused bewilderment and a lot of questions. Pei noticed how Shinho looked at his hands and began to explain that everything in this world can be used, and this includes gold, wood, electricity, and even sound, and that higher Espers can control these elements. And when the bird, instead of a plaintive squeak, began to chirp and come to life, Feijan added that although there are countless high ones in the pantheon, does Zinho know why only a few were able to receive a special rank? Still in the fire, the bird took off, and Pei expressed his opinion that the key to understanding the power is the realization that it has a light and dark side, and Shinho looked with delight at how the bird came to life as if it were a miracle. The little girl thought at that moment that she had never seen anyone who was able to use fire like that, so she immediately asked Feijan if this flame could really heal and not hurt. Pei was glad to finally see the girl with at least some emotion on her face, so he smiled and sheepishly justified himself by saying that it wasn't that it was a cure but definitely help in making the bird feel better. Feijan immediately demonstrated to Zinho that if you perceive the element you wield as a force of destruction, it will be a deadly weapon. The girl again could not contain her surprise, and her mouth opened wide, looking at such a powerful force in the hands of the Esper. And when Pei continued to explain to the little girl that where there is death, there is actually life, he turned her attention in a different direction. Feijan, with the help of fire, seemed to create a huge tree and showed the other side of controlling power as creative, which on the contrary can save from danger. Very abruptly and unexpectedly, Pei turned to the girl and pointed his finger at her while remaining silent for a split second. But in order not to overtire and frighten the little girl, Feijan concluded that how the power is revealed will depend on what is happening in the heart of the person who wants to use it. The bird that had been sitting on the girl's hat before fluttered up, and Shinho carefully reached out for it, with her hand repeating the most important words of everything Pei had said, namely the fire of the heart. Feijan liked what his daughter had chosen for herself, and noted that it was a very beautiful name, so now they will call it Fire of the Heart. Shinho looked at the flying bird and clarified that this sparrow was exactly like her, but Pei did not quite understand this statement, and the girl explained that they were united by the chance they had received to live in a new way. Having risen from the ground, the little girl stood straight and quiet in front of her future teacher, and declared that she wanted to learn the same thing that Pei could do, and he was not against them trying to do it. Feijan brought the girl to a room that was specially isolated and introduced her to the training area. Afterwards, Mr. Pei turned to his assistant Jimon and asked him not to watch TV series here, since that's what the cinema was for, but she waved him off, so that the slacker wouldn't mumble, and said hello to Zinho. The little girl bowed very timidly and also greeted Manjie, not yet knowing how to communicate with this woman. But Jimon did nothing but admire the young talent, whose smile spread into a light and warm one without saying anything else. The training began immediately, and the first thing that Sinkan needed to learn to do was to imagine the temperature of the flame. The little girl showed the light in her hands with such delight, expecting that Pei would now praise her, but he gestured for her to look carefully. The next moment Feijan activated his power, smiling as if it was fun, and Zinho shouted that it was too hot, but the master replied that it was supposed to be that way. Feijan suddenly stopped emitting his power because he saw that he had gone too far for the first time and rushed to apologize to the girl. Jimon approached the calendar that hung on the wall, so that in this closed room she could somehow navigate the days that would slip through her fingers, and at that moment it was July 19th. How scared Feijan was to train his daughter, especially when he heard her scream from feeling such a high temperature. But then during training the day passed and Jimon tore off a page of the calendar just like a day in her life that had inevitably passed. The most interesting thing about Pei and Zinho's training was that the girl was not going to give up, and no matter how much pain she was in, she was ready to continue. So she said it again and surprised Feijan with her enthusiasm. The days melted away one after another, and in addition to the fire tests, one could also hear talk about how the flame was not something that fell from the sky, but in order to be on par with others one needed to train daily. But Shinho said that she understood this. With each passing day, the fiery strikes that could be seen through the glass of the room became stronger and sometimes frightened Jimon very much because she was worried about the baby. Gradually, the camera began to turn from white to black, taking into account the frequency of Feijan and Zingo's activities. And after some time, the room began to resemble a battlefield with many black charred spots. Pei only continued to remind his daughter that her body had to get used to the pain that fire brought, and in fact Zingo was so strong that she continued to endure it, and Jimon periodically watched their training. Jimon may not have said this directly to the girl, but she was rooting for her with all her heart and believed in her as if she were her own child. One day the guys passed by the room on their way to training, and Pei casually asked his assistant to bring lunch, to which she said that as soon as possible. After some time, the little girl herself walked past, declaring that she was going to train, while Pei and Jimon did not even pay attention because they were engrossed in watching a movie. But Shinho decided otherwise and grabbed Feijan by the scruff of the neck and dragged him along until the poor guy, already a devoted fan of the series character, did not want to leave the idiot box. Along with her endurance and strength, Zingo herself grew, and one of the many days after training she noticed Jimon asleep on the sofa. The little girl, without thinking twice, approached the coolest woman she had ever met and carefully covered her with a blanket, and Jimon, half asleep, praised the girl for working so well. Zinho sat down in front of Jimon's face and quietly said with a smile on her face that she was also doing great and thanked her for her support. The girl stood in the cell and held the dangerous element in her hands, rejoicing at her result, and shared with Feijan that now it was almost like the fire of the heart and did not even burn at all as before. Pei gently stroked the baby's head and asked her not to be too strict with herself, because even if the fire of the heart does not work out, he believes that in the future Shinho will still become an outstanding esper. For the first time after such a long time, the little girl lowered her head again, upset that only special ones are capable of creating the fire of the heart, and she will never be able to comprehend this secret. But then Shinho clenched her fists and admitted that even if she couldn't comprehend the secret, she still wasn't going to back down. So she asked Feijan to continue teaching her. Pei was incredibly proud of how strong his daughter was, and not just physically, because her soul was also a very powerful hearth, and he happily agreed to continue their training. In addition to the camera, Shinho also had training to strengthen her body, so she went jogging under the moonlight. And with every step she took, she got closer to the best version of herself, still occasionally violating Pei's request not to be too hard on herself. On a hot day, Jimon noticed Zingo near the beds and asked her to rest at least when she had a snack, but the girl with a sandwich in her mouth said that she was just on a break right now, so she was watering the beds with 2 buckets on her shoulders. What can I say, if the girl trained even when she was in the bathroom, which looked so serious that it was even a little funny because you could have set up a sauna for yourself. Jimon periodically reminded her miss that if she sat in the bathroom a little longer and also trained, then eventually her skin would peel off. Even before going to bed, Shinho quietly told herself that she could do it, she just needed a little concentration. And the next moment a column of fire pierced the blanket and rushed up to the ceiling, which Shinho did not expect at all. The girl jumped out of the burning bed, calling for help from Manjie, immediately shouting out only the word fire extinguisher. Jimon prepared all the fire extinguishers for Zinho's next training session, and wiping the sweat from her forehead prayed that they would be enough at least this time. When Pei removed the fire to see what condition Shinho was in, he saw her lying on the floor and covering her face with her hand. But immediately after the attack stopped, the girl got up on all fours and said her cherished word again, although she hadn't really caught her breath yet. The next training session also ended with Shinho sweating, profusely clenching her fists and shouting at Pei to do it again. Already completely covered in burn patches, the girl became stronger with each rise to her feet after the fiery blow, and this time she was no longer lying on the floor but confidently standing on her knee. Not without the fact that sometimes it was really painful and the enthusiasm faded a little, but the baby still asked for more. Sometimes Pei didn't always see Zinho's face, and the training could end with her not having the strength to raise her head, but her voice still sounded just as firm. No abrasions, burns, or even powerlessness could stop the girl on her way to becoming a better version of herself. There were a huge number of such attempts, and they poured out day after day like those sheets of paper with the days of the calendar, until the most important day came when Zinho called Feijan father and asked him to try again. Jimon's attitude towards Feijan also changed, and at some point when she wanted to say that she would stew eggplants with potatoes for dinner, and then call him a slacker out of habit, she restrained herself and called him master. When the assistant said that she had bought new shoes for the girl, she also almost called the gentleman as usual, but he said that she didn't have to hold back and she could call him whatever she wanted. Therefore, the next time Jimon ran nervously after the guys to put out the fire, and if Zinho was as always miss for her, then she still called the master a slacker, shouting at them to be more careful in the end. For the first time in a long time, such a familiar fire took on a new form, and it seemed so simple, but considering what Shinho had passed through, even such a small flame was unusual for her. The second light came on, and with it came the expression that was so humorous for this house, that someone doesn't know how to light candles at all. It seemed like two small sources of light and heat illuminated the room, and the gift that stood in front of the little one in the form of a strawberry cake with the number 10. Pei and Jimon sat with firecrackers in their hands next to Zinho, and the father announced that they would now celebrate the girl's first year in their family, in honor of which the little girl's favorite strawberry cake was served, to which he heard the woman mutter that in fact it was his favorite cake. The adults firmly grabbed the firecrackers with their hands, so as not to delay such a wonderful moment, and smiled with all their hearts, rejoicing at this moment. With two pops, colorful confetti flew out of the party poppers, and Shinho looked up to see something new in her life. The girl watched as the colored pieces of paper fell down and heard congratulations on her first year in the family, and at the same time on her 10th birthday. The father held a red box in his hands and told his daughter that this was her gift since the previous pair had broken, so Pei asked his friend to make identical ones to the girls. In a beautiful red box with flowers lay no less beautiful bright sticks of bloody color, and Pei seemed to present a gift for his daughter, saying that it was made by the best weapons master in the city who had to be coaxed. It was the first time Shinho had celebrated something and received something as a gift, so she looked at everything without knowing what to do or how to react, and her father was already impatient to find out if the girl liked what he had done for her. But the little girl, instead of being happy as 10-year-old children do, bowed to her father, promising that she would not disappoint him and would protect the child from the prophecy. Pei tenderly called his daughter silly and said that this gift was first and foremost for her and for her protection, so he asked her to at least take it in her hands first. The little one looked at the table and everything that was on it, but she didn't dare even touch the gift with her eyes, and even Jimon asked her not to be shy and to quickly take the chopsticks. Shinho sat motionless but heard the request to accept the gift, but her body seemed not to obey, although she wanted to take the gift and hug everyone. Jimon moved closer and as always smiled warmly and kindly at the girl, warning that she couldn't wait any longer, so she needed to take the gift in her hands. After the words of support, Manhwa disappeared as if she had never been there, and it suddenly became dark and cold. The girl only had time to rush towards Jimon and shout her name, but it was too late, and now everything depended only on her. Sitting in the darkness, Zinho denied what was happening to her and begged the Manhwa to return, and that she needed her more than ever, but now the girl needed to return to herself. The little girl looked at her father, who also began to dissolve, but his calmness was as always stronger than any weapon, and he shared it, saying that there was nothing to be afraid of since it was just an illusion. Pei smiled and asked his daughter to hurry, but no matter how calm the image of her father was in Zinho's head, she, like a little girl, asked her father not to leave her. She screamed with her soul for him to stay. The last thing the father told his daughter was for her to catch the right one, and the man's eyes were the last thing Shinho saw. The girl rushed to grab the image of her father, but at the last moment her hand did not touch anything, and there was emptiness around again. The poor girl grabbed her head and screamed enough, and tears began to flow from her eyes, which were so difficult for her to show because of her strictness towards herself. Shinho lowered her head down, trying to figure out what to do next, and where to go. After hearing her own heartbeat, she raised herself up, remembering her father's request. At the moment when the girl began to return to herself, her body was wrapped in strong threads, and it was terribly difficult to move, but one of her wands appeared in front of her, brightly flickering with its red color in the darkness. With tears in her eyes and pain in her body, Shinho rushed for her weapon, screaming that she couldn't let the fire escape from her. Step by step, the girl's threads were torn, leaving them behind, and she was closer to catching the fire of her life and not letting go. Suddenly, the stronghold under her feet disappeared, and Shinho made something like a jump that turned into a fall, and the threads practically disappeared from her body, and there was a feeling that she was already close. When the red flickering was close again, Zingo became as mature as she was during the battle with Xia Mei, but it was still too early to relax. Holding tightly onto the blood-colored wand, the girl mentally told her father that she had succeeded and caught what he was talking about. Shinho suddenly inhaled so sharply and could not catch her breath, but she did not let go of the captured source from her hand, and now the sensations changed. The girl's hand was clutching both a physical and an ephemeral object, as if something was still missing, and in such a critical state it was difficult to understand what exactly needed to be done. Shinho's weapon-like form turned into a red streak as she opened her hand and finally asked herself what she was holding. Looking at her feet, the girl asked the next question about where she was, which meant the body's response to consciousness and therefore a return. Shinho's opponent was very strong, and her poison should have already killed the girl, but even though she fell to the ground from pain and powerlessness, she was not going to give up. Breathing heavily, the girl clung to the red thread, as if it were her own life, and only this thin material gave her light in the impenetrable darkness. The thread became fire in Shinho's hand, and in her head, she heard the phrase her father had once told her about not approaching the fire raging in the steppe. The girl squeezed the flame in her hand, remembering how Pei had revived a bird with fire, showing that power could be creative and not destructive. Mei's poisonous flower disappeared, as did the pain, and the father's gentle voice spoke to his daughter, informing her that from this moment on her life was in her own hands, and it was up to her to decide what to do next. The flame grew brighter and stronger, and the key moment was the memory of how her father asked Shinho if she liked her name, to which she replied that she did, and that it meant Fire Star, which is quite close to Sinho, that is fire of the heart. The girl was lying face down, so Mei, deciding that she was finished with one, turned her back and asked Yao Guang if he needed to make sure that the girl was dead. Staring as if through the girl, all the guy managed to shout to his sister was her name, trying to warn her about something. The hand of the one who was already dead suddenly grabbed Mei by the leg so tightly that this time it would be impossible to escape. Poisonous Ya only had time to look back when there was already a full-fledged fire show, especially in her honor, or rather in honor of her death. The explosion was so powerful that pieces of earth flew far beyond the battle site of two very strong rivals. Even the guys in the dome heard such an explosion, although before that they didn't care what was happening outside since they had their own showdowns. Shan noted that judging by the sound, Zinho had already entered the battle, although she had even managed to resurrect, but the guys did not know about this, so Ji simply agreed with the young man. Shan looked at his friend's back and mentally promised himself that he would not let Lu die because of him, since he had already lost one friend. Chuan stood quietly with his back to the young man, listening to what was happening outside in order to at least slightly understand what to do next. Given Shan's recent revelation of telekinesis, he didn't anticipate that Lu would turn around and respond to his thoughts by saying there was no point in connecting him with death with his stupid brain. The young man let out a nervous laugh, but he was in shock and still asked himself in his head how this bastard knew his thoughts. This time Lu didn't listen to the guy, but tried to get information from the outside to understand the level of threat to both him and the boy. After a few seconds, Lu Jichuan concluded that the one who could really kill him was already a corpse, although the battle behind the dome was still ongoing. Little Dudu hid his face behind the toy, hugging it tightly to himself, and Tian Lang could only watch as a similar fate awaited them all. Yao miraculously caught Mei taking the blow, from which the wall of the metal shipping container was washed as if a boulder had been thrown into it rather than a person. Still having feelings for that same girl from the experimental center, Guan asked Mei if she could stand, but the girl, still being just as cruel and embittered, hissed and said that she could do without help, so there was no need to interfere where she was not wanted. The two poor fellows, having suffered more than enough, were perhaps thinking together about death, while looking at the fire that seemed to block out even the sky itself. From the very center of the fire, the silhouette of a girl who had risen from the dead and had been greatly underestimated was approaching the enemies. The steps of the survivor were confident and firm, and it was as if an improved version of the warrior was walking towards the enemies. Shinho reminded Mei that she had never answered the question, even though she had seemed so graceful and polite at the beginning of the conversation. Wiping the blood from her face, Pei Zingo reminded herself that she would still like to know the name of the enemy who made her so weak. Mei and Guan couldn't believe their own eyes, because just a moment ago they had seen with these same eyes the death of one of the defenders of the child of prophecy. Yao looked at his friend, knowing that her advantage was in surprise, and as soon as she revealed herself to the enemy, the chance to escape would be lost, and there would be no turning back. And looking at Shinho, the guy admitted that returning to life after Mei's poison is something amazing, And even more incredible is that such power cannot belong to someone with a silver collar, and now it is clear why she is the goal of the 8 great clans. Mei asked Yao to let her go, but it was difficult for the young man to do this because he understood what would happen next, and he also told the girl that in such a state she could not go into battle again. But Xia Mei had already suffered quite a lot in her life, so no matter how she emerged from the battle, she still decided to go to the end. The girl with the black collar and incredible artificial abilities cast perhaps one last glance and smile at the person closest to her before walking into the fire alive. Yao knew the wounded girl like himself and realized that it was better to let her go than to hold her, so the last thing he did was lightly push her, saying goodbye in this way. It was very painful for the guy to watch how Mei herself was going to her death, having already outwitted her so many times and escaped from the embrace of darkness, but he could not do anything about it because he knew that if the girl decided, she would go to the end. Xia approached her opponent like a wounded snake, leaving behind a bloody trail from which a poisonous plume emanated, and finally spoke up, saying that Shinho apparently would not die until he received an answer. Barely able to stay on her feet, Mei ordered Shinho to listen carefully and remember, so that she wouldn't have to repeat the answer to her stupid question again. Poison Flower raised her head and looked at her rival, and said that her name was Xia Mei, thereby showing that she did not regret anything, but on the contrary was proud of her position. Pei, as if acknowledging her opponent's strength, said that her name was too ordinary, and that it did not suit her. Through the pain, the Poisonous Flower laughed, agreeing with her opponent's words, and closed her eyes for a moment to catch her breath. Mei held the hand from which she was dripping blood, and at that moment she even felt a crunch, which meant that every step she took was an additional broken bone. Only after the piercing pain and the sound of crunching bones did Xia suddenly realize that there was essentially no living space left on her body. Closing her eyes again, the girl concentrated on her last sensations in order to give it her all and not think about the result. Bent over in pain, Mei was going crazy from not understanding why, being on the brink of death, she was so happy, although she should have been afraid. Shinho turned to her rival and honestly admitted that it was only thanks to her that she still had that aching feeling in her chest that helped her return to life. But armed with a red wand, the fiery soul still suggested ending their acquaintance with Mei, since she did not want to remain in that form any longer. And in her thoughts, Shinho thought that most of all she would not want Lu to see her like this, since he would most likely start grumbling and start trying to figure things out. While the showdown was going on at the port, someone in a huge hall was watching a recording on a screen where reporters were asking to turn on the cameras and the live broadcast as quickly as possible. The presenter, holding her cap on her head, told the camera that she was currently at Lu's mountain estate because an unexpected man-made storm had interrupted the interview. The girl asked the cameraman to point the camera at the storm's epicenter as quickly as possible and tried to point her finger at a barely visible black dot. The cameraman zoomed in on the image, but the lens hadn't yet caught focus, so all that was visible was a purple tornado. Gradually, as the image approached in the brightest part of the tornado, a small dot actually became visible practically in the sky where lightning was countless. The outlines of a man hanging among the flashing lightning became more and more visible, but this did not pose a threat to him. When the lens zoomed in as far as possible, it turned out that hanging in the air among the heavenly fire was not just a person but a child who apparently was the creator of the spectacle. While the child was hanging between heaven and earth, everyone around was shouting that if he was still alive and this was happening around him, then he was definitely a descendant of God himself. The girl couldn't tear her eyes away from the spectacle in the sky, but she said that Lu Jichuan could hardly be called a divine rank holder yet. A voice behind the presenter finished speaking and informed everyone that the child in the sky was very strong, and there was no need to doubt it, and everyone recognized these words as Mr. Wu Yu. Known as a divine-ranked woman, she warned people that Lu's power was so great that it didn't matter what color his ring was. The cameras were pointed at the lady, and the presenter asked a counter-question provocatively, "What does it mean that it doesn't matter what color the boy is?" Mrs. Wu came down to the people and directed the presenter's thoughts in the right direction, asking who she thought benefited from the existence of the collars, but the girl did not understand. Coming even closer, the lady herself answered her question that collars are important to those like them, that is, to those inside the walls, and this was the cruel truth. The next revelation was that as long as the ring on the neck exists, the top can honestly and fairly exploit and oppress other people and therefore control most of the resources of a given society. Madame Wu Yu watched the hurricane as the most beautiful spectacle, and at the same time continued to say that as long as the colored ranks exist, the perverted desires, and with them the causeless killings, will not end. The woman bitterly reminded that the collars were a huge lie created by a small group of people, among whom unfortunately she herself was. The child did not resist what was happening, but on the contrary continued to be in this state and observed his development. The moment Lu sensed the presence of the divine-ranked woman, he turned and looked straight at her with a humble gaze. And the lady proudly declared that she was waiting more for the boy to break out of here and not become like her than the likelihood of him becoming a divine rank. The video stopped at the moment when the words began to grate on the ears of the person watching the recording, which means that Ms. Yu said everything correctly. The woman who watched the recording found it funny that their mistress goddess was so naive that she handed over to the beneficiary the hope of breaking the rules. There were two figures in the hall, one of which stood in the shadow of a woman literally and figuratively, and looked at the portraits on the walls while listening to the chatter of her superior. The owner of the black robe finally spoke to the important person named Qingdai, asking if she was as naive as Madame Yu. Qingdai picked up the glass with the remains of wine, changed the tone of the conversation, and provocatively asked if the demoness didn't like how they spoke about the goddess. Feeling the contempt in the woman's words, the demoness casually said that she might not like it because she was a demon and moreover, like Qingdai, was loyal to the Lin clan and not to the Wu. The demoness he warned Qingdai that no monster having tasted freedom in every sense of the word would return back to the cage. And when he turned to the photographs of those very monsters, she added that Qingdai would not lose everything by deciding to bet on the trained savages. The temperature in such a large room rose noticeably, and the silence between the two fires was filled with the subtle sound of a finger running along the rim of a glass. The demoness slid her fingers over the photographs of the unique ability holders and continued to bring Qingdai back to reality, explaining that no matter how much she created it, he was right that espers and monsters are still different in nature, even if we take Lu as an example, who has a gift of 2 from above and can eventually reach the maximum. Stopping her hand on the portrait of Xia, May the demoness drew a parallel from Lu to monsters who, unlike the former, use their powers chaotically. And just as the shadow was about to say what the artificially grown rats could achieve with their actions, a glass flew right over her hand and shattered, leaving a bloody trail on the portraits. As if blood were flowing, sweet, intoxicating water flowed down May's photograph, precisely reflecting her immediate fate on the battlefield. Qingdai was furious that she had to remind her again that more time was needed, but not only was there no time, but he also failed to keep the rats in the conference room, but now she was boldly throwing ridicule in her face. The camera also cried for people like Qingdai because she was clearly in trouble in her head, because after such rage she became sweet again, and changing her voice said that she probably went too far. He noted the condition of the leader, stating that today she is not like usual and not herself, which means something has happened. Turning to the photographs on the wall, the demoness realized that it took so long to influence the sharp turns in the cold man's condition. He remained silent at first, instead wondering whether she should voice her suspicions out loud in front of Qingdai, so as not to end up dead here. Looking where the glass flew, the shadow understood and even asked if Qingdai had really found someone truly special among the rats, which is why the storm of emotions had occurred. Some have an avalanche of feelings, while others have a rain of poisonous butterflies that were the last beautiful breath of a rather powerful monster. The beautiful but poisonous creature made its last wing beats just like its owner, wanting to leave behind an elegant, deadly trail even before it left. Only in physics, May's efforts were reflected by drops of blood, of which she had already lost a lot, but for such a hardened body and spirit, broken bones were not the limit. Every movement brought May hellish pain, but she had already become so accustomed to this sensation that it even seemed sweet to her, and she kept telling herself that it was not over yet. Shinho walked towards the poisonous creature, cutting through every butterfly in her path with her wand, leaving behind all the doubts and fears that she had before. Stretching her hand forward, the poisonous flower shouted the name of her opponent, showing her final dash, which was still as beautiful as she was. An eerily beautiful purple meadow appeared on the battlefield, and Tian Lang noted that apparently May was not going to return, which is why little Dudu asked his elder sister to stop her and save her. The guy's jaw clenched and he got angry, but not so much at the boy as at the situation as a whole, because if you think about it, they spend their whole lives doing the idiocy that is sent to them from above. Dudu could not react in any other way than to cry bitter tears, not fully understanding what the 3 older boys who miraculously survived until today had gone through. Tian Lang glared at the boy and muttered through his teeth that no matter how much he saved that wretch May, she would not say thank you, and this angered the boy because he had once saved Yao from her, but his friend had instead sided with the girl. It was unbearably painful for Guan to watch the torment of the one he once loved and wanted to protect, but she refused his help once again. Only thanks to her own strength, May was still able to stay on her feet while large poisonous flowers filled everything around, but this time she was unable to reach Shinho. Pei watched what was happening around her and acknowledged that her opponent's strength was indeed a beautiful sight, but it was also a reminder of how deadly beauty could be. The fire star waved her red wand and regretted that she would not allow herself to lose to the same person twice. After the decision that came from Pei Xingho's fiery soul, the flowers began to burn and break, which became an equally beautiful sight. Among the sounds of flames and cracking stems, the loudest were the sounds of falling petals hitting the ground, marking the end of one story and the beginning of another. At the moment of the powerful explosion, a crowd of people eager to get their rations were heading towards the iron boxes, and although many were frightened by what they heard, they were not going to stop, because if there was an opportunity to eat even before death, they would do it. Qin Tian's assistant followed him and reminded the people to keep up with him so that they could receive the promised provisions. Only one small person from the entire crowd paid attention to the petals that were floating in the air and sometimes disappeared there without reaching the ground. The girl was intrigued by the beautiful butterfly which she reached out to, and although she was also hungry, she could not miss such a beautiful and bright sight. On the battlefield, smoke mixed with petals of poisonous flowers and dust that rose from the ground after the fight between two strong rivals. Something huge knocked Shinho to the ground, but because of the wall of dust it was impossible to see what it was or who it was, so all he could do was guess and keep his distance. The next blow was even stronger and the girl was knocked down on her shoulder blades, and she clearly felt that this was not the work of Mei but of someone else and much bigger. The plush rabbit that Dudu had previously held in his hands had become the size of a house, and it turned out that the little boy knew how to control his toy, while Yao at that moment took Mei to a safe distance. In the blink of an eye, the rabbit shrank back down to the size of an ordinary toy so that Dudu could pick her up again. The little one ran after the older one while he was carrying Mei away and asked if his little sister was really feeling very bad, to which Yao replied that she was still alive, but yes, she was indeed in serious condition. Guan turned to the boy and asked him for forgiveness for having to intervene, and then asked him with concern if everything was okay and if he was injured. The little one squeezed his toy, saying that everything was fine with him, while continuing to talk about his worries for his elders and for them to remain safe and invisible. Mei may have heard the guy's conversation, but she no longer had the strength to answer anything or even open her eyes since her condition was truly critical. Yao leaned Mei against the iron box and called Chizu with an urgent request to come to the lands of the exiled due to Mei's serious injury, and to return to the lab after completing the main case, and all Tianlang could say about this was crap. Just as Guan asked little Dudu to look after Pei Xingho, a multitude of voices from the crowd going for provisions were heard behind him. The black collars were addressed rather sharply and rudely ordered to immediately get out of the way, which was in their own interests, but Guan was in no hurry to attack and watched. If before this the crowd had been walking calmly, now when they saw the containers they ran headlong, creating a hum like in a beehive. Qin Tian's assistant understood that if he didn't hurry to open the doors to the box, he would be eaten alive without exaggeration, since the crowd of people had been starving for a long time. No one paid attention to the fact that Dudu was still a child, or even to the fact that he could be an experiment and therefore could kill, so in an attempt to get food they pushed him aside. Yao picked up the baby and continued to watch the people who, without having received anything yet, had already begun to figure out who was standing where and how much they would take. Tianlang sat on top of the very box that was supposed to be opened and loudly called out to the crowd, but no one responded to him as a general hysteria began to grab as much as possible. Qin Tian's assistant was between two dangerous fires, where one was a crowd ready to tear him to shreds and on top was a monster that could also kill him, so he mentally prayed that no one would pay attention to him. The heavy doors of the container creaked open, and behind them was something that these people valued more than any treasure, and that was food in huge quantities. The poor fellows couldn't believe their luck and rushed at the boxes of food, no longer noticing whether there was anyone nearby or not. The most important thing was to grab as much as possible. The food fell on the floor and was immediately picked up by someone else, and there were shouts all around about whose piece of bread was whose, so it didn't take long for a fight to break out. Some people decided that it was better to eat some of it right there than to lose precious food along the way and still have to fight for it. The girl who was interested in the butterfly, Mei, was now quite close to the creator, but given her physical hunger, she also tried to collect as much food as possible, so she grabbed everything that was in front of her. As if sensing something, the girl glanced towards where the immobilized Mei was sitting, but due to the weakness of her body, she was rather slow to react. The little girl was most interested in the hands of the one who could show her much more beautiful things like that butterfly or the petals flying in the sky. Finally, the girl decided to come closer to Mei, but Yao gently stopped her, asking what she wanted to do, while he himself understood that the little girl did not pose a threat. The girl extended her hand forward to the stranger, giving him a wrapped lollipop, which was already quite strange for the locals. Carefully bending down, the little girl explained that if she ate the candy, the wounds would not hurt as much as they were doing to that girl now. Guan was shocked that the unfortunate child was ready to help strangers, and many questions appeared in his head, from who this girl was to how she knew about the wounds. Literally a second had passed after the conversation between the black collars from different worlds, when suddenly the bandit kicked the girl so hard that the poor thing flew to the side. The bandits began firing their weapons, warning people to put down everything they had taken down to the last crumb, since from that moment on all rations would be the property of the cannibal gang. The one who hit the girl again hit the other person on the head with his knee, shouting for him to spit out the food, and this time Yao got to his feet. The bandit looked at the guy who was approaching him, but he didn't care, since he regarded all black collars as trash that needed to be taught a lesson. The bald guy hid one of the pistols in a holster so that it would be easier for his hands to hold the machine gun, and if necessary fight off the bastards walking around. Guan gave the scum the opportunity to take their share of the provisions and leave on their own 2 feet for now because otherwise they would not be able to leave at all. The bandit pointed the barrel of his gun at Yao's forehead, and there was a click after which he told the guy that he knew what kind of scum was standing in front of him, and what he was going to do so, he warned him that it would be better to raise his hands and turn his back. The young man finished off the nervous asshole with his calmness, and even when the bald man asked if he was really a deaf idiot in front of him, Yao didn't react. At one point out of nowhere, a black sword as tall as him pierced the freak right through, so no one managed to pull the trigger, but Yao knew that Lan would be the first to give in. The body slid down the sword and blood spurted out like a fountain, but even with such a terrible sight, not a single muscle on Yao's face twitched. Among all the shouting and noise that was going on in the port, the loudest call was from Tian Lang, who said to look at him. If before this some people paid attention to the guy standing on top of the box, then after Lan repeated to look at him, everyone already saw a creepy creature that is not to be trifled with. Guan wiped the blood from his face and lowered his head to where the familiar voice of a girl, who could barely pronounce one word, was coming from. The little girl with animal fear in her eyes dried out the word Esper, while still continuing to obediently look at the creepy man on the box. And when the girl said the word savior, her gaze changed to one in which hope for something better still glimmered. People's hysteria for survival gave way to joy at the appearance of a savior, after which food was no longer shoved into mouths and pockets but thrown into the air. Guan was shocked by the people not understanding what was happening, and Lan was also shocked, but anger at the stupidity of these unfortunate creatures prevailed there. The girl instantly became bolder than ever and loudly asked if the Esper had come to free the lands of the exiled from the mark and the chaos that had reigned among the people. Staring at the now even stranger girl, Yao not only couldn't believe his eyes, but his ears seemed to be conveying something incomprehensible to him. Only thanks to Dudu did the guy take his mind off the mass madness and notice that the kid had informed him of their target's disappearance. There was nothing left for Yao to do but curse, but losing the target did not mean the mission was complete. That very target in the form of Zingo was carried in Qin Tian's arms, running away from the black collars, while also commenting that the girl looked rather pathetic. How could she have sunk to such a state? Pei muttered as if drunk that the fighter had not yet seen the state of her opponent, and if he had arrived a few minutes later, she would have decided everything herself, to which Qin thought in his head about the girl's sharp tongue. Shinho started to say in her current state that she could already be let go and that it would be better for the guy to leave, but he said that everything was fine and that it would be better for her to listen. In response to the exhausted girl's silent question, Qin happily replied that it was the pleasant sound of the dome opening. Lan watched from above, simultaneously watching how people scurried about like ants below, and how the dome began to fall apart into pieces, meaning the show was just beginning. The strict black shoes rebounded with a confident blow to the ground, and this sound could not be confused with anything else, especially if you already knew who you were dealing with. Shan was horrified when he saw what was happening outside. Lu was more interested in what kind of noise was going on around him, thereby showing his attitude towards the general situation. The first thing Shan noticed when he went outside was that Shinho was missing, but Ji reassured the guy that the girl would not let anyone harm her. Tian Lang bared his teeth, shouting at his opponents if they really hid in the dome because he wet his fashionable pants out of fear. Without warning, Yao pointed many of his swords at his opponents, and they were in for the same fate as the bandit who turned into the bloody Yushka, but the guys stood calmly. At least that's how Lu did it. Lightning flashed everywhere, crackling with tension, but Chuan with a smile decided to support the joke about wet pants and told the upstart on the box that now it would be visible whose legs would be wet. Again there were explosions and smoke, and it was unclear who dealt the greater blow since both Lu's and Yao's forces were quite powerful, so all that was left was to wait for the cloud to clear. People, despite the fact that they were finally able to get food, now threw it on the ground and saved their lives, shouting that they needed to get their legs in because they would be the first to die in the fight between the espers. Tian Lang laughed and shouted after the people to get lost quickly because, as they themselves said, these were not ordinary espers. Even though the guy wasn't much different from the people below, he found it very funny to watch how everyone was afraid of him, but if his abilities were taken away he would also die. The harsh experience of the experiment turned the wounded child into an angry and resentful monster who considered people with black collars to be worthless. On the ground in the footprints left by the shoe lay a candy wrapper which the girl tried to hand to Yao so that he could give it to Mei to ease the wound. Lan was glad to finally meet a worthy opponent and did not hide this from Lu, so now all that remained was to kill him, and all the time that was spent on preparation would not have been in vain. Guan looked up at his comrade and even called out to him, but the guy was blinded by the desire for the death of two very important people who had come out of the dome. Looking down, Yao turned on his head, unlike his friend, and thought about more than just completing the mission. For the guy, life still had value, but only for people close to him, and now Guan understood that if he entered the battle he could not guarantee the safety of Mei and Dudu. As if the young man's phone had just been rang, he was really hoping to see something there that would help them confront their rivals. The screen actually showed a conversation where Cheese reported that the issue with the special one had already been resolved and reinforcements would arrive in a few minutes. Guan was happy with this news because he understood that he could buy a little more time by calmly discussing everything with Lu and waiting for help from Mei. The young man told Ji that they had nothing to share with him, so he offered to give them the divine child, after which they would calmly disperse. Lu didn't interrupt the guy but listened attentively to what he said next about a pardon from the higher-ups and an end to the persecution of him, and waited for that very but to come. And at the moment of the but that Yao said, Yu's eyes filled with horror mixed with anger, as it was said that if the child did not go with the group, it would be considered a declaration of war on the 7 great clans. Chuan shielded the guy even more with his body while smilingly informing his opponents that of course there would be a declaration of war, since they had not decided to have a tea party here. In a more serious tone, Lu decided to remind them that in any case the small monsters should be grateful since they know better than anyone whose son is now in front of them. At this point Shan couldn't stand it any longer and asked what was going on and why these guys should be grateful and what he had to do with it. Ji heard the small one's questions but was more focused on what ability was currently attacking them, which made it difficult not to notice the similarities. Lu Ji-chuan remembered about the black swords, and this ability was possessed by Lady Yu, which she had to use in her defense. Mrs. Wu suffered because she committed murder, which was not typical for her, but she had no choice because any living creature will strive to protect itself. Having collected his thoughts, Lu looked at his opponent but spoke to the guy about the important information he would now need to remember. Shan listened and did not believe that now when he sees a person in a black collar but with abilities it is connected with him and his mother. The young man felt as if someone had driven a stake into his heart when he learned that all the experimental collars were able to survive until today only thanks to the blood of Lady Yu. The boy's ears were ringing from the tension, and the world no longer looked the same after realizing what some freaks did to his mother. The rivals stood silently for a while Shan repeated to himself this wild combination of words thanks to blood feeling, as if a part of himself had been taken away. Lana liked to mock, so she sarcastically asked if the child of God really didn't know what was going on and wanted to tell him himself. But Lu and Shan shouted in one voice that the idiots should shut up, and this showed that they were a team and not a defender and a child. Shan argued whether he had correctly understood the information about his mother's use and immediately asked the next question about something he still didn't know. This time Ji honestly answered that he himself knew very little, but he remembered that when Lady Wu was captured the Lin family demanded research into the gift of immortality in order to give it to other espers. Chuan explained that only their Lu family refused to participate in this horror and representatives were chosen from the other 7 great clans of families, but everything failed. The study failed because the 7 who took part, having received the blood of the mistress, did not become immortal but on the contrary turned into something between a man and a monster. After this successful experiment, the lab set a goal to modify as many black collars as possible to make them easier to control. After a short story, Lu admitted that he hadn't imagined that that bunch of rats would actually commit such a horror, and Shan immediately asked where the laboratory was because he knew that they had already tried to look for it but heard that it ended in failure. The young man was shocked that despite having such great resources, the Lu clan could not do anything to save his mother. Shan couldn't get his head around the fact that among the 8 great clans the Lu family was in 3rd place, and even with the change of generations it did not lose influence but still could not do anything. Anger and disappointment penetrated to the bones as such a powerful clan was unable to help the lady and only remained to watch from the sidelines. After all this reasoning, the guy had the following counter-question about what kind of power is concentrated in the pantheon. Now the young man was also overcome by the realization that Lu Xingo and the others understood what they were getting into and were still opposing the pantheon. A dead memory of the death of a friend who passed away for nothing appeared before Yu's eyes, and now the others themselves were going to meet the enemy. Thoughts began to squeeze his throat and choke Shan just like the bastard who killed his only friend had once tried to do, but this became the turning point. Yu now recalled everything that Lu had said, imagined his mother as a hostage, and realized that he was again faced with a choice of further actions. The young man clenched his fist so hard that he left bloody marks from his nails on his palm, as if his whole life was in his hand. Ji felt the feelings of the guy who suddenly had such a burden placed on him and therefore was honest with him until the end, telling him that there was nothing to hesitate about since those rats had sent their rivals to break him. Now Lu said what Madame Wu wanted so much, namely that it doesn't matter at all what ranks are assigned in this world, because his generation with Shan must break the rules. Yu was desperate, so all he could say was that he didn't understand the rules at all, which is why he didn't care, and he could only see his mother in his dreams. The look from uncertainty became cold, and Yu said that no matter how hard it was for him, he had to save his mother, because he knew she was still waiting for him. Chuan smiled, slyly stating the fact that the guy now has absolutely no hope for anything, but this is also a kind of impetus. Therefore, the lightning-fast guy reminded his friend of his own words that everyone is waiting for hope to appear. Suddenly, Sean realized that the guys who came to kill them clearly knew where the laboratory was located and suggested catching them and finding out everything through torture, which Lu was terribly happy about as the student surpassed the teacher. Lan was disgusted to watch the two idiots chirping because they could have been finished off several times by now. Suddenly, a real bird began chirping above everyone's heads, and Yao didn't quite understand whether he really saw a magpie in the middle of the port. But the bird was real, and she decided to prove her existence to everyone with the help of biomaterial that was successfully bombarded. Sean pushed Lu to the side so unexpectedly that he didn't even have time to do anything, but by inertia he had already moved away. The bird's biomaterial successfully landed on the collar of the suit, which although already dirty did not require additional dirt. The guys froze in strange poses, as if they were playing a game of who could hold out the longest without moving, and the situation became increasingly absurd. From the excessive emotions, even a vein appeared on Lu's face. He was so angry about the damage to his suit. Continuing to stare at the white stinking stain on his collar, all Lu Jichuan could say about the situation was shit. Chuan shouted to Zhou she like a whistling kettle, and for now everything was clear only to him while the others froze in bewilderment. Xi's angry cry was answered by a soft and velvety voice asking if his friend had really missed him and was already looking forward to meeting him, to which everyone present turned around. Lu was furious, and Sean didn't know where to go because he didn't understand whether more enemies were coming or whether it was someone from their team, which meant he didn't have to worry, but he wouldn't get an answer now. The noise and din was getting closer, and it was created by those who came to defend the side of Lady Wu Yu and everything connected with her, which meant that Sean would have even more friends. Shinho wasn't the only one who had to fight with the enemy in order to buy time until help arrived, and at that moment the help also had to deal with the problems that the rats in black collars were creating for them. Zhou was able to escape from the stone labyrinths that Cheese had set up, and now the monk was finally heading towards Lu and Sean, while at the same time reading the general chat. On the broken phone screen in the hero's general chat hung the geolocation that Lu had sent, and then a new voice message in which Han Li greeted everyone, explaining that she was Shu's sister. Li added shyly that her brother could not come due to special circumstances, which Zhou perceived as childishness, not knowing all the details about Shu's condition. The monk understood that the 14-year-old girl was clearly in danger somewhere, so he asked his feathered assistants to find Li's location. Zhou was right about the danger, but it was more threatening to Thea, who, although she controlled the operation of the equipment and disabled the robot, and Li's machine was already ready to fight. Yuan's electronic assistant reported that automatic control was no longer possible and headed toward the edge of the bridge against her will. Pieces of concrete started falling from the bridge, but the car had not yet been thrown completely into the water, which meant there was hope for its rescue. Thea froze in place, watching as a rather young girl managed to fly out of the switched-off car, and she was clearly not in the mood for a nice conversation. Li actually flew at Thea with her fists and shouting, "Don't you dare touch the robot," but she didn't even move from the unexpected encounter. The blow was so strong that it seemed like the bridge had been blown up by explosives, but it was just Li hitting it with her fist once. Thea was stunned for a moment, not understanding whether she was still alive or already dead, because the blow was not only strong but also deafening. The first thing the girl saw was her arms and legs hanging in the air, but that didn't make it any easier since it was still unclear whether she had been thrown back and was still flying or whether she had already died, but a voice nearby brought her back to Earth. Poor Cheese was breathing so heavily that the only thing he could say at first was that it was over, and only then did he begin to grumble to Thea that she didn't have to stand there like a fool while they pushed the cabin into place for her. Thea found herself fully on the ground, both with her feet and her thoughts, and Cheese could catch her breath after the journey he had made at the speed of light. In front of the guys there was a wall that Cheese had managed to erect as a human shield, and it had already cracked, which was not clear to both of them since there was only a little girl on the other side. That same little girl in turn on the other side of the wall sank her arm up to her